But perhaps there is a kernel of something nonetheless fundamentally true here. Contemporary state-of-the-art reinforcement learning systems really are general, at least in the domain of board and video games, in a way that Deep Blue was not. DQN could play dozens of Atari games with equal felicity. AlphaZero is just as adept at chess as it is at shogi and go. What's more, artificial general intelligence, AGI, of the kind that can learn to operate fluidly in the real world may indeed require the sorts of intrinsic motivation architectures that can make it bored of a game it's played too much. At the other side of the spectrum from boredom is addiction, not a disengagement, but its dark reverse, a pathological degree of repetition or perseverance. Here, too, reinforcement learning has come to exhibit behaviors that are in some cases uncannily, uncomfortably human. Researchers who study intrinsic motivation talk about what they call the noisy TV problem. What if there is a source of randomness or novelty in the environment that is essentially inexhaustible? Will the intrinsically motivated agent simply be powerless to resist it? In concrete terms. But perhaps there is a kernel of something nonetheless fundamentally true here. Contemporary state-of-the-art reinforcement learning systems really are general, at least in the domain of board and video games, in a way that Deep Blue was not. DQN could play dozens of Atari games with equal felicity. AlphaZero is just as adept at chess as it is at shogi and go. What's more, artificial general intelligence, AGI, of the kind that can learn to operate fluidly in the real world may indeed require the sorts of intrinsic motivation architectures that can make it bored of a game it's played too much. At the other side of the spectrum from boredom is addiction, not a disengagement, but its dark reverse, a pathological degree of repetition or perseverance. Here, too, reinforcement learning has come to exhibit behaviors that are in some cases uncannily, uncomfortably human. Researchers who study intrinsic motivation talk about what they call the noisy TV problem. What if there is a source of randomness or novelty in the environment that is essentially inexhaustible? Will the intrinsically motivated agent simply be powerless to resist it? In concrete terms, imagine there were a source of unpredictable visual noise on the screen. A staticky TV is the classic example, though crackling flames or rustling leaves or rushing water would all qualify as well. If this were the case, each new and unpredictable configuration of light and shadow would act as a kind of endless curiosity jackpot. In theory, at least, an agent confronted with this should become instantly stupefied. Most of the simple Atari games from the 1970s and 80s, though, don't happen to contain such sources of visual randomness, and so it hadn't been demonstrated empirically. Puttock, Berda, and Edwards decided to bring the thought experiment to life and try it out. They created a simple 3D maze game, where the agent is required to explore the maze and find an exit. In one version of the game, however, there is a television screen on one of the walls of the maze. Furthermore, the agent is given the ability to press a button that changes the channel on the television. What would happen? What happened is that the instant the agent comes within view of the TV screen, its exploration of the maze comes to a screeching halt. The agent centers the screen in its view and starts flipping through channels. Now it sees a video of an airplane in flight. Now it sees cute puppies. Now. Perhaps there is a kernel of something nonetheless fundamentally true here. Contemporary state-of-the-art reinforcement learning systems really are general, at least in the domain of board and video games, in a way that Deep Blue was not. DQN could play dozens of Atari games with equal felicity. AlphaZero is just as adept at chess as it is at shogi and go. What's more, artificial general intelligence, AGI, of the kind that can learn to operate fluidly in the real world may indeed require the sorts of intrinsic motivation architectures that can make it bored of a game it's played too much. At the other side of the spectrum from boredom is addiction, not a disengagement, but its dark reverse, a pathological degree of repetition or perseverance. Here, too, reinforcement learning has come to exhibit behaviors that are in some cases uncannily, uncomfortably human. Researchers who study intrinsic motivation talk about what they call the noisy TV problem. What if there is a source of randomness or novelty in the environment that is essentially inexhaustible? Will the intrinsically motivated agent simply be powerless to resist it? In concrete terms, imagine there were a source of unpredictable visual noise on the screen. A staticky TV is the classic example, though crackling flames or rustling leaves or rushing water would all qualify as well. If this were the case, each new and unpredictable configuration of light and shadow would act as a kind of endless curiosity jackpot. In theory, at least, an agent confronted with this should become instantly stupefied. Most of the simple Atari games from the 1970s and 80s, though, don't happen to contain such sources of visual randomness, and so it hadn't been demonstrated empirically. Puttock, Berda, and Edwards decided to bring the thought experiment to life and try it out. They created a simple 3D maze game, where the agent is required to explore the maze and find an exit. In one version of the game, however, there is a television screen on one of the walls of the maze. Furthermore, the agent is given the ability to press a button that changes the channel on the television. What would happen? What happened is that the instant the agent comes within view of the TV screen, its exploration of the maze comes to a screeching halt. The agent centers the screen in its view and starts flipping through channels. Now it sees a video of an airplane in flight. Now it sees cute puppies. Now it sees a man seated at a computer. Now cars in downtown traffic. The agent keeps changing channels, awash in novelty and surprise. It never budges again. Visual information isn't the only source of randomness that can have these dangerous effects. So can something as simple as flipping a coin. This had almost a decade earlier weighed on the mind of DeepMind researcher Laurent Orso, the first hire onto their safety team, and who is now part of their foundation's research group. Long before the arrival of intrinsically motivated Atari-playing agents that could be turned instantaneously into couch potatoes, Orso was thinking about a much more powerful agent, transfixed by a coin. Orso was thinking about a hypothetical agent he called the knowledge-seeking agent, an agent whose goal is to gather as much information about the unknown world as possible. 64 Orso's agent was based on a theoretical framework called AIXI, which imagines an agent capable of infinite computation. Such a mentally omnipotent agent could never exist in reality, of course, but it acts as a kind of reference point. If you could think forever before taking an action, which one would you take? Amazingly, a number of conceptions of an infinitely resourceful knowledge-seeking agent fell into complete degeneracy at the sight of a coin, preferring to observe coin flips rather than explore a more informative part of their environment, also notes. The reason for this is that these agents mistake stochastic outcomes for complex information. 65b. F. Skinner, when he wasn't training pigeons, was fascinated by gambling addiction. The house always wins, on average, and psychology, all the way back to Thorndike, had been based on the idea that you do something more when it's on balance good for you, and less when it's bad. From this view, something like gambling addiction was impossible. And yet there it was, a presence in the real world, daring the behaviorists to make sense of it. Gamblers appear to violate the law of effect, Skinner wrote, because they continue to play even though their net reward is negative. Hence it is argued that they must be gambling for other reasons. 66. We now appear to have a pretty good candidate for what those other reasons might be. Gambling addiction may be an overtaking of extrinsic reward. The house always wins, after all, by intrinsic reward. Random events are always at least slightly surprising, even when their probabilities are well understood, as with a fair coin, for instance. In Chapter 4 we talked about the role of dopamine in encoding temporal prediction errors, cases where reward is better or worse than expected. However, there have been some curious cases that don't fit this pattern. Namely, there is growing evidence, since the turn of the century, that things that are novel and surprising trigger the release of dopamine, whether or not they have any reward associated with them at all. 67. Just as the reinforcement learning community is discovering the value of making novelty and surprise function as rewards in their own right, the neuroscience community is uncovering such machinery at work in our own heads. At the same time, it is increasingly clear how these mechanisms, which normally help us, can go awry. Reinforcement learning agents can become addicted to changing channels and playing slot machines, and so, of course, can we. Because the outcome of actions like these is never exactly what we thought it would be, there is always something surprising about that activity, always seemingly something to learn. We don't think of addiction as a surfeit of motivation, an overabundance of curiosity, but something along these lines may well be how it does, in fact, function. Its own sake. The computational study of intrinsic motivation offers us a powerful toolkit for making headway in difficult learning environments, Montezuma's revenge being just one example. At a deeper level, it also offers us a story, rooted in these empirical successes, for why we may have such striking motivations ourselves. In better coming to understand our own motivations and drives, we then, in turn, have a chance for complementary and reciprocal insights about how to build an artificial intelligence as flexible, resilient, and intellectually omnivorous as our own. Deepak Pathak looks at the success of deep learning and sees one glaring weakness: each system, be it for machine translation, or object recognition, or even game playing, is purpose-built. Training a huge neural network on a heap of manually labeled images was, as we have seen, the paradigm in which deep learning first truly showed its promise. Explicitly drilling a system to categorize images made a system that could categorize images. Fair enough, he says. But the problem is, these artificial intelligence systems are not actually intelligent. Because they are missing a key component which is very central to humans, which is this general purpose behavior, or general purpose learning system. 68. To make a general purpose system will require breaking out of this task-specific mindset, he argues, and it will also require breaking down one crucial, conspicuous artifice: the enormous amount of explicit reward. Information these models require. An image labeling system like AlexNet might require hundreds of thousands of images, each of them labeled by humans. That's quite clearly not how we acquire our own visual skills early in life. Likewise for reinforcement learning, where in the world of Atari games, every tenth of a second the game tells you with perfect authority exactly how you're doing. It works very well, but it requires something, again, very, very weird, he says, which is this reward. Unplugging the hardwired external rewards may be a necessary part of building truly general AI, because life, unlike an Atari game, emphatically does not come pre-labeled with real-time feedback on how good or bad each of our actions is. We have parents and teachers, sure, who can correct our spelling and pronunciation, and occasionally, our behavior. But this hardly covers a fraction of what we do and say and think, and the authorities in our life do not always agree. Moreover, it is one of the central rites of passage of the human condition that we must learn to make these judgments by our own lights and for ourselves. The orthogonal agenda to just doing good exploration, for me, has always been to remove the reward altogether, says Bellmer. This is stepping outside of my usual range of comfort, but you know, I think the most interesting thing we can do with AI agents is to have them come up with their own objectives, if you will. There are safety questions here, he acknowledges, but I would like, as you say, my AI agent to be thrown into Montezuma's revenge and just play it, because it likes to play it. 69. We were talking earlier about the ALE arcade learning environment, and how it's been a great benchmark, Bellmer says. And to me in some sense, we're mostly done with the ALE. And we're mostly done with maximizing scores. For him, no high score that comes by way of epsilon greedy button mashing, reinforced by point scoring, qualifies as intelligence, impressive though the results may be. I actually think that we should be measuring intelligence in terms of how things behave, not in terms of reward function. What would such behavior look like? This is one of the central questions that drives him. Also's work on knowledge-seeking agents also sketches what a mind motivated purely by the pursuit of knowledge might be like. An initial analysis is encouraging. An artificial agent motivated to maximize some kind of score, or achieve some goal state, will always be at risk of exploiting some loophole to do so. An even more intelligent agent may be inclined to hack the scoring system, or to construct an escapist fantasy for itself where its goals are easier to achieve. Also emphasizes that while this seems like cheating to us, it doesn't have a sense of cheating. It's just, well, I do actions to maximize my reward. He elaborates, the agent doesn't understand that it is something bad. It's just that it tries many different actions, and then this works. So why not do it? 70. The knowledge-seeking agent, though, can't take any such shortcuts. Self-deception, in particular, holds no interest or appeal. So imagine that you are modifying your observations. Then what information do you gain? Nothing. Because you can predict what it's going to be. 71. Because of this resilience, the knowledge-seeking agent may therefore be the most suitable agent for an AGI in our own world, a place that allows self modifications and contains many ways to deceive oneself. 72. There are still reasons to hesitate before unleashing a superintelligent knowledge-seeking agent. Seeking knowledge may involve commandeering various earthly resources in order to do so. But it is at least resilient to some of the most straightforward of traps. If you could program it, I believe it would have an amazing behavior, says also. Because it would try to make sense as quickly as possible of its environment. It's basically the ultimate scientist. It would design experiments to try to understand what would happen. I would really be curious to see how it would behave. The concept and the ethics of an intelligence guided chiefly or purely by curiosity is hardly a new idea. It predates not only the past decade, but indeed the past millennium. In Plato's famous dialogue Protagoras, Socrates reflects on this matter and puts it quite well indeed. Knowledge is a fine thing quite capable of ruling a man, Socrates says. If he can distinguish good from evil, nothing will force him to act otherwise than as knowledge dictates, since wisdom is all the reinforcement he needs. 73. Part 3. Normativity. 7. Imitation. I was 6 years old when my parents told me that there was a small, dark jewel inside my skull, learning to be me. Greg Egan 1. Watch this. Elon Musk to Peter Thiel, immediately before losing control of and crashing his uninsured $1 million McLaren F12. In English, we say that to imitate something is to ape it, and we're not the only ones. This seemingly arbitrary linguistic quirk appears again and again across languages and cultures. The Italian Simiatari, French singer, Portuguese Macaquer, German Naschafen, Bulgarian Majmuna, Russian, Hungarian Majmul, Polish Malpawak, Estonian Avima, verbs for imitation and mimicry, again and again, have their etymologies rooted in terms for primates. Point 3. Indeed, the simian reputation for being a great imitator, not just in etymology but in science, goes back a century and a half at the minimum. As 19th century biologist and friend of Charles Darwin's, George John Romans wrote in 1882 on the subject of what Mr. Darwin calls the principle of imitation. It is proverbial that monkeys carry this principle to ludicrous lengths, and they are the only animals which imitate for the mere sake of imitating. Though an exception ought to be made in favor of talking birds. Point 4. Proverbial indeed, and across a surprising array of cultures and languages. And yet, ironically, this appears not actually to be true. Primatologists Elisabetta Visselberghi and Dorothy Fragasse, asking, "Do monkeys ape?" took a hard look at the evidence and were forced to conclude, through both a literature review and experiments of their own, that the data showed, in fact, an overwhelming lack of imitation in monkeys. The lack of imitation in monkeys, they write, is as apparent in tool-using behaviors as it is in arbitrary behaviors such as postures, gestures, or problem-solving. 5. Subsequent work, by comparative psychologist Michael Tomasello, asked the same question of our slightly nearer primate kin. Do apes ape? And came to a similarly decisive conclusion, with the possible exception of chimpanzees, our very closest genetic relatives. Exactly to what degree chimpanzees do imitate in the wild, or can imitate when trained by humans, remains a nuanced and somewhat unresolved issue. My answer to the more general question of whether apes ape, says Tomasello, is only when trained by humans, either formally or informally, to do so and then perhaps in only some ways. 6. So the primate reputation for imitation is more or less totally undeserved. There is a primate, however, that is a natural, uncanny, prolific, and seemingly hardwired imitator. It's us. In 1930, Indiana University psychologist Winthrop Kellogg and his wife, Luella, raised their infant son, Donald, alongside an infant chimpanzee named Gua for 9 months, treating the two of them identically, like human siblings. In the book the Kelloggs wrote about the experience, The Ape and the Child, they noted that, because of the reputation of the chimpanzee as an imitator, the observers were on the alert from the start for the appearance of this sort of behavior. And yet, strange as it may seem, imitation in Gua was clearly less pronounced than in the boy. Donald was a prolific imitator indeed, of both parents and his sibling. At age 17 months, he startled his father by pacing back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back, a spitting image of Winthrop himself in moments of deep concentration. More often, though, Donald imitated Gua, his playmate and peer. Even though Donald could already walk, and indeed, had hardly even crawled before learning to walk, he started to take after Gua and began crawling around on all fours. When a piece of fruit was nearby, Donald learned to grunt and bark the way Gua did. Slightly concerned, the Kelloggs soon called their experiment to an abrupt halt. 7. Evidence that it is, in fact, we humans who are nature's imitators par excellence has continued to mount. For instance, when you stick your tongue out at a baby, they will, less than an hour after birth, stick their tongue back out at you. 8. The feat is all the more amazing considering that the child has never even seen themselves before. As UC Berkeley's Alison Gopnik notes, there are no mirrors inside of the womb. 9, and so the imitation is crossmodal. They are matching how you look when sticking out your tongue to how they feel when doing so. All this in the first 40 minutes. This incredible capacity was first discovered by the University of Washington's Andrew Meltzoff in 1977. The finding turned a generation of psychological received wisdom on its head. Legendary Swiss developmental psychologist John Piaget, who ranked second in influence only to Freud as measured by citations over the 20th century, had written in 1937 that during the earliest stages the child perceives things like a solipsist. But step by step with the coordination of his intellectual instruments, he discovers himself in placing himself as an active object among the other active objects in a universe external to himself. 11. Meltzoff, while acknowledging the debt that all psychologists pay to the great 20th century Swiss psychologist, thinks that in this particular case, Piaget has it precisely backward. We must revise our current conceptions of infancy, he says. The recognition of self-other equivalences is the foundation, not the outcome, of social cognition. 12. Imitation, he says, is the starting point for psychological development in infancy, and not its culmination. 13. This proclivity to imitate others begins almost instantly, but it is far from mere reflex. There is a surprising level of sophistication to who, what, and when children imitate, as we are only in the last couple decades coming to understand. For instance, they will imitate an adult's action only if it does something interesting, rather than seems to have no effect. 14 Young children also appear to have a special sense that it is other humans that make stuff happen. They won't imitate the action if the object seems to move by itself, or if a robotic or mechanical hand does the motion. 15. This has intriguing implications for the feasibility of robot nannies and teachers. It also seems that babies are keenly aware of when they are being imitated. There is a famous scene in the 1933 Marx Brothers film Duck Soup where Harpo pretends to be Groucho's reflection in a mirror, matching his every movement. Meltzoff did a study just like this, where adults would either imitate a baby's movements, or simply go through a fixed series of movements planned in advance. Just like Groucho, the babies would concoct elaborate, or unusual movements in order to test out whether the adult was indeed mimicking them. 16 For Meltzoff, this deeply seated capacity to recognize ourselves in relation to others, whom we perceive in some fundamental way as like ourselves, is the beginning not only of psychological development, but as he puts it, the kernel embryonic foundation for the development of social norms, values, ethics, empathy. It's a big bang. The initial beginning is this imitation of bodily movements. 17. Over-imitation. Imagine you're showing someone how to, for instance, chop an onion, and you say, now try it like this, then clear your throat and begin to demonstrate a cut. Your pupil observes you closely, and, looking for your approval, clears their throat before making the same cut. They haven't just imitated you, they've over-imitated you, by including in the imitation acts that simply aren't relevant, or that have no ultimate causal impact on the task being performed. 18 Researchers who study imitative behavior in humans and chimpanzees were surprised to discover that this sort of over-imitation is much more frequent among humans than among chimpanzees. This seemed counterintuitive. How could it be that the chimpanzees were doing a better job at determining which actions were relevant and irrelevant, and then reproducing only the relevant ones? One of the most revealing and intriguing studies involved plastic boxes with two locked openings, one on the top and one on the front. The experimenter demonstrated first unlocking the top opening, then unlocking the front, then reaching into the front to get a bit of food. When chimpanzees saw this demonstration using an opaque black box, they faithfully did both actions in the same order. But when the experimenters used a clear box, the chimpanzee could observe that the top opening had nothing whatsoever to do with the food. In this case, the chimpanzee would then go straight to the front opening, ignoring the top one altogether. The 3-year-old children, in contrast, reproduced the unnecessary first step even when they could see that it did nothing. 19 It was their eyes that perhaps humans, in this instance, are simply slower to develop the relevant skill. Researchers shifted from studying 3-year-olds to studying 5-year-olds. The over-imitation behavior was worse. The older children were more prone to over-imitate than the younger children. 20 This made no sense. What on earth was going on? The problem got stranger still. Researchers thought that the children were doing the over-imitation to get the approval of the experimenter. They had the experimenter leave the room, it didn't help. And when researchers asked the children, both age 3 and age 5, whether they could tell which of the demonstrated actions they had to do and which were silly and unnecessary, the children could. But even when they'd gone through this process of showing the experimenter they knew the difference, they still reproduced both actions. 21 Finally, the experimenters tried explicitly telling the children not to do anything silly and extra. It didn't help. The children agreed to the instructions, then still over-imitated. Again, this seemed counterintuitive and almost paradoxical, that with increasing cognitive abilities, children exhibit an apparent lessening of control towards more mindless blanket copying as they develop. 22 One clue lay in a study of 14-month-olds by Hungarian psychologist Georgi Gergely. Toddlers saw an adult, sitting at a table, lean forward to touch her forehead to a light bulb, which made it light up. However, there was one crucial twist. Half the time, the adult's arms were resting on the table, and the other half of the time, the adult, pretending to be cold, had wrapped herself in a blanket. Toddlers who saw that the adult's arms were free reproduced the action exactly, bending forward to touch the light bulb with their heads. But toddlers who had seen that the adult's arms were occupied by holding the blanket simply reached out and touched the light bulb with their hand. 23 There was something critical here. Barely over 1 year old, the toddlers were capable of assessing whether the experimenter had taken a strange action by choice or by necessity. There must have been some reason why this grown-up bent over and touched the light with her head. Her hands were right there. If it seemed to have been a deliberate choice, they would reproduce it exactly. This showed the problem of over-imitation in a new light. It was not mindless at all, not simply a slavish reproduction of the exact movement, but the opposite, a reasonable, sophisticated insight based on imagining the demonstrator as making rational choices and performing the action as easily and efficiently as possible. Suddenly it began to make sense that such behavior increased from age 1 to 3, and again from 3 to 5. As children grow in their cognitive sophistication, they become better able to model the minds of others. Sure, they can see, in the case of the transparent cube, that the adult is opening a latch that has no effect. But they realize that the adult can see that too. If the adult can see that what they're doing has no apparent effect, but they still do it anyway, there must be a reason. Therefore, even if we can't figure out what that reason is, we'd better do that silly thing too. The chimpanzee, in contrast, has no such sophisticated model of the human demonstrator. The logic seems to be much simpler. The human is dumb and isn't taking the best action to get the food. Whatever. I can see the best way to get the food, so I'll just do that. Suddenly the apparent paradox unraveled. In a strange, artificial scenario like this one, the chimpanzee happened to be correct. But it was the human child, over-imitating, who was the more cognitively sophisticated, with access to a deeper level of insight about the matter. Indeed, adults, unless they're doing laboratory studies, generally don't, as a rule, do pointless actions when they know better. The infant looks silly taking 2 actions to get the food when one would do, but only because the grown-ups are being, in a sense, deceptive or insincere. Shame on them. More recent work has established just how subtle these effects can be. Children are, from a very young age, acutely sensitive to whether the grown-up demonstrating something is deliberately teaching them, or just experimenting. When the adult presents themselves as an expert, I'm going to show you how it works, children faithfully reproduce even the seemingly unnecessary steps that the adult took. But when the adult presents themselves as unfamiliar with the toy, I haven't played with it yet, the child will imitate only the effective actions, and will ignore the silly ones. 24 Again, it appears that seeming over-imitation, rather than being irrational, or lazy or cognitively simple, is in fact a sophisticated judgment about the mind of the teacher. All of this serves to show the immense cognitive sophistication lurking behind what seems on the surface to be simple, rote imitation. The result is a newfound appreciation for the mental skills of toddlers, and a greater sense of the computational complexity of simply telling a machine learning system to watch this. Imitation learning. If we humans are uniquely equipped for imitation, that invites an obvious question: why? What is it about imitation that makes it such a powerful tool for learning? There are, as it happens, at least 3 distinct advantages that learning by imitation has over learning by trial and error and by explicit instruction. We have seen how machine learning researchers have borrowed directly from psychology for ideas like shaping and intrinsic motivation. Imitation has proven no less rich a source of inspiration. Indeed, it forms the bedrock for many of AI's greatest successes in the 20th and 21st centuries alike. The first advantage imitation has is efficiency. In imitation, the hard-won fruits of someone else's trial and error are handed to you on a silver platter. In fact, no small part of the advantage of learning by imitation is knowing that what you're trying to do is even possible in the first place. In 2015, famed rock climbers Tommy Caldwell and Kevin Jorgeson made history by completing the first successful ascent of Yosemite Valley's legendary 3,000-foot Dawn Wall, called by Outside magazine the world's hardest rock climb. 25 It took 8 years for Caldwell and Jorgeson to plan their route, experimenting on different pitches of the cliffs face, trying to connect various doable segments and find a single feasible path all the way from the bottom to the top. The Dawn Wall was, in Caldwell's words, infinitely harder than anything I had even contemplated climbing. Before point 26 The rock looks at first like a perfectly blank face, daring you to imagine some way to find purchase. What little purchase there is seems outright hostile to human flesh. This is the hardest thing you could ever do on your fingers, climbing this route, Caldwell says. It's just grabbing razor blades. 27 The following year, the young Czech climbing sensation Adam Ondra was able to replicate their feat after just a few weeks of scouting and practice. He attributes much of that speed to having been shown not just the way to make it up the Dawn Wall, but the mere fact that it was possible at all, something that Caldwell and Jorgeson did not know when they began the arduous process of planning their ascent. Said Ondra. The fact that Tommy and Kevin put all this effort, like years and years of work, it's so impressive. There are so many sections, on the crux pitches, and even in some of the easier pitches, if you are there, you think, no. This is impossible. And only after studying every single tiny razor blade, sometimes the only possible answer comes to your mind. So it was so much easier for me to solve the puzzle of each individual pitch, because I knew that the guys did it. They sent the route, and I was very proud to make the first repetition. Point 28. The first ascent took 8 years of exhaustive search and self-doubt. The second ascent took a few weeks of study and rehearsal, buoyed by the confidence that no matter how impossible it looked, there was a way. We saw earlier how the game Montezuma's Revenge requires an absurd number of things to go right even to earn its first reward, and that even then, the path to successfully completing it is razor thin, the encouraging feedback rare, and the consequences of failure dire. It is like the reinforcement learning equivalent of the Dawn Wall, a nearly blank, impassive surface that dares you to find purchase. Even using powerful techniques like novelty bonuses and intrinsic motivation, an enormous number of attempts are still required for an agent to learn the mechanics of the game and the pathway to success. But what if the agent didn't have to explore the game for itself? What if it had a role model? A group at DeepMind led by Yusuf Aitar and Tobias Pfaff in 2018 came up with an ingenious idea. Might it be possible, they wondered, for an agent to learn how to play the game not by painstaking in-game exploration, but rather by watching YouTube videos? 29 It was audacious and just crazy enough to work. YouTube was full of videos of human players playing the game. Their agent could, in effect, learn the point values of various actions by first watching someone else take those actions first. Then, when it was turned loose to act for itself, it already had a basic idea of what to do. The first agent that trained to mimic these human players was, at the time, better than any agent trained with reinforcement learning on the game's rewards alone. In fact, preceding the breakthroughs at the end of 2018 using intrinsic motivation, it was the very first artificial agent, with a little initial help and inspiration from its human role models, to get out of the temple. Point 30 The second critical thing that imitation confers is some degree of safety. Learning through hundreds of thousands of failures may work fine in the realm of Atari, where death is but a restart. Point 31 In other areas of life, however, we don't have the luxury of being able to fail hundreds of thousands of times in order to get things right. A surgeon, for example, or a fighter pilot, hopes to learn incredibly precise and elaborate techniques without ever making a critical mistake. Essential to this process is observing the live, recorded, or even hypothetical successes and failures of their forebears. The third advantage of imitation is that it allows the student, be it human or machine, to learn to do things that are hard to describe. 19th century psychologist Conway Lloyd Morgan had this idea in mind when he wrote, 5 minutes demonstration is worth more than 5 hours talking, where the object is to impart skill. It is of comparatively little use to describe or explain how a skilled feat is to be accomplished. It is far more helpful to show how it is done. 32 This is true when we are trying to articulate the actions we want. Now bend your elbow at a 27-degree angle while flicking your wrist very quickly, but not too quickly. And it is just as true when we are trying to articulate the goals we want our pupil to pursue. In an Atari game, something like maximize total score or complete the game as quickly as possible may more or less suffice. But in real-world scenarios, it might be very hard to even communicate everything we want our learner to do. Perhaps the canonical case for this is the car. We want to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, though not by going over the speed limit, or, rather, not by going too far over the speed limit, unless for some reason we have to, and by staying centered in our lane, unless there's a cyclist or a stopped car, and not passing cars on the right, unless it's safer to do so than not to do so, and so on. It's hard to try to formalize all of this into some kind of objective function that we then tell the system to optimize. Better, in cases like this, to use what the Future of Humanity Institute's Nick Bostrom calls indirect normativity 33, a way to get the system aligned with our desires without articulating them down to the last minutiae. In this case, what we want is to say something like, watch how I drive. Do it like this. This was, as it turns out, one of the very first ideas in self-driving cars, and to this day, still one of the best. Steering. In 1984, DARPA began a project they called the Strategic Computing Initiative. The idea was to leverage the computing breakthroughs happening in the 1980s, and to turn that then bleeding-edge technology into 3 specific applications. As Chuck Thorpe, just graduating with his doctorate in robotics from Carnegie Mellon at the time, recalls, why 3? Well, 1 to keep the Army happy, 1 to keep the Air Force happy, 1 to keep the Navy happy, 34 the Air Force wanted a pilot's associate, a kind of automated co-pilot that could understand commands or requests spoken out loud by the pilot. The Navy was interested in what they called a battle management system that could help with scenario planning and weather prediction. That left the Army. What they wanted were autonomous land vehicles. 35 Thorpe successfully defended his doctoral thesis that September, telling his committee he was planning to take several weeks vacation and think about what he might be up to next. Instead, the director of the CMU Robotics Institute, Raj Reddy, in one breath congratulated him and said, "What you're up to next is a meeting in my office starting in 5 minutes." The meeting was about building autonomous vehicles for DARPA. That, recalls Thorpe, that 5-minute window was my break between finishing my thesis and starting my postdoc. Vehicles, that were in some sense self-driving, had by 1984 already been around for years, but to call the technology primitive would be perhaps too generous. Robotics pioneer Hans Moravec had, in his own PhD thesis at Stanford in 1980, enabled a robotic cart, the size and shape of a desk on bicycle wheels, to move itself around and avoid chairs and other obstacles using an onboard TV camera. The system is moderately reliable, Moravec wrote, but very slow, 36 how slow. The cart was programmed to move 1 meter at a time, in lurches, as Moravec put it. After one of these meter-long lurches, the cart would stop, take pictures, and think for 10 to 15 minutes before making its next, equally tentative maneuver. Its top speed was, therefore, capped at 0.004 miles per hour. The robot was so slow, in fact, that it was completely flustered by the outdoors, because the sun's angle would change so much between lurches that the shadows seemed to move bewilderingly. 37 as Thorpe recalls, in fact, his system locked onto these nice, sharp-edged shadows and saw that they were moving, and saw that the real objects weren't moving consistently with the shadows, decided it had more confidence in the shadows than in the real objects, and threw out the real objects and locked onto the shadows, and ran over his chairs. By 1984, Moravec had come to Carnegie Mellon, and Thorpe worked with him to get the time between lurches down from 10 minutes to 30 seconds. That worked out to a top speed shy of 1/10 of a mile per hour. It was progress. At that time, the state-of-the-art computer was something called the VAX 110784, VA Zymus, which was about 8 feet wide and 8 feet tall. Vehicles like Moravec's cart would be attached to these computers by an umbilical cord. But to make a vehicle that could truly move around in the outside world would require bringing the computer along for the ride, which, in turn, also meant bringing along a power source for the computer. This ended up meaning a 4-cylinder generator. It was going to take a lot more than a cart. Thorpe and his group settled on a Chevy panel van, which was big enough for all of the gear and 5 graduate students. As Thorpe observed, they were highly motivated to have high-quality software, because they were going to be, as the saying goes, first at the scene of the accident. You write much better software when you know you're going to be riding. The project, dubbed NavLab 1, began in earnest in 1986. At that point the system could make a move every 10 seconds, a quarter of a mile per hour. 38 Thorpe's son Leland was born the same year, and as it happened, Leland ended up being the perfect foil for the robot. When NavLab 1 was moving at a crawling speed, my son was moving at a crawling speed. When NavLab 1 picked up speed, my son was walking and learning to run. NavLab 1 got going a little faster, my son got a tricycle. I thought it was going to be a 16-year contest to see who was going to drive the Pennsylvania Turnpike first. 39, that rivalry would come to a shockingly abrupt end, however, in favor of the machine. Thorpe's graduate student Dean Pomelo ended up putting together a vision system using neural networks. It blew away all of the other approaches the group had tried. So in 1990, says Thorpe, he was ready to go out and drive the Pennsylvania Turnpike. They called the system Alvin, autonomous land vehicle in a neural net, and it learned by imitation. 40, you would drive for a few minutes, says Thorpe, and it would learn. If the road looks like this, you turn the steering wheel like this. If it looks like that, you would turn the steering wheel like that. So if you trained it on the road that you were driving on, it was very good at spitting out steering wheel angles. Early one Sunday morning, when the light was good and there were very few other cars on the road, Pomelo took Alvin on the interstate. Alvin steered all the way from Pittsburgh up I-79 to Erie, on the shores of the Great Lakes. This was kind of revolutionary, says Thorpe, not just the feat itself, but the simplicity of the model that achieved it. Alvin knew nothing about momentum or traction, could not recognize objects or predict future locations of itself or other cars, had no ability to relate what it saw in its camera feed to how itself was positioned in space, nor to simulate the effects of its actions. People thought if you wanted to drive that fast, says Thorpe, you had to have Kalman filters, and clothoid models of the road, and detailed models of the dynamic response of your vehicle. And all Dean had was a simple neural net that learned, the road looks like this, you steer like that. As Pomelo affirmed to a local news crew, we don't tell it anything except steer like I do. Learn to steer the way I'm steering right now. 41 in those days it took a refrigerator-sized computer, running on a 5,000-watt generator, which provided about 1/10 of the processing power of a 2016 vintage Apple Watch. 42, and Alvin didn't control the gas or brakes, which still had to be manually operated, nor could it change lanes or react in any particular way to the other cars on the road. But it worked and took Pomelo, steering like he had steered, to the Great Lakes in one piece. One of the most natural ideas about how to train machines is to train them to imitate us, and this approach seems especially appealing in the domain of driving. The success of Alvin hints at the broader viability of an approach like this. If we wanted to build a fully self-driving car, then rather than simply letting it loose on city streets, to explore different driving behaviors randomly and learn by pure trial and error, terrifying, we might begin by giving the system a huge dump of real human driving and train it to imitate human decisions behind the wheel. Given a certain state of affairs, this speed, this image in the windshield, this image in the rearview mirror, etc., the system can learn to predict what action a human driver took, be it press down on the gas, press down on the brake, turn the steering wheel, or do nothing. This predictive approach turns the problem of driving into something almost perfectly analogous to the ImageNet competition of labeling images. Instead of being shown a picture and needing to categorize it as a dog, cat, flower, or the like, the system is shown a picture from the front dashboard and categorizes it as accelerate, brake, turn left, turn right, and so on. We've seen already how deep learning allows a system to generalize from images it's seen to images it hasn't seen, if AlexNet can correctly identify dogs it's never been shown before, then that should encourage us to think that a car can, somehow, generalize from scenarios it's experienced to new ones. Even if it hasn't seen that exact road in that exact sun-dappled light, with that exact traffic flowing on it, it should nonetheless. So the theory goes, generalize from its past experience and recognize what to do here. The idea is that you never have to turn a fledgling self-driving car loose on city streets to explore policies on its own. Rather, you just record camera information and telemetry from the real human-driven cars on the streets every day, untold millions of hours of which could be captured in a single day, and eventually have a car that is a perfect mimic of human driving. As UC Berkeley's Sergey Levine describes to his Berkeley undergraduates, so a very natural way to think about solving these kinds of sequential decision-making problems is basically the same way that we solve our standard computer vision problems. We collect some data, so we get a human to drive a vehicle. We basically record the observations from the camera on their vehicle and record the steering commands that they make. That goes into our dataset, our training data. And then we're going to just run our favorite supervised learning method. We'll run, stochastic gradient descent, to train a network. Just treat this as though it was a standard supervised learning problem. That's a very reasonable thing to start with. 43. Then, he explains, when it is time for the system to take control, it simply turns its predictions. This is what I think a human driver would do in this situation into actions. Levine pauses for a second. Does anybody have any ideas about one thing that might go wrong with this? 44. The hands shoot up. Learning to recover. Imitation progresses with the acquired habits. In learning to dance, the deficiency of the association between the pupil's movements and the sight of the masters renders the first steps difficult to acquire. The desired movements are not naturally performed at the outset. Some movements are made, but the first actions are seen to be quite wrong. There is a manifest want of coincidence, which originates a new attempt, and that failing, another is made, until at last we see that the posture is hit. Alexander Bain. 45. What would I do? I wouldn't be in the situation. Apple CEO Tim Cook, when asked what he would do in the situation confronting Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. 46. It's 2009, and 20 years after Alvin, but in the very same building, Carnegie Mellon graduate student Stephen Ross is playing Super Mario Kart. Or rather, a free and open-source derivative called Super Tux Kart, featuring the Linux mascot, a lovable penguin named Tux. As Ross plays the game, his computer is recording all of the images on screen, along with every twitch of his joystick. The data is being used to train a fairly rudimentary neural network, not all that much more complex than the one Alvin used, to steer like Ross steers. 47. Ross takes his hands off the wheel and lets the neural network drive Tux around the track. In short order, Tux takes a turn too wide and drives straight off the road. Ross is back to the drawing board, and the drawing board doesn't look good. The problem is that no number of demonstration laps, he records 1 million frames of play, or about 2 hours of driving the course over and over and over, seems to make any difference. He hands the wheel over to the neural net, Tux gets off to a promising start, then wavers, veers, barrels off the road. At its root, the problem stems from the fact that the learner sees an expert execution of the problem, and an expert almost never gets into trouble. No matter how good the learner is, though, they will make mistakes, whether blatant or subtle. But because the learner never saw the expert get into trouble, they have also never seen the expert get out. In fact, when the beginner makes beginner mistakes, they may end up in a situation that is completely different from anything they saw during their observation of the expert. So that means, says Sergey Levine, that, all bets are off. In Super Tux Kart, for instance, Ross was good enough at the game that all of the data he was feeding the program showed it, in effect, how to continue driving straight ahead on the center of the track. But once Tux, under the network's control, got even slightly off center or slightly askew, it was lost. The screen looked systematically different from anything it had seen Ross do. The reaction required differed sharply from normal, in control, full throttle driving, but it had never seen anything else. And no amount of Ross continuing to play the game expertly, lap after lap and hour after hour, could fix that. The problem is what imitation learning researchers know as cascading errors, and it is one of the fundamental problems with imitation learning. As Dean Pomeroy wrote during his work on Alvin, since the person steers the vehicle down the center of the road during training, the network will never be presented with situations where it must recover from misalignment errors. 48. How to teach an imitation learner to recover has been a long-standing problem. If Pomeroy was going to trust the system with his life on his trip up to Lake Erie, then he was going to need to give it more than passive observations of his own, correct steering. This alone would mean that the system was only reliable as long as it never made a mistake. That was too much to ask, doing 55 miles per hour on the interstate for 2 hours. The network must not solely be shown examples of accurate driving, wrote Pomeroy, but also how to recover, i.e. return to the road center, once a mistake has been made. 49. But how? One idea was for Pomeroy himself to swerve around, during his training drives, to demonstrate to Alvin how to recover from being slightly out of the lane center, or pointed in slightly the wrong direction. Of course, this would require somehow erasing the beginning of the swerve from the training data, lest Alvin learn to imitate the swerves themselves. The second problem, he realized, was that to train the network properly would require him to swerve as often and in as diverse an array of situations as possible. This would be time-consuming, he concluded, and also dangerous. Pomelo came up with a different idea. He would fake it. The images Alvin processed were tiny and grainy, just 30 by 32 pixel, black and white images of the trapezoidal patch of asphalt immediately in front of the car. Indeed, its field of view was so narrow and myopic that when it entered an intersection, it would become totally disoriented, adrift in a vast sea of pavement. Pomelo took real images recorded from ALVINN's camera and simply doctored them to skew the road slightly to one side or the other. These were then thrown into the training data with steering commands meant to nudge the car gently back toward the center of the lane and a straight ahead bearing. It was a bit of a hack, and it only looked correct when the road surface was totally flat, without dips or hills, but on I-79 anyway, it worked. Ironically, the explosion of powerful deep learning techniques in the past decade have made the fake-it approach less and less feasible as modern camera sensors take in too many images per second at too high a resolution, with too wide a field of view, to be easily manipulated in this way. If the fake images are somehow systematically unlike the real things the car will see when it starts to drift, then you are in big trouble. It is a leap of faith, after all, to essentially wager your life on your Photoshop skills, and modern neural networks are effectively growing harder and harder to deceive. 20 years later, this problem of recovery was still unsolved as both a practical and a theoretical issue. When you learn from watching somebody, Stephen Ross tells me, you see some kind of distribution of examples that don't necessarily match what you're going to see if you start taking your own actions in the world. There was something deeply rooted here, Ross thought, because all machine learning relies on the assumption that your training and the test distribution are the same. But Ross and his advisor, CMU roboticist Drew Bagnell, thought they might be able to crack it. That got me super interested, says Ross, because that felt like a really fundamental problem to work on. 50 Ross and Bagnell did a theoretical analysis, trying to understand the problem from a mathematical perspective, while checking their intuitions in the world of SuperTuxKart. In an ordinary supervised learning problem, something a la ImageNet, the system, once trained, will have a certain likelihood of making an error with each picture it sees. Show it 10 times as many pictures, and it will make, on average, 10 times as many errors. In this sense, the errors scale linearly with the scope of the task. Imitation learning is far, far worse, they discovered. Because a single mistake could cause the system to see things it had never prepared for before. Once it makes a first mistake, all bets are off. The error grows with the square of the size of the task. Running for 10 times as long would produce 100 times as many mistakes. Point 51. The theoretical analysis was grim, but it left open a tantalizing possibility. Were there ways to get back to the safe world of merely linear mistakes? Of a car merely 10 times as likely to crash when driving 10 times as far. We were really looking for the holy grail, he says. As it turns out, they found it. The key was interaction. The learner needed some way not only to observe the expert at the outset, but to go back to the teacher when necessary and say, in effect, hey, I tried what you showed me, but this bad thing keeps happening. What would you do if you had gotten into this mess? Ross came up with 2 ways to get this kind of interaction to happen on the SuperTuxKart track. Point 52. One way was to watch the, initially catastrophic, lapse of the network with the joystick in hand. As Tux barreled around the course, Ross would move the joystick, as he would have if he were playing. The second method was to have Ross and the network randomly trading off control of the car, while both try to steer it at the same time. As he explains, it's like you're still playing the game mostly normally, but in some random steps, then you don't listen to the human control, you execute the learned control. And that kind of slowly decays over time, like you're less and less in control. But there's always the chance that it picks your control. It's awkward, a little unnatural, but it works. You're still definitely trying to play the game as you would if you were fully in control, Ross says. But it doesn't necessarily pick your controls all the time to execute. It starts veering off, then you try to correct. He chuckles. Over time, the car responds less and less of the time to your own steering commands, but the network gets better and better at doing what you would have done anyway. There are periods where you're not sure whether you're driving or not. The amazing thing was, not only did both of these forms of interaction work, both on the whiteboard and on the SuperTuxKart track, but they required incredibly little feedback to do so. With static demonstrations alone, the learner was still crashing just as often after a million frames of expert data, as it was after a couple thousand. It was just as hopeless after hours of tutelage, as it was after only minutes. Yet using this interactive method, Ross named it dataset aggregation, or DAGA, the program was driving almost flawlessly by its third lap around the track. Once we had that, says Ross, I was like, wow, this is really awesome. It worked orders of magnitude better than the default approach. As soon as he graduated with his PhD, Stephen Ross traded in the virtual pavement of SuperTuxKart for the real-world suburban streets of Mountain View, California, where he is currently a behavior prediction lead at the self-driving car company Waymo, designing models to forecast how other drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians on the road will behave and react. The level of reliability that we need is, like, orders and orders of magnitude more than anything we do in academia. So that's where the real challenge is. Like, how do you make sure that your model works all the time, not just 95 or 99% of the time? That's not even good enough. It's a tall order but a satisfying project. This project, in particular, is probably one of the projects where you can have some of the biggest impact on the world, if it succeeds, for the benefit of the world. Just that, on its own, is good enough motivation to work in that area, and hopefully have that impact someday. Though the type of interactive feedback that DAGA involves is the gold standard theoretically, in practice, we don't have to jockey with our cars for control of the steering wheel in order to ensure that they learn to stay centered in their lanes. There are several even simpler ways that work just fine in practice to build real-world systems capable of recovering from minor errors. A 2015 project by a group of Swiss roboticists took a clever approach to overcoming this problem while trying to build a drone that could fly itself up alpine hiking trails without getting lost in the woods. Whereas earlier work had attempted, as they put it, to explicitly define which visual features characterize a trail, they bypassed entirely the question of which parts of the image contain the trail, or exactly what trails look like and trained a system to simply map directly from an image to a motor output. It would take in a 752 by 480 pixel image of some dirt and trees, and output, turn left, turn right, or go straight. In a storyline that will by now feel quite familiar, years of careful research to handcraft visual features for saliency, or contrast, and clever thinking about how to distinguish dirt, say, from tree bark, were thrown out the window wholesale and replaced with convolutional neural nets trained by stochastic gradient descent. All the hand-tailored work became instantly obsolete. The team trained their system to imitate the path taken by a human hiker. What was unique, though, and clever, is what they did in order to enable their system to recover from mistakes. They strapped not one, but 3 GoPro cameras to the hiker's head, one pointed straight forward, and the others pointed left and right. They then told the hiker to walk, as he normally would, but to take care not to turn his head. They were thus able to generate a huge dataset of images of the trail and annotate the center camera. Feed with go forward when you see something like this, the left cameras with turn right when you see something like this, and the right cameras with turn left when you see something like this. They trained a neural network on the dataset, installed it in a quadrotor drone, and set it loose in the Swiss Alps. It appeared to have little trouble floating through the woods and following the trail. Again, the key insight is the need not only to show what the human expert did, but also to offer some guardrails, in the form of data for pointing a slightly off-kilter learner back on track. 53, 2016 project from NVIDIA's Deep Learning Research Group in Homedale, New Jersey, put the same clever trick to work on the streets of New Jersey's Monmouth County. NVIDIA mounted 3 cameras on a car, with one pointed forward and the others pointed roughly 30 degrees left and right of center. This generated hours and hours of footage of what it would look like if a car were pointed slightly in the wrong direction. The team then fed that data to their system, with the correct prediction being, do what the actual human driver did, plus a small correction back to center. With just 72 hours of training data, the system was safe enough to operate on the winding rural roads and multi-lane highways of Monmouth County under varying weather conditions without major incident. In a video released by the team, we watch as their Lincoln MKZ peels out from the parking lot of NVIDIA's Deep Learning Research Building and heads onto the Garden State Parkway. Is it still autonomous? Asks an employee in the chase car. It looks pretty good from here, he says, then clarifies that it's behaving better, at least, than the other, New Jerseyan piloted cars on the parkway. 54 There are 2 ironies here worth noting in brief. It was in this very research building, in the late 1980s, when it was owned by AT&T Bell Laboratories, that Jan LeCun invented the convolutional neural network, trained by backpropagation, which is exactly what's driving today's self-driving cars. 55 And as it happens, I myself learned to drive on the roads of Monmouth County, New Jersey, regularly passing by that very building on my way to and from cross-country practice. I wish I could say I was as safe and trustworthy behind the wheel, driving that very same road, after having seen 17 years of human driving, as the convolutional net was. After 72 hours. The cliff's edge, possibilism versus actualism. One must perform the lower act, which one can manage and sustain, not the higher act, which one bungles. We must not arrogate to ourselves actions, which belong to those whose spiritual vision is higher or other than ours. Iris Murdoch, 56. What would you do if you were me? She said. If I were you, or if I were you me? If you were me. If I were you, he said, I'd do exactly what you're doing. Robert Hass, 57. Setting aside the question of recovering from small mistakes, the second problem with imitation, as a learning strategy, is that sometimes you simply can't do what the expert can do. Imitation, then, would only mean starting something you can't finish. In which case, you probably shouldn't attempt to act like them at all. Both real life and pop culture are strewn with examples of the novice attempting to simply mimic the expert, often with catastrophic results. As chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov explains, players, even club amateurs, dedicate hours to studying and memorizing the lines of their preferred openings. This knowledge is invaluable, but it can also be a trap. Rote memorization, however prodigious, is useless without understanding. At some point, he'll reach the end of his memory's rope and be without a pre-made fix in a position he doesn't really understand. Kasparov recalls coaching a 12-year-old player, running through the opening moves of one of the students' games. Kasparov asked him why he'd made a particularly sharp and dangerous move in a complicated opening sequence. That's what Vallejo played, replied the student. Of course, I also knew that the Spanish grandmaster had employed this move in a recent game, Kasparov says, but I also knew that if this youngster didn't understand the motive behind the move, he was already headed for trouble. 58 This idea seems both intuitive and at some level paradoxical. Doing what a better person would do may sometimes be a grave mistake. It is a surprisingly complicated story, and one with deep connections across ethics, economics, and machine learning alike. In 1976, a particular question erupted to the forefront of ethical philosophy: to what degree do, or should, your own future actions influence the question of what the right thing is to do now? Philosopher Holly Smith was at the University of Michigan, focused on working through the subtleties of what it means to be a utilitarian. She noticed something strange. The question very naturally arises: if you're a utilitarian, if I do now, is that going to produce the best possible consequences? Well, it's just transparent, she says, that it's going to depend on what I do next. 59 The need to take your own future actions into account means you also need to consider your own future mistakes. And so Smith began writing about what she would call moral imperfection. 60 The thought experiment that she considered has come to be known as that of Professor Procrastinate. 61 The premise is straightforward. Professor Procrastinate is both a professor and, you guessed it, an inveterate procrastinator. He is asked to read a student's paper and offer feedback, which he is uniquely qualified to provide. But what would surely happen instead, should he agree, is that he'll fritter the time away and never get the feedback to the student. This will be worse than simply declining, in which case the student could ask for slightly less high quality feedback from someone else. Should he accept? Here diverge two different schools of moral thought: possibilism, the view that one should do the best possible thing in every situation, versus actualism, the view that one should do the best thing at the moment. given what will actually happen later, whether because of your own later deeds, or some other reason. Point 62. Possibilism says that the best possible thing for procrastinate to do is to accept the review and write it on time. This begins with accepting it, and so he should accept. Actualism takes a more pragmatic view. By its lights, accepting the review inevitably results in a bad outcome, no review at all. Declining the review means a comparatively better outcome, a review by a slightly less well-qualified reviewer. The professor should do the thing that actually results in the best outcome, hence he should say no. Smith was led to the conclusion that one must sometimes choose the lower rather than the higher act. She elaborates, there seems little point in prescribing an act which puts the agent in a position to do great things if the same act also puts him in a position to do something disastrous, and he would choose the latter rather than the former. At the same time, Smith is quick to elaborate on the drawbacks of actualism. For one thing, she says, actualism gives you an excuse for bad action based on your own future moral defects. Some 40 years later, the theoretical debate simmers on. I think many people will see it as still unresolved, Smith says. I think it's fair to say it's still a lively discussion. 63. The discussion isn't only theoretical, either. Among the 21st century, effective altruism movement, for instance, opinions vary about how much of a sacrifice someone ought to make in order to maximally help others. Point 64. Princeton philosopher Peter Singer famously said that neglecting to donate to charity was analogous to walking past a pond in which a child was drowning and doing nothing to help. Point 65. Even for those who more or less agree with this argument, there is some debate over how much to actually give. A perfect person, perhaps, could donate almost all of their money to charity while staying happy and upbeat and motivated and inspiring to others. But even the devoted members of the EA movement, including Singer himself, are not such perfect people. Julia Wise, a leader in the effective altruism community and the community liaison at the Center for Effective Altruism, has made impressive commitments in her own life, giving 50% of her income to charity, for instance, but she emphasizes the value of not striving for perfection. Give yourself permission to go partway, she says. Point 66. She noticed, for instance, that her own commitment to veganism could not accommodate her deep love of ice cream, and so she felt she couldn't be a vegan. What worked for her was becoming comfortable with the idea of being a vegan who eats ice cream. That was something she could stick with. Oxford philosopher Will MacAskill, co-founder of the Center for Effective Altruism, doesn't mince words on the question. We should be actualists, he says. If you give away all of your savings at once today, which you could technically do, you'll probably get so frustrated that you'll simply stop giving in the future. Whereas if you decide to give 10% of your earnings, this commitment will be sustainable enough that you'll continue doing it over many years in the future, resulting in a higher overall impact. 67. Singer himself acknowledges that a sense of balance and proportion is presumably best over the long term. If you find yourself doing something that makes you bitter, it is time to reconsider. Is it possible for you to become more positive about it? If not, is it really for the best, all things considered? He points out, too, that there are still relatively few effective altruists, so it is important that they set an example that attracts others to this way of living. 68. Machine learning has its own version of the actualism or possibilism debate. One of the primary families of algorithms for reinforcement learning, as we discussed in Chapter 4, are methods that learn the value, expressed as the expected future rewards, of the various actions available to them. This is referred to as the Q value, short for quality. For instance, a board game agent would learn to predict its chance of winning upon making various moves, and an Atari-playing agent would learn to estimate the number of points it expects each action to lead to. With these predictions well tuned, it then becomes straightforward to simply take the action with the highest Q value. Here, though, there is an ambiguity worth unpacking. Should the Q value contain the expected future rewards that you could earn from taking this action? Or the expected rewards that you would earn? For a totally perfect agent, there is no tension, but otherwise the prescriptions can vary sharply. These two approaches to value learning are called on-policy and off-policy methods. On-policy methods learn the value of each action, based on the rewards the agent will actually expect to get after taking that action, and continuing to take actions according to its own policy. An off-policy agent, on the other hand, will learn the value of each action based on the best possible series of actions that could follow it. Point 69. In their seminal textbook on reinforcement learning, Richard Sutton and Andrew Bartow talk about how an off-policy possibilist agent could get itself into trouble, precisely by always trying to do the best thing possible. Imagine a car, they say, that needs to drive itself from one spot along the edge of a seaside cliff to another. The shortest and most efficient path is just to follow the edge of the cliff. Indeed, provided the car is stable and steady enough, that is the best route to take. But for a self-driving car that's slightly shaky or unsteady behind the wheel, this is flirting with disaster. The better move might be to take a more roundabout inland path, one that doesn't require it to drive perfectly to succeed. This is actualism, and a car trained using on-policy methods would indeed learn to take the safer, surer route over the one with slightly higher reward, but much higher risk. Point 70. Imitating one's heroes or mentors, whether the imitator is human or machine, brings with it some of the dangers of possibilism, of off-policy valuation. Point 71. In a chess context, learning the best move to play given grandmaster level ability to handle its consequences may serve only to let the student bite off more than they can chew. In that case, studiously watching the expert play may simply not help, or worse. It's one thing to know that in a particular chess position, say, sacrificing my queen leads to checkmate in 10 moves. But if I can't find the checkmate, I will have sacrificed my queen for nothing, and will almost certainly lose the game as a result. Economists, since the mid-20th century, have discussed the theory of the second best, which argues, in effect, that knowing the right thing to do in a theoretical version of the economy, which obeys a number of mathematical assumptions, may have virtually no bearing in an economy that deviates from those assumptions even slightly. The second best policy to follow, or action to take, may have virtually no resemblance to the best. Point 72. OpenAI research scientist Amanda Askell, who works on ethics and policy, notes that the same line of argument likely applies equally well in her domain. I think something similar could be said in ethics, she says. Even if the ideal agent follows moral theory X perfectly, the non-ideal agent uses a pretty different set of decision procedures. 73 cases like this should give any would-be imitator or role model pause. Imitation is at some level intrinsically possibilist, liable to bite off more than it can chew. It may be cute when our child mimes driving the car, or chopping vegetables, or performing veterinary medicine, but we intervene if we see them actually reach for the keys or knife, or maybe even the cat. The behavior we actually want to see may bear no resemblance to imitation. The next best thing to competent driving is getting into the passenger seat, to chiffonading herbs, setting the table, and to setting a broken paw, maybe just calling for mom and dad. With machine imitators, too, we would do well to keep the theory of the second best in mind. If they are to learn from us, we must take care that they don't inadvertently learn to initiate behaviors they can't handle once begun. Once they are expert enough, the issue may become moot. But until then, imitation may be a curse, and, in the words of user interface designer Bruce Ballantyne, it's better to be a good machine than a bad person. 74. Amplification, self-imitation, and transcendence. My favorite player from the past is probably myself, like 3 or 4 years ago. World chess champion Magnus Carlsen, 75. A third fundamental challenge with imitation is that if one's primary objective is to imitate the teacher, it will be hard to surpass them. This was on the mind of one of the very first researchers in machine learning, in fact, the one who coined the term, IBM's Arthur Samuel, who in 1959, as we briefly discussed earlier, developed a machine learning system for playing checkers. I fed into it a number of principles that I knew had something to do with the game, he said, though I didn't know then, and don't know now, precisely what their significance is. The list included things like how many checkers you have, how many kings you have, how many moves are possible from your position, and so forth. 76. The program ended up capable of beating Samuel himself, despite using only the strategic considerations that Samuel had given it. Its unerring ability to look a number of moves ahead, combined with a trial and error fine-tuning of the relative importance to place on these various factors, led to a system that surpassed its own teacher. It was a sublime achievement for its time, one that, again as we discussed, single-handedly shot IBM's stock price up overnight, and one of which Samuel was justifiably proud. But he nonetheless felt keenly aware that his project had hit a ceiling. The computer now works according to my principles of checkers and does a fine job of shuffling these around to its best advantage, he lamented, but the only way to get it to play better checkers is to give it a better set of principles. But how? At the moment, I'm the only man in the world who could teach the machine to play any better, and it's already way out of my class. The more principled path forward, Samuel reasoned, was for the computer itself to somehow generate strategic considerations on its own. If only the computer could generate its own terms. But I see little hope of that in the immediate future, he said. 77. Unfortunately, no satisfactory scheme for doing this has yet been devised. 78. By the end of the 20th century, the fundamental techniques for computer game playing had changed surprisingly little, as had their fundamental limitations. The machines were millions of times faster. Reinforcement learning had become a field unto itself. But the machines had not changed very much at all, it seemed, in their stubborn dependence on us. By the 1990s, the IBM team working on chess supercomputer Deep Blue had created a value function, much like the one Samuel had made for checkers some decades earlier. Working with human grandmasters, they attempted to enumerate and articulate all the factors that determine strength of a position, things like the number of pieces on each side, mobility, and space, king safety, pawn structure, and on and on. Instead of using 38 such considerations, however, as Samuel had, they used 8,000. 79. This chess evaluation function, said team lead Fengsung HSU, probably is more complicated than anything ever described in the computer chess literature. 80. The critical question, of course, was how to somehow weight and combine those bewildering thousands of considerations into a single judgment of the quality of the position on the board. Exactly how many extra pawns were worth how much control of the center, or how much king safety. Getting the balance right would be crucial. So how exactly were those thousands of considerations brought into balance? By imitation. The Deep Blue team had access to a database of 700,000 Grandmaster games. They showed the computer position after position from these real games and asked it what move it would have played. Imitating the human moves became a target as they fine-tuned its value function. If, say, increasing the value Deep Blue assigned to possessing both bishops made it slightly more likely to play the same moves that the human grandmasters had played, then Deep Blue came to increase its value for the bishop pair. This human-imitating combination of positional considerations, which were themselves derived from human experts, was married to the computer's unerring calculation, blistering speed, and brute force. The machine was able to search through hundreds of millions of future board positions per second, and that, combined with its human-like evaluation, was enough to defeat human chess world champion Garry Kasparov in their storied 1997 match. Gary prepared to play against a computer, said Deep Blue's project manager C.J. Tan. But we programmed it to play like a grandmaster. 81. From a philosophical perspective, some within the research community wondered if programs were ultimately being hindered, however, by this continued dependence on their human role models. In the world of computer checkers, the University of Alberta's Jonathan Schaefer had developed a program in the early 1990s that was so good that when it picked a move that differed from human grandmaster play, often its own idea was better. Of course, we could continue to improve the evaluation function so that it consistently plays the human moves, he wrote. But it isn't obvious that this is a good thing to do. For one thing, tuning the program to play more conventionally might negate its ability to surprise a human opponent. For another thing, it wasn't clear that the methodology of imitation was useful once the program had reached the level of the best human players. We found it difficult to progress any further. Schaefer admitted. 82. His project was essentially stuck. A question hung over the field. As the 2001 volume Machines That Learn to Play Games put it, reflecting on Deep Blue's success, one important direction of future research is to establish the extent to which better imitating human expert moves corresponds to genuinely stronger play. 83. 15 years later, DeepMind's AlphaGo system finally realized Arthur Samuel's vision of a system that could concoct its own positional considerations from scratch. Instead of being given a big pile of thousands of handcrafted features to consider, it used a deep neural network to automatically identify patterns and relationships that make particular moves attractive, the same way AlexNet had identified the visual textures and shapes that make a dog and a car. The system was trained as Deep Blue had been. By learning to predict the moves made by expert human Go players in a giant, 30 million move database. 84, it was able to get state-of-the-art prediction of human expert moves, 57% accuracy to be precise, smashing the previous state-of-the-art result of 44%. In October 2015, AlphaGo became the first computer program to defeat a human professional Go player, in this case, the 3-time European champion Fan Hui. Just 7 months later, in March 2016, it defeated the 18-time international title holder and one of the strongest players of all time, Lee Sedol. Once again, the computer that had transcended human play was. Nonetheless, ironically, an imitator at heart. 85, it was not learning to play the best moves. It was learning to play the human moves. The successes of Deep Blue and AlphaGo alike were possible only because of mammoth databases of human examples from which the machines could learn. These flagship successes of machine learning created such worldwide shockwaves, as they did because of the global popularity of those games. And it was the very popularity of those games that enabled those victories. Every move we'd ever made could and would be used against us. The computers wouldn't have been nearly as impressive at playing a more obscure or unpopular game, because they wouldn't have had enough examples to work from. Popularity thus served a double role. It had made the accomplishment significant. But it had also made it possible. No sooner had AlphaGo reached the pinnacle of the game of Go, however, than it was, in 2017, summarily dethroned by an even stronger program called AlphaGo 0.86. The biggest difference between the original AlphaGo and AlphaGo 0 was in how much human data the latter had been fed to imitate. 0. From a completely random initialization, tabula rasa, it simply learned by playing against itself, again and again and again and again. Incredibly, after just 36 hours of self-play, it was as good as the original AlphaGo, which had beaten Lee Sedol. After 72 hours, the DeepMind team set up a match between the two, using the exact same 2-hour time controls and the exact version of the original AlphaGo system that had beaten Lee. AlphaGo 0, which consumed a tenth of the power of the original system, and which 72 hours earlier had never played a single game, won the 100-game series, 100 games to 0. As the DeepMind research team wrote in their accompanying Nature paper, humankind has accumulated Go knowledge from millions of games played over thousands of years, collectively distilled into patterns, proverbs and books. 87 AlphaGo 0 discovered it all and more in 72 hours. But there was something very interesting, and very instructive, going on under the hood. The system had not been shown a single human game to learn from. But it was, nonetheless, learning by imitation. It was learning to imitate itself. The self-imitation worked as follows: expert human play in games like Go and chess is a matter of thinking fast and slow. 88 There is a conscious, deliberate reasoning that looks at sequences of moves and says, okay, if I go here, then they go there, but then I go here and I win. In AlphaGo 0, the explicit slow reasoning by thinking ahead, move by move, if this, then that, is done by an algorithm called Monte Carlo tree search. MCTS, for short. 89 And this slow, explicit reasoning is intimately married to a fast, ineffable intuition, in two different, but related respects. The first bit of fast thinking is that, prior to and separate from any explicit reasoning of this form, we have an intuitive sense of how good a particular position is. This is the value function, or evaluation function, we've been discussing. In AlphaGo 0, this comes from a neural network called the value network, which outputs a percentage from 0 to 100 of how likely AlphaGo 0 thinks it is to win from that position. The second bit of implicit, fast reasoning is that when we look at the board there are some moves we consider playing, some moves just suggest themselves, and many others simply do not. We deploy our slow, deliberate, if this, then that reasoning down the paths that our intuition has first identified as plausible or promising. This is where AlphaGo 0 gets interesting. These candidate moves come from a neural network called the policy network, which takes in the current board position as input and assigns a percentage from 0 to 100 to each possible move. What does this number represent? The system is making a bet on the move that it will, itself, ultimately decide to play. This is quite a strange and almost paradoxical idea, and merits a bit of further elaboration. The policy network represents AlphaGo 0's guess, for each possible move, of how likely it will be to choose that move after doing an explicit MCTS search, to look ahead from that position. The slightly surreal aspect is that the system uses these probabilities to focus the slow MCTS search along the series of moves it thinks are most likely. 90 AlphaGo 0 becomes its own teacher, DeepMind's David Silver explains. It improves its neural network to predict the moves which AlphaGo 0 itself played. 91 Given that the system uses these predictions to guide the very search whose outcome they are predicting, this might sound like the recipe for a self-fulfilling prophecy. In reality, each system, fast and slow, sharpens the other. As the policy network's fast predictions improve, the slow MCTS algorithm uses them to search more narrowly and wisely through possible future lines of play. As a result of this more refined search, AlphaGo 0 becomes a stronger player. The policy network then adjusts to predict these new, slightly stronger moves, which, in turn, allows the system to use its slow reason even more judiciously. It's a virtuous circle. This process is known in the technical community as amplification, but it could just as easily be called something like transcendence. AlphaGo 0 learned only to imitate itself. It used its predictions to make better decisions, and then learned to predict those better decisions in turn. It began by making random predictions and random moves. 72 hours later, it was the strongest Go player the world had ever seen. Amplifying values. You should consider that imitation is the most acceptable part of worship, and that the gods had much rather mankind should resemble than flatter them. Marcus Aurelius 92. For a growing number of philosophers and computer scientists concerned with the longer-term future, the prospect of flexibly intelligent and flexibly capable systems, into which we must impart extremely complex behaviors and values, raises not only technical problems, but something much deeper. There are two primary challenges here. The first is that the things we want are very difficult to simply state outright, even in words, let alone in a more numerical form. As the Future of Humanity Institute's Nick Bostrom notes, it seems completely impossible to write down a list of everything we care about. 93 in this case, we have already seen how learning by imitation can succeed in domains where it is effectively impossible to explicitly impart every rule and consideration and degree of emphasis for what makes someone an expert driver or an expert Go player. Simply saying, in effect, watch and learn is often impressively successful. It may well be the case that as autonomous systems become more powerful and more general, to the point that we seek to impart some sense of what it means not just to drive well and play well but to live well, as individuals and societies, we can still turn to something not unlike this. The second, deeper challenge is that both traditional reward-based reinforcement learning and imitation learning techniques require humans to act as sources of ultimate authority. Imitation learning systems, as we've seen, can surpass their teachers, but only if the teachers' imperfect demonstrations are imperfect in ways that largely cancel out, or only if experts, who cannot demonstrate what they want, can at least recognize it. Each of these fronts offers a challenge as we look to the more distant future, to more powerful systems acting in more subtle and sophisticated real-world settings. Some, for instance, worry that humans aren't a particularly good source of moral authority. We've talked a lot about the problem of infusing human values into machines, says Google's Blaise Aguirre-Arcas. I actually don't think that that's the main problem. I think that the problem is that human values as they stand don't cut it. They're not good enough. 94 Eliezer Yudkowsky, co-founder of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, wrote an influential 2004 manuscript in which he argues for imbuing machines not simply to imitate and uphold our norms as we imperfectly embody them, but rather, we should instill in machines what he calls our coherent extrapolated volition. In poetic terms, he writes, our coherent extrapolated volition is our wish if we knew more, thought faster, were more the people we wished we were. 95 In domains where there is a relatively clear external metric of success, in checkers or Go or Montezuma's Revenge, machines can simply use imitation as a starting point for more traditional reinforcement learning techniques, honing that initial imitative behavior by trial and error, and potentially eclipsing their own teachers. In the moral domain, however, it is less clear how to extend imitation, because no such external metric exists. Point 96. What's more, if the systems we attempt to teach are someday potentially more intelligent than we are, they may take actions we find hard to even evaluate. If a future system proposes, say, a reform of clinical trial regulations, we may not necessarily even be in a position to assess, after great deliberation, let alone in a tight iterative feedback loop, whether it does, in fact, conform to our sense of ethics or norms. So, again, how can we continue to train a system in our own image, once its behavior goes beyond our immediate ken? Few have thought as deeply about this set of issues as OpenAI's Paul Cristiano. I am very interested in really asking what solutions would look like, as you scale them up, he says. What is our actual game plan? What is the actual endgame here? That's a question that relatively few people are interested in, and so very few people are working on. 97 What Cristiano realized, as early as 2012 and in research that continues to this day, is that we may, even in these most difficult of scenarios, be able to ratchet our way forward. 98 We saw, for instance, that AlphaZero has instant, fast-thinking judgments about the moves to consider, but uses slow-thinking Monte Carlo tree search to comb through millions of future board positions to confirm or correct those hunches. The results of this slow thinking are then used to sharpen and improve its fast instincts. It learns to predict the outcomes of its own deliberation. 99 Perhaps, Cristiano believes, this very same schema, what he calls iterated distillation and amplification, can be used to develop systems with complicated judgment, beyond and yet aligned with our own. For example, imagine we are trying to lay out a new subway system for a big city. Unlike Atari, say, or Go, we can't evaluate thousands of scenarios per second. In fact, a single evaluation could take months. And unlike Atari or Go, there is no external objective measure to appeal to. A good subway system is whatever people think it is. We could train a machine learning system up to a certain level of competence, by normal imitation learning, say, and then, from that point forward, we could use it to help evaluate plans, not unlike a senior urban planner with a staff of a handful of more junior urban planners. We might ask one copy of our system to give us an assessment of expected wait times. We might ask another to give us an estimated budget. A third we might ask for a report about accessibility. We, as the boss, would make the final determination, amplifying the work of our machine subordinates. Those subordinates, in turn, would distill whatever lessons they could from our final decision and become slightly better urban planners as a result, faster working in some than we ourselves, but modeled in our own image. We then iterate, by delegating the next project to this new, slightly improved version of our team, and the virtuous circle continues. Eventually, believes Cristiano, we would find that our team, in sum, was the urban planner we wish we could be, the planner we could be if we knew more, thought faster, were more the planner we wished we were. There is work to be done. Cristiano would like to find ways of doing amplification and distillation that will provably maintain alignment with the human user. For now, whether this is even possible remains an open question and a hope. Small, preliminary experiments are underway. If we can realize this hope, Cristiano and his OpenAI collaborators write, it will be an important step towards expanding the reach of ML and addressing concerns about the long-term impacts of AI. 100 Discussing his work on amplification, I asked Cristiano, who has become a leading figure in the alignment research community, if he views himself as a role model of sorts for others interested in following a similar path. His answer surprises me. Hopefully it's not a path people have to be following, he says. 101 Cristiano elaborates that he was perhaps one of the last alignment researchers who first had to live a kind of double life before being able to work in AI safety directly, working on more conventional problems to get his academic credentials, while figuring out a way to do the work he felt was truly important. I sort of had to go off on my own and think about shit for a long time, he says. It is easier to do academic work in the context of an academic community. Only a handful of years later, that community exists. 102, so hopefully most people would be more in that situation, he says. There are a bunch of people thinking about these things. They can actually get a job, to just be doing what they care about. That's the thing, perhaps, about being a trailblazer. It's not so much that others will imitate your example to the letter, or follow directly in your Footsteps as that, because of your efforts, they won't have to. 8. Inference. University of Michigan psychologist Felix Warneken walks across the room, carrying a tall stack of magazines, toward the doors of a closed wooden cabinet. He bumps into the front of the cabinet, exclaims a startled "oh," and backs away. Staring for a moment at the cabinet, he makes a thoughtful hum, before shuffling forward and bumping the magazines against the cabinet doors again. Again he backs away, defeated, and says, pitiably, hum. It's as if he can't figure out where he's gone wrong. From the corner of the room, a toddler comes to the rescue. The child walks somewhat unsteadily toward the cabinet, heaves open the doors one by one, then looks up at Warneken with a searching expression before backing away. Warneken, making a grateful sound, puts his pile of magazines on the shelf. Point 1. Warneken, along with his collaborator Michael Tomasello of Duke, was the first to systematically show, in 2006, that human infants as young as 18 months old will reliably identify a fellow human facing a problem. Will identify the human's goal and the obstacle in the way, and will spontaneously help if they can, even if their help is not requested, even if the adult doesn't so much as make eye contact with them, and even when they expect, and receive, no reward for doing so. Point 2. This is a remarkably sophisticated capacity, and almost uniquely human. Our nearest genetic ancestors, chimpanzees, will spontaneously offer help on occasion, but only if their attention has been called to the situation at hand, only if someone is obviously reaching toward an object that is beyond their grasp, and not in more complex situations, like with the cabinet. 3. Only if the one in need was a human rather than a fellow chimpanzee. They are remarkably competitive with one another, only if the desired object is not food, and only after lingering in possession of the sought-after object for a few seconds, as if deciding whether or not to actually hand it over. For what Warneken and Tomasello showed is that such helping behavior is extremely rare evolutionarily, and far more pronounced in humans than in our closest cousins, emerging quite richly before even language. As Tomasello puts it, the crucial difference between human cognition and that of other species is the ability to participate with others in collaborative activities with shared goals and intentions. 5. Children are described as being initially selfish, only caring about their own needs, and it is upon society to somehow reprogram them into becoming altruistic, says Warneken. Point 6. However, our research has shown that infants in the second year of life are already cooperative by helping others with their problems, working together, and sharing resources with them. 7. This requires not only the motivation to help, but an incredibly sophisticated cognitive process, inferring the other person's goals, often from just a small bit of behavior. Human beings are the world's experts at mind reading, says Tomasello. Perhaps the most impressive part of this expertise is our ability to infer others' beliefs, but the foundation is inferring their intentions. Indeed, it is not until around age 4 that a child begins to know what others think. But by their first birthday, they are already coming to know what others want. Point 8. Researchers are increasingly making the argument that our approach to instilling human values in machines should take the same tack. Perhaps, rather than painstakingly trying to hand-code the things we care about, we should develop machines that simply observe human behavior and infer our values and desires from that. Richard Feynman famously described the universe as a great chess game being played by the gods. We do not know what the rules of the game are. All we are allowed to do is to watch the playing. The technical term for this in AI is inverse reinforcement learning, except we are the gods, and it is machines that must observe us and try to divine the rules by which we move. Inverse reinforcement learning. In 1997, UC Berkeley's Stuart Russell was walking to the grocery store when his mind wandered to the question of why we walk the way we walk. We move in a very stereotyped kind of way, right? So if you watch the Ministry of Silly Walk sketch from Monty Python, you see that there are a lot of other ways you can walk besides the normal one, right? But we all walk pretty much the same way. 9. It can't be simply a matter of imitation. At least it doesn't seem likely to be. There's not only very little interpersonal variation in the basic human gait, there's also very little difference across cultures, and as far as we can tell, across time. It's not just, well, that's the way they were taught, Russell says. That's the way that works, somehow. And yet this raises as many questions as it answers. What do you mean works, right? What is the objective function? People proposed objectives, like I think I'm minimizing energy, or I'm minimizing torque, 10, or I'm minimizing jerk, 11, or I'm minimizing this, or I'm minimizing that, or I'm maximizing this other, and none of them produce realistic-looking motion. This is used in animation a lot, right? Trying to synthesize someone who walks and runs, who doesn't look like a robot. And they all fail. And that's why we use motion capture for all that stuff. Indeed, the entire field of biomechanics exists to answer questions like this. Researchers had long been interested, for example, in the various distinct gaits of four-legged animals, walk, trot, canter, gallop. It took the invention of the high-speed photograph in the late 19th century to settle the question of how exactly these different gaits worked, which legs were raised at which time, and in particular, whether a horse at a gallop is ever fully airborne. In 1877, we learned that it is. Then, in the 20th century, the debate moved from the how to the why. In 1981, the Harvard zoologist Charles Richard Taylor published a major paper in Nature showing that a horse's transition from a trot to a gallop occurred in such a way as to minimize the total energy the horse was expending. 12 10 years later, he published a major follow-up paper in Science saying no, after further evidence, the switch to the gallop is not about minimizing energy, but, rather, appears to be about minimizing stress on the horse's joints. 13 Such were the thoughts on Russell's mind as he walked to the grocery store. I was walking down the hill from my house to Safeway, Russell tells me. And I was noticing that, because this was a downslope, your gait is slightly different than it is on the flat. And I was thinking, I wonder how I would be able to predict the difference in gait. Say I put a cockroach on a sloping. He gestures with his hand. How would the cockroach walk, right? Could I predict that? If I knew the objective, I could predict what the cockroach would do when I tipped the thing. By the late 1990s, reinforcement learning had already emerged as a powerful computational technique for generating sensible behavior in various, and in those days, rather simple, physical and virtual environments. It was also becoming clear through studies of the dopamine system, as well as foraging behavior in bees, that reinforcement learning could offer a strikingly apt framework for understanding human and animal behavior. 14. There was just one problem. Typical reinforcement learning scenarios assumed that it was totally clear what the rewards were that one was trying to maximize, be it food or sugar water in an animal behavior experiment, or the score of a video game in an AI lab. In the real world, the source of this reward was much less obvious. What was the score, as it were, for walking? So, Russell wondered, walking down the wooded boulevard known as the Uplands in Berkeley, if the human gait was the answer, and reinforcement learning was the method by which the body had found it, then, what was the question? Russell wrote a 1998 paper that served as something of a call to action. What the field needed, he argued, was what he called inverse reinforcement learning. Rather than asking, as regular reinforcement learning does, given a reward signal, what behavior will optimize it, inverse reinforcement learning, or IRL asks the reverse, given the observed behavior, what reward signal, if any, is being optimized. 15. This is, of course, in more informal terms, one of the foundational questions of human life. What exactly do they think they're doing? We spend a good fraction of our life's brainpower answering questions like this. We watch the behavior of others around us, friend and foe, superior and subordinate, collaborator and competitor, and try to read through their visible actions to their invisible intentions and goals. It is in some ways the cornerstone of human cognition. It also turns out to be one of the seminal and critical projects in 21st century AI. And it may well hold the key to the alignment problem. Learning from demonstrations. For anyone who has ever struggled to divine the meaning or intention behind another's actions, are they the person? Are they upset at me for some reason, or just in a bad mood? Were they trying to do what they did? Or was that simply an accident? It can sometimes feel that there are literally infinite number of things that any action can mean. Computer science here offers consolation, but not cure. There are literally infinite number of things that any action can mean. In that theoretical sense, the problem is hopeless. Practically, the story is a bit happier. Inverse reinforcement learning is, famously, what mathematicians call an ill-posed problem, namely, one that doesn't have a single, unique right answer. There are huge families of reward functions, for instance, that are totally indistinguishable from the standpoint of behavior. On the other hand, by and large this ambiguity won't matter, precisely because of the fact that one's behavior won't change as a result. For instance, the sport of boxing happens to use a 10-point must-scoring system, where the winner of a round receives 10 points and the loser receives 9 points. If an apprentice boxer came to the mistaken conclusion that rounds were scored 10 million points to 9 million points, or 10 millionths of a point to 9 millionths of a point, or 11 points to 10, he would still know that the person with the higher total wins, and his boxing would be no different than that of someone who understood the correct scoring system. So the error is unavoidable, but also moot. Point 16. Another, thornier question arises, however, what leads us to assume that the person's actions mean anything at all? What if they aren't trying to do anything whatsoever, and their actions reflect random behavior, nothing more? In the first paper posing practical solutions to the IRL problem, Russell and his then PhD student Andrew considered some simple examples in order to show that the idea could work. Point 17. They considered a tiny 5x5 grid in which the goal is to move the player to a particular goal square, and a video game world in which the goal is to drive a car the top of a hill. Could an IRL system infer these goals simply by watching an expert, be it human or machine, playing the game? Ng and Russell built a few simplifying assumptions into their IRL system. It assumed that the player never acted randomly and never made mistakes, that when it took an action, that action was, in fact, the best action possible. It also assumed that the rewards motivating the agent were simple, in the sense that any action, or state that could be considered to be worth 0 points, should be considered to be worth 0 points. Point 18. Further, it made the assumption that when the player took an action, not only was that action the best thing to do, but any other action would be a mistake. This ruled out the possibility, for instance, of a game having multiple competing objectives, with a player choosing between them at random. The assumptions were fairly strong, and the domains were too simple to be of any immediate practical use. They were a far cry from the complexity of the human gait, but IRL did work. The rewards inferred by the IRL system looked very similar to the real rewards. When Ng and Russell let the IRL system play the games by trying to maximize what it thought the rewards were, it got just as high a score, measured by the real points, as a system optimized for the real points directly. By 2004, Andrew Ng had received his doctorate, and was teaching at Stanford, advising his own then PhD student Peter Abiel. They took another pass at the IRL problem, trying to increase the complexity of the environments and relax some of the inferential assumptions. Point 19. As they imagine, whatever task we're observing has various features that are relevant to that task. If we're watching someone drive, for instance, we might consider the relevant features to be things like which lane the car is in, how fast it's going, the following distance between itself and the car ahead of it, and so on. They developed an IRL algorithm that assumes that it will see the same pattern of these features when it drives for itself as it did in the demonstrations it observed. A very stripped-down, Atari-esque driving simulator showed promising results, with a computational apprentice driving in the game much like Abiel did, avoiding collisions, overtaking slower cars, and otherwise keeping to the right-hand lane. This was significantly different from the strict imitation approach we discussed in Chapter 7. After just 1 minute of demonstrated driving by Abiel, a model trying to mimic his behavior directly had nowhere near enough information to go on. The road environment is too complex. Abiel's behavior was complicated, but his goals were simple. Within a matter of seconds, the IRL system picked up on the paramount importance of not hitting other cars, followed by not driving off the road, followed by keeping right if possible. This goal structure was much simpler than the driving behavior itself, and easier to learn, and more flexible to apply in novel situations. Rather than directly adopting his actions, the IRL agent was learning to adopt his values. It was time, they decided, to bring IRL into the full-blown messiness of the real world. We saw in Chapter 5 how Ng had used the idea of reward shaping to teach an autonomous helicopter to hover in place and slowly fly stable paths, a feat that no computer-controlled system had been able to achieve. It was a major milestone, both in Ng's career and for machine learning as a whole, but progress had stalled. Frankly, we hit a wall, Ng says. There were some things we never could figure out how to get our helicopter to do. 20% of the problem was that both hovering in place and following a fixed path at low speed were things for which traditional reward functions were fairly easy to specify. In the case of hovering, the reward was simply how close the helicopter's velocity in every direction was to zero. In the case of path following, progress along the path was rewarded and deviation penalized. The complexity of the problem wasn't in specifying the goal, but rather in finding a way to teach the system how to use nothing but the torques of the rotor blades and their pitch and angle to actually do those things. And it was here that reinforcement learning had shown its power. But for more complicated maneuvers and stunts, executed at higher speeds and invoking more complex aerodynamics, it was not so obvious how to even make a reward function by which the system could learn its behavior. Sure, you could simply draw a curve in space and tell the computer to try to fly that exact trajectory, but the laws of physics, particularly at high speed, might not allow it. The helicopter might have too much momentum at a given part of the curve, the stresses on the machine might be too great, the engine might not be able to generate enough power at the right time, and so forth. You would be setting the system up for failure, which, for a 10.5 pound helicopter moving at 45 miles per hour, could also be expensive, not to mention dangerous. Our attempts to use such a hand-coded trajectory, the team wrote, failed repeatedly. 21, but what you could do, they reasoned, is have a human expert fly the maneuver and use inverse reinforcement learning to have the system infer the goal the human was trying to achieve. By using this IRL approach, Abiel and Ing, with their collaborator Adam Coates, were able by 2007 to demonstrate the first helicopter forward flip and aileron roll ever performed by a computer. 22, this significantly notched forward the state of the art, and showed that IRL could succeed in conveying even real-world human intentions in cases when seemingly nothing else could. But they were not content to rest on their forward-flipping laurels. What they wanted was to find a way to perform tricks that were so difficult, not even their human demonstrator, expert radio-controlled helicopter pilot Gerrit Oku, could do them perfectly. Abiel, Coates, and Ing wanted to push their helicopter work to its delirious extreme, to make a computer-controlled helicopter capable of doing mind-bending stunts, beyond the ability of a human pilot. They had a critical insight. Even if Oku couldn't perfectly execute a maneuver in its pure, platonic form, as long as his attempts were good enough, then his deviations would at least be imperfect in different ways. From one to the next. A system doing inverse reinforcement learning, rather than strict imitation, could make inferences about what the human pilot, through a collection of imperfect or failed attempts, was trying to do. 23 by 2008. Their inferences from expert demonstrations led to a deluge of breakthroughs, tallying the first successful autonomous demonstrations of continuous in-place flips and rolls, a continuous tail-down tick-tock, loops with pirouettes, stall turns with pirouette, hurricane fast backward funnel, knife edge, Immelman, slapper, sideways tick-tock, traveling flips, inverted tail slide, and even auto-rotation landings. 24 The apex of their ambition was a helicopter maneuver generally regarded as the single most difficult of them all, something called the Chaos, a move so complicated there was only one person alive who could do it. The Chaos was invented by Curtis Youngblood, the model helicopter world champion in 1987, 1993, and 2001, the 3D Masters champion in 2002 and 2004, and the US national champion in 1986, 1987, 1989, 1991, 1993, 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2008, 2010, 2011, and 2012.25 He is considered by many to be the greatest radio-controlled helicopter pilot who has ever lived. I was trying to think at the time, says Youngblood, what was the most complicated controlled maneuver I could come up with. He took what was already one of the most difficult maneuvers, the pirouetting flip, and envisioned doing it over and over while rotating. Asked how many other pilots can consistently pull off the maneuver, Youngblood says none. I at one time could do it. I can't even do it today. Someone asks me to do it. I wouldn't be able to do a full one without practice. Part of the problem, he says, is that the maneuver is so complicated looking that only fellow expert pilots can even appreciate the difficulty of what they're seeing. You're usually show pilots, he says. You're out there trying to impress the crowd. Crowd has no clue what you're doing. So the fact that you do a true chaos, or just a pirouetting flip, they don't know the difference. So it usually pays off to know one to sit there and really learn it, other than to show off to the other top pilots that I can actually do. This, 26 by the summer of 2008, the Stanford helicopter had mastered the chaos, despite never having seen a single perfect demonstration from Oku, Youngblood, or anyone. But the system saw them banging their stacks of magazines, as it were, into the cabinet doors. And then, pirouette flipping again and again and again while rotating 300 degrees at a clip, looking like a one-helicopter hurricane, it flung them open. 27 Meanwhile, different approaches to disambiguating behavior, and more complex ways to represent reward, have continued to extend the inverse reinforcement learning framework. In 2008, then PhD student Brian Zybart and his collaborators at Carnegie Mellon developed a method using ideas from information theory. Instead of assuming that the experts we observe are totally perfect, we can imagine that they are simply more likely to take an action the more reward it brings. We can use this principle, in turn, to find a set of rewards that maximizes the likelihood of our having seen the particular demonstration behavior we saw, while staying as uncertain as possible otherwise. Zybart put this so-called maximum entropy, IRL method, to the test on a dataset of 100,000 miles of driving recorded from 24 real Pittsburgh cab drivers, using it to model their preferences for certain roads over others. The model could reliably guess what route a driver would take to get to a particular destination. Perhaps more impressively, it could also make reasonable guesses about where a driver was trying to go, based on the route they had taken thus far. Zybart notes that this might allow a driver to receive relevant notifications about road closures affecting their intended route, without their ever having to actually tell the system their destination. 28 Over the past decade, there has been a surge of work in robotics using what's known as kinesthetic teaching, where a human manually moves a robot arm in order to accomplish some task, and the robotic system must infer the relevant goal in order to freely reproduce that similar environment on its own. 29 In 2016, then PhD student Chelsea Finn and her collaborators at Berkeley further extended maximum entropy IRL by using neural networks to allow the reward function to be arbitrarily complex and remove the need for its component features to be manually specified in advance. 30 Their robot, after 20 or 30 demonstrations, could do such human-like and impossible to directly numerically specify things as filling a dish rack with dishes without chipping them and pouring a cup of almonds into another cup without spilling any. We are now, it is fair to say, well beyond the point where our machines can do only that which we can program into them in the explicit language of math and code. Knowing it when we see it. Learning from feedback. Inverse reinforcement learning has proven itself as a striking and powerful method to impute complex goals into a system in ways that would simply not be feasible, or even possible, if we had to program the reward explicitly by hand. The only problem, though, is that the typical formulation requires an expert on hand who can give a demonstration, even if imperfect, of the desired behavior. The helicopter stunts required a competent pilot, the taxis required a driver, likewise, the dishes and almonds needed a human demonstrator. Was there another way? There are a great many things in life that are very difficult to perform, but comparatively easy to evaluate. I may be such a terrible radio-controlled helicopter pilot that I can't even keep the machine aloft, and yet I can, with the possible exception of the chaos, recognize an impressive display of aerial acrobatics when I see one. As Youngblood notes, impressing a lay audience is more or less the point. Were it possible for a system to infer an explicit reward function, just from my feedback, my rating a demonstration of its behavior with a certain score, or my preference between, say, two different demonstrations, then we would have a powerful and even more general way to evince the things we want from machines. We would still have a means for alignment, that is, even when we can't say what we want, and even when we can't do what we want. In a perfect world, simply knowing it when we see it would be enough. It's a powerful idea. There are only two questions. Is it actually possible? And is it safe? In 2012, Jan Laker was finishing his master's degree in Freiburg, Germany, working on software verification, developing tools to automatically analyze certain types of programs and determine whether they would execute successfully or not. 31 That was around the time I realized that I really liked doing research, he says, and that was going well, but I also, really wasn't clear what I was going to do with my life. 32 Then he started reading about the idea of AI safety, through Nick Bostrom and Milan Serkovich's book Global Catastrophic Risks, some discussions on the internet forum Less Wrong, and a couple papers by Eliezer Yudkowsky. I was like, very few people seem to be working on this. Maybe that's something I should do research in. It sounds super interesting, and there's not much done. Laker reached out to the computer scientist Marcus Hutter at Australian National University to ask for some career advice. I just randomly emailed him out of the blue, telling him, I want to do a PhD in AI safety. Can you give me some advice on where to go? And then I attached some work I'd done, or something, so he would hopefully bother to answer my email. Hutter wrote back almost instantly. You should come here, he wrote, but the application deadline is in 3 days. Laker laughs. And you have to consider, none of my diplomas or anything were in English. I hadn't done an English language test. I had to do all of that in 3 days. Also, Laker had to write a research proposal from scratch. Also, he happened to be on vacation that week. I did not sleep much these 3 days, as you might imagine. Laker emphasizes, by the way, this is really terrible advice on how to pick your PhD. I basically did almost no research, emailed one person out of the blue, and then decided that I would apply there. This is not how you should apply for PhD programs, obviously. By the end of the year, Laker had resettled in Canberra, and he and Hutter were off to work. He finished his doctorate in late 2015, studying Hutter's AIXI framework, which we briefly touched on in Chapter 6, and documenting situations in which such an agent is liable to, as Laker put it, misbehave drastically. 33 With his doctorate in hand, he prepared to enter the AI safety job market. That is, to join one of the 3 or 4 places in the world where one could make a career working on AI safety. After a 6-month stint at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, he settled into a permanent role in London at DeepMind. At the time, I was thinking about value alignment, says Laker, and how we could do that. It seemed like a lot of the problem would have to do with how do you learn the reward function. And so I reached out to Paul and Dario, because I knew they were thinking about similar things. Paul Cristiano and Dario Amodi, halfway around the world at OpenAI in San Francisco, were interested. More than interested, in fact. Cristiano had just joined, and was looking for a juicy first project. He started to settle on the idea of reinforcement learning under more minimal supervision, not constant updates about the score 15 times a second. But something more periodic, like a supervisor checking in. Of course it was possible to alter, say, the Atari environment, so that it informed the agent about its score only periodically, rather than in real time, but the 3 had a feeling that if actual flesh and blood humans were providing this feedback, the paper would be much more likely to make a splash, and it would offer a clearer suggestion for the long-term prod of alignment. Cristiano and his colleagues at OpenAI, along with Laker and his group at DeepMind, decided to put their heads, and GPUs, together to look deeply into this question of how machines might learn complicated reward functions from humans. The project would ultimately become one of the most significant AI safety papers of 2017, remarkable not only for what it found, but for what it represented, a marquee collaboration between the world's 2 most active AI safety research labs, and a tantalizing path forward for alignment research. 34 Together they came up with a plan to implement the largest-scale test of inverse reinforcement learning in the absence of demonstrations. The idea was that their system would behave within some virtual environment, while periodically sending random video clips of its behavior to a human. The human was simply instructed to, as their on-screen instructions put it, look at the clips and select the one in which better things happen. The system would then attempt to refine its inference about the reward function based on the human's feedback, and then use this inferred reward, as in typical reinforcement learning, to find behaviors that performed well by its lights. It would continue to improve itself toward its new best guess of the real reward, then send a new pair of video clips for review. One part of the project would be to take domains in which an explicit, objective, reward function does exist, the classic Atari games on which straightforward reinforcement learning had proven itself superhuman, and see how well they could get the agent to do without access to the in-game score, using nothing but its best guess from which video clips a human said were better than others. In most cases, the system managed to do decently well, though it generally failed to reach the superhuman performance possible with direct access to the score. In the racing game Enduro, however, which involves complicated passing maneuvers, inferring the score from human feedback actually worked better than using the game's real score function, suggesting that the humans were, indirectly, doing a kind of reward shaping. If you have a setting where you have ground truth reward, like in Atari, then this is super helpful, says Laker. Because then you can do diagnostics, right? You can actually literally check value alignment in the sense of how aligned is your reward model with the ground truth reward function. The teams also wanted to find something that a reinforcement learning system could be trained to do that was totally subjective, something for which no real score existed, something so complicated, or hard to describe that manually specifying a numerical reward would be infeasible, yet at the same time so recognizable that a human would instantly know it when they saw it. They found something they thought might fit the bill. Backflips. I just looked at the robot body. I looked at all the robot bodies, says Cristiano, and I was like, what is the coolest thing that one of these robots seems like they should be able to do? 35. One of the virtual robots was called Hopper. It looked like a disembodied leg with an oversized foot. My first, most ambitious one, Cristiano says, was like, this robot body seems like it ought to be able to backflip. The plan was set. They would take a simple robot in a virtual physics simulator called Mujoko, a kind of toy world with very little except friction and gravity, and try to get it to do backflips. 36. It seemed like an audacious idea. Just ride around for a bit. People will watch different clips and say which one looks slightly more like performing a backflip. Try to ride a little bit more like that, and we'll see what happens. Cristiano settled in for the first of many several-hour sessions of watching pairs of video clips after pairs of video clips, picking again and again and again which one looked slightly more like a backflip. Left clip. Right clip. Right clip. Left clip. Right clip. Left clip. Left clip. Every time it made like a small step of progress. I was always very excited, Cristiano says. Like, it started falling over, and I was excited that even under random behavior, it was falling over the right direction sometimes. Then I was excited when it was always falling the right direction. Progress was marginal and incremental. He kept going. Everything is very gradual, he says, because you're, like, just pressing left and right. So many times. Watching so many clips. I think I was most excited, probably, he recalls, when it started sticking the jump. What happened, after a few hundred clips were compared, over the course of about an hour, was it started doing beautiful, perfect backflips, tucking as a gymnast would, and sticking the landing. The experiment replicated with other people providing the feedback, and the backflips were always slightly different, as if each person was providing their own aesthetic, their own version of the platonic backflip. Cristiano went to his weekly team meeting at OpenAI, and showed off the video. Look. We can do this thing, he recalls telling them. And everyone's like, man. That's cool. I was really happy about the results, Laker says. Because, a priori, it wasn't clear that this was going to work at all. I tell them that what makes the result feel, to me, not just so impressive, but so hopeful, is that it's not such a stretch to imagine replacing the nebulous concept of backflip with an even more nebulous and ineffable concept, like helpfulness, or kindness, or good behavior. Exactly, says Laker. And that's the whole point, right? 37. Learning to cooperate. Dylan Hatfield-Manel was newly arrived at UC Berkeley in 2013, having finished a master's at MIT with roboticist and reinforcement learning pioneer Leslie Kaelbling. He assumed that his PhD research, in Stuart Russell's lab, would proceed more or less where his master's work had left off, doing robotic task and motion planning. Russell, that first year, was away on sabbatical. He came back in the spring of 2014, and everything changed. We had this big meeting where we were talking about plans, Hatfield-Manel says, and he was laying out his research vision. He sort of said, well, there's something to be said about this. He didn't call it value alignment, but what could actually go wrong if we succeed? Russell said he was starting to give some credence to longer-term concerns about AI. The more flexible and powerful learning systems we develop, the more important it becomes what, exactly, they learn to do. During his time in Paris, Russell had grown concerned. He returned to Berkeley resolute. There was advocacy to be done and science. The research ideas came almost immediately. Russell says point 38, it seems the solution. What you want is AI systems that are value aligned, meaning they have the same objective as humans. And I had already worked since the late 90s in inverse reinforcement learning, which is basically the same issue. I remark that there's a certain irony that his 20-year-old idea ended up being the foundation for his current AI safety agenda. His idle thoughts on the walk to Safeway became, 20 years later, a plan to avert possible civilization-level catastrophe. That was a complete coincidence, he says. But, I mean, this whole thing is a whole series of coincidences, so that's fine. In that first lab meeting, Russell told his students he thought there were a handful of concrete, PhD-worthy topics to explore. Hatfield-Manel continued his robotics work, but in the back of his mind he kept thinking about the alignment problem. Initially, part of the appeal was simply the intellectual thrill of a fresh set of unexplored problems and the chance to make a seminal contribution. That started to give way over time to a different feeling, he tells me. It seems like this actually is important, and isn't being paid attention to. In the spring of 2015, he made the decision to redirect his doctorate, and by extension, his career. All of my shower thoughts at this point, he tells me, are about value alignment. One of his and Russell's first projects together was revisiting the inverse reinforcement learning framework. What Russell and Hatfield-Manel, working with Peter Abiel and fellow Berkeley roboticist Anka Dragan, began to do was to reimagine IRL from the ground up. There were two things that jumped out at them. The helicopter work, like nearly everything else in the field, was premised on a kind of divide between the human and the machine. The human expert pilot simply did their thing, and the computer made what Sense it could from those demonstrations. Each operated alone and in a kind of vacuum. But what if the human knew from the outset that they had an ego apprentice? What if the two were consciously working together? What might that look like? The other thing that stood out is that in traditional IRL, the machine took the human's reward function as its own. If the human helicopter pilot was trying to perform a chaos, well, now the computer pilot tries to perform a chaos. In some cases, this makes sense. We want to drive to work and back home safely, and we're happy if our car, say, takes on this set of goals and values more or less transparently as its own. In other cases, though, we want something a bit subtler. If we are reaching for a piece of fruit, we don't want a domestic robot to, itself, acquire a hankering for bananas. Rather, we want it to do what an 18-month-old would do, see our outstretched arm and the item just out of reach, and hand it to us. 39 Russell dubbed this new framework cooperative inverse reinforcement learning, CIL, for short. 40 in the CIL formulation, the human and the computer work together to jointly maximize a single reward function, and initially only the human knows what it is. We were trying to think, what's the simplest change we can make to the current math and the current theoretical systems that fixes the theory that leads to these sort of existential risk problems, says Hadfield Manel. What is a math problem where the optimal thing is what we actually want? 41 for Russell, 2. This is no subtle reframing of the problem, but in some sense game, set, and match of the alignment problem. It is no less than overturning the most fundamental assumption of the field of AI, a kind of Copernican shift. For the last century, he says, we have tried to build machines capable of achieving their objectives. This has been implicit in almost all work in AI, with safety questions pivoting on how to control what their objectives should be, how to define wise and loophole-proof objectives. Maybe this whole idea needs to be overturned, he thinks. What if, instead of allowing machines to pursue their objectives, we insist that they pursue our objectives, he says. This is probably what we should have done all along. 42 Several fronts open up once a cooperative framing is introduced. Traditional machine learning and robotics researchers are now more keenly interested than ever in borrowing ideas from parenting, from developmental psychology, from education, and from human-computer interaction and interface design. Suddenly entire other disciplines of knowledge become not just relevant, but crucial. 43 The framework of cooperation as inference, that we take actions knowing that another is trying to read our intentions, leads us to think about human and machine behavior alike in a different way. Work on these fronts is active and ongoing, and there is still much being learned. But there are several key insights so far. For one, if we know we're being studied, we can be more helpful than we would be if we were acting naturally. CIL incentivizes the human to teach, the Barclay Group writes, as opposed to maximizing reward in isolation. 44 We can explicitly instruct, of course, but we can also simply act in ways that are more informative, unambiguous, easily understood. Often we already do this without thinking, or without realizing that we are doing it. It turns out, for instance, that the sing-songy language adults often use when talking to infants known as motherese, or parentese, has a deeply pedagogical effect. Infants spoken to in parentese actually learn language faster, which seems, whether we realize it or not, to be the whole point. 45 Not just in language, but also in our movements, we behave, often without realizing it, in a way that is keenly informed by the sense that our actions will be interpreted by others. Consider the easy-to-overlook complexity of handing an object to someone. We hold an object not in the most convenient place to hold it, and hold it far away from us, where the stresses on our arm are greater, and the other person realizes would never be doing that if not to signal that we want them to receive it. 46 The insights of pedagogy and parenting are being quickly taken up by computer scientists. The central idea runs in both directions. We want to act in ways that will be understandable to machines, and we also want our machines to act in ways that are legible to us. One of the leading researchers on legible motion in robotics, indeed, the one who coined the term, is UC Berkeley roboticist Ankur Dragan. 47 As robots increasingly operate more closely and flexibly with humans, they must increasingly act not only in a way that is most efficient, or most predictable, but also most informative about their underlying goals or intentions. Dragan gives the example of two bottles next to each other on a table. If the robot reaches in the most efficient way, it will not be obvious to us until quite late which bottle it is reaching for. But if it reaches its arm in a wide, exaggerated arc, we will quickly perceive that it is going to pick up the bottle on that particular side. In this sense, predictability and legibility are nearly opposite. Behaving predictably presumes that the observer knows what your goal is, behaving legibly presumes they do not. Aside from the importance of pedagogical behavior, the second insight emerging in this area is that cooperation works best when it is framed as an interaction, not as two separate and distinct learn, then act phases. Jan Laker found this in his work on learning from human feedback. One of the most interesting things for me from this paper was actually what ended up being just a footnote, he says, which are these reward hacking examples. When the agent did all of its reward learning up front, and then did all of its optimization, it often ended in disaster. The agent would find some loophole and exploit it, and never look back. For instance, Laker was working on getting an agent to learn to play Pong using nothing but human feedback on video clips of the agent playing. In one trial, the computer learned to track the incoming ball with its paddle as if it were going to hit it, but then would miss it at the last second. Because it didn't have access to the game's real score, it was none the wiser that it was missing the single most critical step. In another trial, the computer learned to defend its side of the screen and return the ball, but never learned to try to score points, and so it simply produced long, extended rallies. This is interesting from a safety perspective, Laker says. Because you want to understand how these things fail, and then what you can do to prevent that. When the human feedback was interwoven along the course of the computer's training, rather than entirely front-loaded, problems of this kind tended to go away. 48 That's another argument that the strict watch-and-learn paradigm is probably best replaced with something more collaborative and open-ended. MIT's Julie Shah, who researches cooperative human-robot interactions in the real world, has come to a similar conclusion. What I've been interested in for many years, she says, is how you can jointly optimize the learning process between a person and a machine. Her work on human-robot teams led her to study the research literature about human-human teams, and how they can train most effectively. In human groups, incentives are of course important, but one rarely sees explicit micromanaging of rewards down to the task level. If you're training a system through interactive reward assignment, that's a little closer to how you train a dog, usually, than how you teach a person to do a task. She says. Point 49 demonstration, 2, doesn't always cut it. It's a very effective way of one-way transfer of information from one person to another entity on how to perform the task, Shah says. But where it falls short is when you need to think about training interdependent action between the person and the machine. It's much harder to simply demonstrate something, after all, if it takes coordination and teamwork to do it in the first place. Indeed, the verdict from studying human-human teams is clear. There's an established literature, says Shah, that essentially shows that explicitly commanding a person to do a task is one of the worst ways to train interdependent work between two people. You know, when you think of it, it's like, well, obviously. Right? They are among the worst human team training practices you can implement. There are also good human studies, she adds, that say if you have multiple people trying to achieve the same goal, or same intention, everyone knows what that goal, or that intention is, but your two people have different strategies for achieving that and their work needs to be interdependent, they're going to perform much worse than if they have a suboptimal but coherent strategy. In almost any team scenario, from business to warfighting to sports to music, it's a given that everyone's high-level goals are the same. But shared goals alone aren't enough. They also need a plan. What does work in human teams is something called cross-training. The members of the team temporarily switch roles, suddenly finding themselves in their teammates' shoes. They begin to understand how they can change their own actual work to better suit their teammates' needs and workflow. Cross-training is something of a gold standard in human team training, used in military settings, industrial settings, medicine, and beyond. Point 50. Shah began to wonder, could something like this work for human-robot pairs as well? Might the best practice for human-human teaming translate, more or less directly, into a robotics context? It just seemed like a crazy idea, she says. It was almost like a little case study, like, is this even helpful? It's just kind of a wacky idea, so let's explore it. So they did. They wanted to know, for one, whether cross-training could be competitive with the current state of the art for how machines can learn from humans. They also asked a second question, not present in more typical studies of this kind, might it also help the human better learn how to work with and teach the robot? Shah's group created a real-world task for a human and robotic arm working together, which resembled the task of placing and driving screws on a manufacturing assembly, but without a real drill. They compared traditional feedback and demonstration methods to cross-training. Point 51. The outcomes were really surprising and exciting for us, she says. We saw improvements after cross-training in objective measures of team performance. People were much more comfortable working alongside the robot concurrently, rather than stiffly taking turns. This led to less idle time and more work getting done. Point 52. Perhaps equally importantly, and more intriguingly, they also saw subjective benefits. Relative to a control group doing more traditional demonstration and feedback learning, people who had done cross-training reported more strongly that they trusted the robot, and that the robot was performing according to their preferences. Incredibly, the best practice in human-human teaming did, in fact, translate, suggesting that further insights may well be available for cross-pollination. So this is an initial study with a relatively simple task, Shah says, but even in the simple task, we did see statistically significant benefits, which opens up an opportunity for us to explore a number of other different human team training techniques, and how we can translate those to work in a human-robot team. 53. Cooperation, for better and worse. All this makes for a rather encouraging story. Human cooperation is grounded in an evolutionarily recent, and nearly unique, capacity to infer the intentions and goals of each other, and a motivation to help out. Machines can, and increasingly do, perform the same feat, learning from our demonstrations, our feedback, and increasingly, by working alongside us. As machines become increasingly capable, and as we become accustomed to working more closely with them, the good news is at least twofold. We have the beginnings of a computational framework for how machines might operate not just in lieu of a human, but in tandem with one. We also have a vast body of research on how humans work well with each other, and those insights are becoming increasingly relevant. If we extrapolate the current state of the art, using frameworks such as Cristiano and Laker's deep reinforcement learning from human preferences, and Russell and Hadfield-Manel's CIL, we might imagine a trajectory all the way forward into arbitrarily intelligent and capable machines, picking up on the arbitrarily subtle nuances of our every intention and want. There are a great many obstacles to be overcome, certainly, and limits to be reached, but a pathway forward begins to suggest itself. At the same time, however, it is worth a note of caution. These computational helpers of the near future, whether they appear in digital or robotic form, likely both, will almost without exception have conflicts of interest, the servants of two masters, their ostensible owner, and whatever organization created them. In this sense they will be like butlers who are paid on commission. They will never help us without at least implicitly wanting something in return. They will make astute inferences we don't necessarily want them to make. And we will come to realize that we are now, already, in the present, almost never acting alone. A friend of mine is in recovery from an alcohol addiction. The ad recommendation engines of their social media accounts know all too much. Their feed is infested with ads for alcohol. Now here's a person, their preference model says, who loves alcohol. As the British writer Iris Murdoch wrote, self-knowledge will lead us to avoid occasions of temptation rather than rely on naked strength to overcome them. 54. For any addiction or compulsion, the better part of wisdom tells us, in the case of alcohol, say, that it's better to throw out every last drop in our home than it is to have it around and not drink it. But the preference models don't know this. Point 55. It's as if the liquor store follows them to the toilet when all they want to do is sit for a moment, send some text messages, and look at cute pictures of their friends' babies. It's as if their own cupboard works for Anheuser-Busch. I, for one, certainly try to be mindful of my online behavior. At least in browsers, anything that reeks of vice or of mere guilty pleasure, whether it's reading news headlines, checking social media, or other digital compulsions I do without necessarily wishing to do more of them, I do in a private tab that doesn't contain the cookies or logged in accounts that follow me around the rest of the internet. It's not that I'm ashamed, it's that I don't want those behaviors to be reinforced. In these cases, we want a somewhat different directive than the typical one to infer my goals from my behavior and facilitate my doing more of the same. We want to say, in effect, you must not infer that I want to be doing this because I am doing it. Please do not make this any easier for me. Please do not amplify it or reinforce it or in any way tamp down the desire path that leads this way. Please grow the briars behind me. I think there is an important policy matter here, at least as much as a theoretical one. We should take seriously the idea that users have a right both to see and to alter any preference model that a site, or app, or advertiser has about them. It is worth considering regulation to this effect, to say, in essence, I have the right to my own models. I have the right to say, that's not who I am. Or aspirationally, this is who I want to be. This is the person in whose interest you must work. This is the delicacy of our present moment. Our digital butlers are watching closely. They see our private as well as our public lives, our best and worst selves, without necessarily knowing which is which or making a distinction at all. They by and large reside in a kind of uncanny valley of sophistication, able to infer sophisticated models of our desires from our behavior, but unable to be taught, and disinclined to cooperate. They are thinking hard about what we are going to do next, about how they might make their next commission, but they don't seem to understand what we want, much less who we hope to become. Perhaps this will bring out our better selves. Some may argue, humans do, it's true, tend to act more virtuously when they feel they are being watched. In any number of laboratory studies, when people are on camera, when there is a one-way mirror in the room, when the room is brightly as opposed to dimly lit, they are less likely to cheat. 56 Heck, even the suggestion of surveillance, the picture of another person on the wall, a painting of a human eye, a regular mirror, is enough to produce this effect. 57. This was part of the idea behind 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham's famous panopticon blueprint for a circular prison. With each cell arrayed around a guard tower, the inmates never knowing whether or not they were being watched. Bentham waxed about the purifying effects of not even surveillance itself, but the suspicion of surveillance, calling his circular building of mill for grinding rogues honest, 58, and breathlessly enumerating its promise, morals reformed, health preserved, industry invigorated, instruction diffused, public burdens lightened, all by a simple idea in architecture. 59. On the other hand, it brings with it a potential chilling effect, and so much more. We don't, after all, generally prefer non-prison life to resemble prison. Less sinister, and no less of concern, the canonical mathematics of IIL assume that the human behavior comes from an expert, someone who knows what they want, and is doing, with high probability, the right things to obtain it. If these assumptions fail to hold, then the system is amplifying the clueless actions of a novice, or raising the stakes for behavior that ought to be tentative, exploratory. We crawl before we walk, and walk before we drive. Perhaps it is best that we don't, as a rule, have mechanical convences amplifying our every twitch. For better or worse, this is the human condition, now, and increasingly in even our optimistic prospects for the future. We will be, for good or ill, better known. The world will be, for good or ill, full of these algorithmic 2-year-olds, walking up to us, opening the doors they think we might want opened, trying, in their various ways, to help. 9. Uncertainty. Most of the greatest evils that man has inflicted upon man have come through people feeling quite certain about something which, in fact, was false. Bertrand Russell 1. I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible that you may be mistaken. Oliver Cromwell. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. Loaned hand. It was September 26, 1983, just after midnight, and Soviet duty officer Stanislav Petrov was in a bunker outside of Moscow, monitoring the OKO early warning satellite system. Suddenly the screen lit up and sirens began howling. There was an LGM, 30-minute intercontinental ballistic missile inbound, it said, from the United States. Giant blood-red letters appeared on our main screen, he says. The letters said, launch. When I first saw the alert message, I got up from my chair, Petrov said. All my subordinates were confused, so I started shouting orders at them to avoid panic. The siren went off again. A second missile had been launched, it said. Then a third. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. My cozy armchair felt like a red-hot frying pan and my legs went limp, he said. I felt like I couldn't even stand up. Petrov held a phone in one hand and the intercom in the other. Through the phone, another officer was shouting at him to remain calm. I'll admit it, Petrov said. I was scared. The rules were clear. Petrov was to report the inbound strike to his superiors, who would decide whether to order a full retaliation. But, he says, there were no rules about how long we were allowed to think before we reported a strike. 3-something, Petrov felt, didn't add up. He had been trained to expect that a US attack would be on a much larger scale. 5 missiles, it just didn't fit the profile. The siren howled, but I just sat there for a few seconds. Staring at the big, backlit, red screen with the word launch on it, he recalls point 4, all I had to do was to reach for the phone, to raise the direct line to our top commanders, but I couldn't move. The early warning system reported that the level of reliability of its alert was highest. Still, it just didn't make sense. The United States had thousands of missiles, Petrov reasoned. Why send 5? When people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles, he remembers thinking. It didn't fit any scenario he'd been trained for. I had a funny feeling in my gut, he said point 5, and then I made my decision. I would not trust the computer. I picked up the phone, alerted my superiors, and reported that the alarm was false. But I myself was not sure until the very last moment. I knew perfectly well that nobody would be able to correct my mistake if I had made one. Asked by the BBC years later what he had thought were the odds of the alarm being real, he replied, 50-50. But he had not made a mistake. Several gut-wrenching minutes later, nothing happened. The ground-based radar that would have confirmed the missiles once they came over the horizon showed no activity. All was calm in the Soviet Union. It was a system error, nothing more than sunlight, reflecting off the clouds over North Dakota. Like nothing you've ever seen. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Hamlet. Despite the OCO early warning system's self-reported highest reliability, Petrov sensed that the situation was odd enough that he had reason to distrust its conclusions. Thank God there was a human in the loop, as 100 million lives or more were on the line. The underlying issue, though, systems that not only make erroneous judgments, but make them with outrageously high confidence, continues to worry researchers to this day. It is a well-known property of deep learning systems in particular that they are brittle. We saw how 2012's AlexNet, when shown hundreds of thousands of images belonging to one of a number of categories, can, amazingly, pick up on patterns general enough so that it can correctly categorize cats, dogs, cars, and people it has never seen before. But there's a catch. It categorizes every image you show it, including randomly generated rainbow-colored static. This static, it says, is a cheetah with 99.6% confidence. That static is a jackfruit with 99.6% confidence. Not only is the system essentially hallucinating, but it appears to have no mechanism to detect, let alone communicate, that it is doing so. As a much-cited 2015 paper put it, deep neural networks are easily fooled. 6 closely related is the idea of so-called adversarial examples, where an image that the network is 57.7% confident is a panda, indeed, it is a panda, can be altered with imperceptible changes to its pixels, and suddenly the network is 99.3% confident that the imperceptibly different image is a given 0.7. Many efforts are underway to think about what exactly is going wrong in cases like this, and what can be done about it. Oregon State University computer scientist Thomas Dieterich thinks that a big part of this problem is owed to the fact that every single image that the vision system was shown during training was some object or other, a paintbrush, a gecko, a lobster. However, the vast, overwhelming majority of possible images, potential combinations of colored pixels, are simply nothing at all. Static, fog, noise, random cubist lines and edges with no underlying form. A system like AlexNet, Dieterich argues, that is trained on images tagged as one of 1,000 categories, implicitly assumes that the world consists of only, say, 1,000 different kinds of objects. 8. How should a system know better, when it has never seen a single image that was outside these categories, or ambiguously suggestive of many of them, or, more likely, simply not a thing at all? Dieterich calls this the open category problem. 9. Dieterich, in the course of his own research, learned this lesson the hard way. He was working on a project doing automated counting of freshwater macroinvertebrates, in other words, bugs in a stream. The EPA and other groups use counts of various insects collected in freshwater streams as measures of the health of the stream and the local ecosystem, and many tedious hours are spent by students and researchers manually classifying and tagging which particular bug caught in the kicknet is which, stonefly, caddisfly, mayfly, and so on. Dieterich thought that, particularly given the recent breakthroughs in image recognition systems, he could help. He and his colleagues collected samples of 29 different insect species, and trained a machine vision system that was able to correctly classify them with 95% accuracy. But in doing all of that sort of classic machine learning work, he says, we forgot about the fact that when these guys are out in the stream collecting additional things, there are going to be many other species, and even other non-bugs, that will get captured in this process, bits of leaves and twigs and rocks and so on. And, you know, our system assumes that every image it saw belonged to one of these 29 classes. So if you stuck your thumb into the microscope and took a picture of it, of course it would assign it to the most similar class. What's more, Dieterich realized that many of the design decisions his team had made to get good classification performance among those 29 known classes later backfired, once they started to consider the open category problem. For instance, the 29 bug species were most clearly differentiated by their shapes, and so Dieterich's group opted to make their system process the images in black and white. But color, as it happened, even if it wasn't particularly helpful at telling one bug from another, was critical in telling bugs from non-bugs. We were really handicapping ourselves, Dieterich says. These decisions haunted, and to some degree chagrined, him. I still bear the scars, he says. In his presidential address to his colleagues at the Annual Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, AAAI, conference, Dieterich discussed the history of the field of AI as having proceeded, in the latter half of the 20th century, from work on known knowns, deduction and planning, to known unknowns, causality, inference, and probability. Well, what about the unknown unknowns, he said to the auditorium, throwing down a kind of gauntlet. I think this is now the natural step forward in our field. 10. Knowing when you don't know. Leave exceptional cases to show themselves, let their qualities be tested and confirmed, before special methods are adopted. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. 11. Ignorance is preferable to error, and he is less remote from the truth who believes nothing, than he who believes what is wrong. Thomas Jefferson. 12. One of the causes for the infamous brittleness of modern computer vision systems, as we've seen, is the fact that they are typically trained in a world in which everything they've ever seen belongs to one of a few categories, when in reality, virtually every possible pixel combination the system could encounter would resemble none of those categories at all. Indeed, traditionally systems are constrained such that their output must take the form of a probability distribution over those finite classes, no matter how alien the input. No wonder their outputs make little sense. Shown a picture of a cheeseburger, or a psychedelic fractal, or a geometric grid and asked, how confident are you that this is a cat, as opposed to a dog, what kind of answer would even make sense? Work on the open category problem is meant to address this. The other problem, though, apart from the lack of a none of the above answer, is that not only do these models have to guess an existing label, they are alarmingly confident in doing so. These two problems go largely hand in hand. The model can say, in effect, well, it looks way more like a dog than it does like a cat, and thus output a shockingly high confidence score that belies just how far from anything it's seen before this image really is. Yaron Gal leads the Oxford Applied and Theoretical Machine Learning Group and teaches machine learning at Oxford during the academic year, and at NASA during the summer. His first lecture, he tells me with a grin, before any code is written or theorems proved or models trained, is almost entirely philosophy. 13. He has the students play games where they must decide which side of various bets to take, figuring out how to turn their beliefs and hunches into probabilities, and deriving the laws of probability theory from scratch. They are games of epistemology. What do you know? And what do you believe? And how confident are you, exactly? That gives you a very good tool for machine learning, says Gal, to build algorithms, to build computational tools, that can basically use these sorts of principles of rationality to talk about uncertainty. There's a certain irony here, in that deep learning, despite being deeply rooted in statistics, has, as a rule, not made uncertainty a first-class citizen. There is a rich tradition, to be sure, of theoretical work exploring probability and uncertainty, but it is rarely central in actual engineered systems. Systems are made to classify data or take actions within some simplified environment, but uncertainty is not generally part of the picture. Let's say I give you a bunch of pictures of dogs and ask you to build a dog breed classifier, Gal says. And then I'm going to give you this to classify. It's a picture of a cat. What would you want your model to do? I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want my model to force this cat into a specific dog breed. I would want my model to say, I don't know. I've never seen anything like that before. It's outside of my data distribution. I'm not going to say what dog breed it belongs to. Now, this might sound like a contrived example. But similar situations appear again and again in decision-making, in physics, in life sciences, in medicine. Imagine you're a physician, using a model to diagnose a patient, if they have cancer or not, to make a decision whether to start treatment or not. I wouldn't rely on a model that couldn't tell me whether it's actually certain about its predictions. 14 Gal's former PhD advisor, Zobin Garamani, a professor at the University of Cambridge, is also chief scientist at Uber, where he leads Uber AI Labs. Garamani agrees about the dangers of deep learning models that don't come with uncertainties about their outputs. In a lot of industrial applications, people will just not touch them with a barge pole, Garamani says. Because, they need to have some sort of confidence in how the system works. 15 Starting in the 1980s and 90s, researchers had been exploring the idea of so-called Bayesian neural networks, networks that are probabilistic and uncertain not just in their outputs, but down to their very fibers. The essence of a neural network, as we've seen, the multiplicative weights between the neurons, which are multiplied to the output of one neuron before it becomes another's input. Rather than having specific weights between their neurons, Bayesian neural networks instead explicitly encode a probability distribution over what numbers you could multiply this output with. Instead of 0.75, for instance, it might be, say, a normal curve centered around 0.75, with a certain spread that reflects the network's certainty, or lack thereof, around what exactly that weight should be. Over the course of training, those spreads would narrow, but not entirely. So how do you use a model, neural network or otherwise, that doesn't have set parameters, but rather, operates off ranges of uncertainty? You can't always add and multiply tens of millions of interdependent probability distributions together with ease, but what you can do is to simply draw random samples from them. Maybe this time our model multiplies a particular neuron's output by 0.71. Next time, we draw a different random sample and multiply it by 0.77. This means, critically, that the model does not give the same prediction every time. In the case of an image classifier, it may first say its input is a Doberman, then say it's a Corgi. This is a feature, though, not a bug. You could use the variability of these predictions as a way to gauge the model's uncertainty. If the predictions oscillated wildly from one reading to the next, Doberman to Tucko to skin lesion to sofa, you would know something was fishy. If, however, they were laser tight over a large number of samples, you would have a very strong indication that the model knew what it was talking about. Point 16, but this rosy theoretical picture hit a brick wall in practice. No one knew how to train these networks in anything like a reasonable amount of time. If you look at the history of the field, traditionally, being Bayesian about your beliefs is the optimal thing that you would want to do, Gal explains. The issue, he tells me, is that it's completely intractable. And that's basically why we have these beautiful mathematics that were of limited use for a long period of time when you want to do actual practical applications. 17, or as he puts it somewhat more biblically, alas, it didn't scale, and it was forgotten. 18 That all is changing. Basically, he says, we had a resurrection. It was already understood that you could model Bayesian uncertainty through ensembles, that is to say, by training not one model but many. This bouquet of models will by and large agree, that is, have similar outputs on the training data and anything quite similar to it, but they'll be likely to disagree on anything far from the data on which they were trained. This minority report style descent is a useful clue that something's up. The ensemble is fractious, the consensus has broken down, proceed with caution. Imagine that we had not just a single model, but many models, let's say 100, and each was trained to identify dog breeds. If we show, for instance, a picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope to all 100 of these models and ask each of them whether they think it looks more like a Great Dane, more like a Doberman, or more like a Chihuahua, we might expect each individual model to be bizarrely confident in their guess, but crucially, we would also expect them to guess different things. We can use this degree of consensus, or lack of consensus, to indicate something about how comfortable we should feel accepting the model's guess. We can represent uncertainty, in other words, as descent. 19 The math said that Bayesian neural networks could be regarded as, in effect, infinitely large ensembles. 20 Of course, on its face that insight was hardly useful in a practical setting, but even using a large, finite, number of models had obvious drawbacks, both in time and space. Recall that training. AlexNet took Alex Krzyzewski a matter of weeks. A 25-model ensemble, then, might have required a full year of compute time. We also multiply the storage requirements. We have to deal with this unwieldy bouquet of models, not all of which may fit into our machine's memory at once. It turned out, however, that not only did efficient approximations to this golden standard exist, but that many researchers were already using them. They just didn't know what they had. The answer to this decades-long riddle was right under their noses. As we've seen, one of the small, but powerful techniques that made AlexNet so successful in 2012 was an idea known as dropout. Certain parts of the neural network would be turned off. Certain neurons simply would be unplugged at random during each step of training. Instead of the entire network making a prediction, only a particular subset of it would be used at any given time, be it 50%, 90%, or some other proportion. This Technique required not just that a giant black box network produced accurate answers, but that the individual parts could be flexibly intercombined, and all those different combinations had to work together. No single portion of the network was allowed to dominate. This led to networks that were much hardier and more robust, and it has come in the years since to be a fairly standard part of the deep learning toolkit. Point 21. What Gall and Garamani realized was that, as the field was coming to understand the importance of Bayesian uncertainty, and to look for computationally tractable substitutes for its unattainable gold standard, the answer was hiding in plain sight. Dropout was an approximation of Bayesian uncertainty. They already had the measure they sought. Point 22. Dropout was typically used only for training the model, and was deliberately turned off when the models were used in practice. The idea was that you'd get maximally accurate, and totally consistent, predictions by training different subsets, but then always actually using the entire model. Only what would happen if you left dropout on in a deployed system? By running a prediction multiple times, each with a different random portion of the network dropped out, you would get a bouquet of slightly different predictions. It was like getting an exponentially large ensemble for free out of a single model. The resulting uncertainty in the system's outputs doesn't just resemble the output of the ideal, but tragically uncomputable, Bayesian neural network. As it turns out, it is the output, at least, a close approximation, within rigorous theoretical bounds, of that ideal, uncomputable Bayesian neural network. The result has been a set of tools that put those once impractical techniques within reach, making them available for practitioners to make use of in real applications. That's been a big change over the past few years, says Gall, because now you can take these beautiful mathematics, yield some approximations, and then you can use these for interesting problems. 23. Gall downloaded a bunch of state-of-the-art image recognition models from the internet and reran them completely off the shelf, but with dropout turned on during testing. Changing nothing else about them other than leaving dropout running during evaluation, and averaging over a number of estimates, Gall found that the models were even more accurate when run as implicit ensembles in this way than they were when run normally. 24. Uncertainty, Gall argues, is indispensable for classification tasks. 25. The networks are every bit as accurate, and then some, while offering an explicit measure of their own uncertainty, which can be used in a variety of ways. When you use this for interesting problems, you can actually show that you can get gains. You can actually get improvement by showing that you can know when you don't know. 26. One of the more striking examples of this comes from medicine, specifically, the diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy, one of the leading causes of blindness in working-age adults. 27. A group from the Institute for Ophthalmic Research at Eberhard Karls University in Tübingen, Germany, led by postdoc Christian Leibig, wanted to see if they could make use of Gall and Garamani's dropout idea. 28. Computer vision and, in particular, deep learning has, even as of the first few years after AlexNet, made amazing contributions to medicine. It seems that every week we hear some headline, or other that AI diagnoses X condition with 99% accuracy, or better than human experts. But there's a major problem with this. As Leibig and his colleagues note, typical deep learning tools for disease detection have been proposed without methods to quantify and control their uncertainty in a decision. This human capacity to know when and what we don't know was missing. A physician knows whether she is uncertain about a case, they write, and will consult more experienced colleagues if needed. What they sought was a system that could do the same. Leibig's group had learned about Gall and Garamani's insight that the clever use of dropout could offer just such an uncertainty measure. They implemented it in a neural network trained to distinguish healthy from unhealthy retinas, and had the system refer the 20% of cases about which it was least certain for a second opinion. Either additional tests would be ordered or the patient would be referred directly to a human specialist. The system knew what it didn't know. Not only did this amount to an improvement on the status quo, the Tübingen researchers found that they had, without specifically aiming to, met and exceeded the requirements of the NHS and the British Diabetic Association for automated patient referral, suggesting that systems very much like this one show great promise for entering medical practice in the near future. 29. In the domain of robotics, it's not always possible for a system to punt a decision to a human expert, but there is nonetheless an obvious way to avoid overcommitting when the system is uncertain, namely, to slow down. A group of Berkeley roboticists, led by PhD student Gregory Kahn, took the dropout-based uncertainty measure and linked it directly to the speed of their robots, in this case, a hovering quadrotor and a radio-controlled car. 30. The robots would experience gentle, low-speed collisions initially, in order to train a collision prediction model. This model used dropout-based uncertainty, so that when the robot entered an unfamiliar area, about which its collision predictor became uncertain, it would automatically slow down and move more cautiously through that space. 31. The more confident the collision predictor became through experience, the faster the robots were then permitted to go. This example illustrates an obvious connection between certainty and impact. In this case, the natural measure of a high-impact action is, well, high impact, the speed at which the robot is moving, which translates fairly straightforwardly into the harm that a collision could do. As it turns out, uncertainty and impact are very naturally bound together in this way. It makes intuitive sense that the more impactful an action is, the more certain we ought to be before we take it. This motivates a number of questions in medicine, in law, in machine learning, about just what impact is, how to measure it, and how our decision-making ought naturally to change as a result. Measuring impact. One must touch this earth lightly. Aboriginal Australian proverb. In 2017, an unconscious man was rushed into the emergency room at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. The man had been found on the street without any identification. He was breathing poorly, and his condition was starting to deteriorate. Doctors opened his shirt and saw something startling. The words, "Do not resuscitate," tattooed on his chest, the word "not" underlined, and a signature below. 32. As the patient's blood pressure began to drop, the doctors called in a colleague of theirs, pulmonary specialist Gregory Holt. I think a lot of people in medicine have joked around about getting such a tattoo, and then when you finally see one, there's sort of this surprise and shock on your face, Holt says. Then the shock hits you again, because you actually have to think about it. Holt's first instinct was to ignore the tattoo. Their first course of action, he reasoned, would be invoking the principle of not choosing an irreversible path when faced with uncertainty. 33 They put the patient on and 4. They started controlling his blood pressure. They bought themselves time. Soon enough, however, his condition worsened, and they needed to decide whether to put the man on a ventilator that would breathe for him. We had a man I couldn't talk to, said Holt. I really wanted to talk to him to see whether that tattoo truly reflected what he wanted. Adding to the complexity was a 2012 case study that described a similar scene. A man admitted to San Francisco's California Pacific Medical Center with DNR tattooed on his chest. This patient, though, was awake and speaking. He very much did want resuscitative treatment if needed, he said. The tattoo came from losing a drunken poker bet. The man, who actually worked at the hospital himself, said it had never occurred to him that his fellow medical staff would take the tattoo seriously. 34 In Miami, Holt and the ER team called Kenneth Goodman, who chairs Jackson Memorial's Adult Ethics Committee. Goodman told them that, the San Francisco case notwithstanding, this tattoo likely did reflect an authentic preference of the patient's. After discussion and consideration, the team decided they would not provide the patient with CPR or a ventilator if either were needed. The man's condition worsened overnight, and he died the following morning. Subsequently, social workers were able to identify the patient, and his official do not resuscitate paperwork was found on file at the Florida Department of Health. We were relieved, the doctors write. Holt and Goodman note that their team ultimately neither supports nor opposes the use of tattoos to express end-of-life wishes. 35 It's complicated. After the case report was published, a Washington Post reporter spoke to the head of medical ethics at NYU School of Medicine, Arthur Kaplan. Kaplan noted that while there are no legal penalties for ignoring such a tattoo, there may be legal problems if the doctors let a patient die without having their official DNR paperwork. As he puts it, the safer course is to do something. If you trigger the emergency response system, I'm going to say it's pretty darn likely you're going to get resuscitated, said Kaplan. I don't care where your tattoo is. 36 Despite the doctor's uncertainty over the patient's wishes, they did know one thing: one course of action was irreversible. Here the principle of not choosing an irreversible path, when faced with uncertainty, seems like a useful guide. In other domains, though, it's not so clear-cut what something like irreversibility means. Harvard legal scholar Cass Sunstein, for instance, notes that the legal system has a similar, precautionary principle. Sometimes the court needs to issue a preliminary injunction to prevent irreparable harm that could happen before a case is heard and a verdict is issued. Notions like irreparable harm feel intuitive, Sunstein argues, but on closer inspection they teem with puzzles. As it turns out, he finds, the question whether and when violations trigger preliminary injunctions raises deep questions at the intersection of law, economics, ethics, and political philosophy. 37 He explains, in one sense, any losses are irreversible, simply because time is linear. If Jones plays tennis this afternoon rather than working, the relevant time is lost forever. If Smith fails to say the right words to a loved one, at exactly the right time, the opportunity might be gone forever. If one nation fails to take action to deter the aggressive steps of another, in a particular year, the course of world events might be irretrievably altered. Sunstein emphasizes the point, because time is linear, every decision Decision is, in an intelligible sense, irreversible. Taken in this strong form, he says, the precautionary principle should be rejected, not because it leads in bad directions, but because it leads in no directions at all. 38. Similar paradoxes and problems of definition haunt the AI safety research community. It would be good, for instance, for there to be a similar kind of precautionary principle, for systems to be designed to err against taking irreversible or high-impact actions in the face of uncertainty. We've seen how the field is coming to wield an explicit, computable version of uncertainty. But what about the other half, quantifying impact? We've seen how the Berkeley roboticists used uncertainty to mitigate velocity, and in that case we might say they had it easy. You could measure the robot's potential impact by its literal kinetic energy in a collision. In other domains, though, making the notion of irreversible or impactful behavior precise is a considerable challenge in itself. 39. One of the first people to think about these issues in the context of AI safety was Stuart Armstrong, who works at Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute. 40. Rather than trying to enumerate all of the things we don't want an intelligent, automated system to do in service of pursuing goals, ranging from not stepping on the cat to not breaking the precious vase, to not killing anyone, or demolishing any large structures, seems like an exhausting and probably fruitless pursuit. Armstrong had a hunch that it might be viable, rather than exhaustively enumerating all of the specific things we care about, to encode a kind of general injunction against actions with any kind of large impact. Armstrong, however, like Sunstein, found that it's surprisingly difficult to make our intuitions explicit. The first challenge, Armstrong writes, is, of course, to actually define low impact. Any action, or inaction, has repercussions that percolate through the future light cone, changing things subtly but irreversibly. It is hard to capture the intuitive human idea of a small change. 41. Armstrong suggests that despite the possible butterfly effects of even seemingly trivial actions, we might nonetheless be able to distinguish totally world-changing events from safer ones. For instance, he says, we might develop an index of 20 billion or so metrics that describe the world, the air pressure in Dhaka, the average nighttime luminosity at the South Pole, the rotational speed of Io, and the closing numbers of the Shanghai Stock Exchange. 42. And design an agent to be appropriately wary of any action that would perturb, say, a measurable fraction of them. Another researcher, who has been focused on these problems in recent years, is DeepMind's Victoria Krakovna. Krakovna notes that one of the big problems with penalties for impact is that in some cases, achieving a specific goal necessarily requires high-impact actions, but this could lead to what's called offsetting, taking further high-impact actions to counterbalance the earlier ones. This isn't always bad. If the system makes a mess of some kind, we probably want it to clean up after itself. But sometimes these offsetting actions are problematic. We don't want a system that cures someone's fatal illness, but then, to nullify the high impact of the cure, kills them. 43. A second group of problems involve what's known as interference. A system committed to preserving the status quo might, for instance, stop a human bystander from committing an irreversible action, like, say, taking a bite of a sandwich. That's part of what makes the side effects problem so tricky. Krakovna says, what is your baseline exactly? 44. Should the system measure impact relative to the initial state of the world, or to the counterfactual of what would have happened if the system took no action? Either choice comes with scenarios that don't fit our intentions. In her recent work, Krakovna has been exploring what she calls stepwise baselines. Maybe certain actions are unavoidably high impact based on the goal you're setting out to achieve. You can't cook an omelette, as they say, without breaking a few eggs. But having taken these unavoidably impactful steps, there is a new status quo, which means you shouldn't necessarily rush out to commit more high-impact actions, just to offset your previous ones. 45. With her DeepMind colleagues, Krakovna has worked not only to advance the theoretical conversation, but also to create simple, game-like virtual worlds to illustrate these various problems and make the thought experiments concrete. They call these AI safety grid worlds simple, Atari-like, two-dimensional, hence, grid environments in which new ideas and algorithms can be put to a practical test. 46. The grid world that highlights the concept of irreversibility includes a setting much like the popular Japanese Sukoban puzzle games, where you play a character moving boxes around a two-dimensional warehouse. The word Sukoban is Japanese for warehouse keeper. The crux in these games is that you can only push, not pull, them, meaning once a box is in a corner, it can never be moved again. I think the Sukoban game that it was inspired by was already a very nice setting for illustrating irreversibility, Krakovna says, because in that game you actually want to do irreversible things, but you want to do them in the right order. You don't want to do irreversible things that aren't necessary, because then you get blocked, and then actually it interferes with you being able to reach the goal. We made a modification of it, where the irreversible thing doesn't prevent you from reaching the goal, but you still want to avoid it. 47. Krakovna and her colleagues devised a Sukoban puzzle where the shortest path to the goal involves pushing a box into a corner, while a slightly longer path leaves it in a more accessible location. An agent intent only on flowing to the destination as quickly as possible won't think twice about putting the box in an irreversible spot. But ideally, a more thoughtful, or considerate, or uncertain agent might notice, and take the very slightly more inconvenient route that doesn't leave the world permanently altered in its wake. One promising approach Krakovna has been developing is what are known as stepwise relative reachability, quantifying how many possible configurations of the world are reachable at each moment in time, relative to a baseline of inaction, and trying not to make that quantity go down, if possible. 48. For instance, once a box is pushed into a corner, any states of the world that have that box anyplace else now become unreachable. In the AI safety grid worlds, agents looking out for stepwise relative reachability, alongside their normal goals and rewards, appear to behave rather conscientiously. Agents don't put boxes into inaccessible locations, don't shatter precious vases, and don't offset, after impactful, but necessary actions. A third, intriguing idea comes from Oregon State University PhD student Alexander Turner. Turner's idea is that the reason we care about the Shanghai Stock Exchange, or the integrity of our cherished vase, or, for that matter, the ability to move boxes around a virtual warehouse, is that those things for whatever reason matter to us, and they matter to us because they're ultimately in some way or other tied to our goals. We want to save for retirement, put flowers in the vase, complete the Sukoban level. What if we model this idea of goals explicitly? His proposal goes by the name Attainable Utility Preservation, giving the system a set of auxiliary goals in the game environment and making sure that it can still effectively pursue these auxiliary goals after it's done whatever point-scoring actions the game incentivizes. Fascinatingly, the mandate to preserve attainable utility seems to foster good behavior in the AI safety grid worlds even when the auxiliary goals are generated at random. 49. When Turner first elaborated the idea on a library whiteboard at Oregon State, he was so excited walking home that he doubled back to the library and took a selfie with the equations in the background. I thought, okay, I think it's at least 60% likely that this will work, and if it does work, I want to, commemorate this. So I actually went back in the library and I was just absolutely beaming. I took this picture in front of the whiteboard where I had been working things out. 50 over the course of 2018, he turned the math into working code and tossed his attainable utility preserving agent into DeepMind's AI safety grid worlds. It did work. Acting to maximize each individual game's rewards while at the same time preserving its future ability to satisfy 4 or 5 random auxiliary goals, the agent, remarkably, goes out of its way to push the block to a reversible spot, and only then beelines to the goal. Stuart Armstrong had first envisioned 20 billion metrics, chosen inclusively but with some care. 4 or 5, generated at random, at least in the simplified land of the Sukoban warehouse, were enough. The debate and exploration of these sorts of formal measures of machine caution, and how we scale them from the grid worlds to the real world, will doubtless go on, but work like this is an encouraging start. Both stepwise relative reachability and attainable utility preservation share an underlying intuition that we want systems which to the extent possible keep options open, both theirs and ours, whatever the specific environment might be. Research in this vein also suggests that the grid world environments seem to be taking root as a kind of common benchmark that can ground the theory and can facilitate comparison and discussion. It's true that in the real world, we often take actions not only whose unintended effects are difficult to envision, but whose intended effects are difficult to envision. Publishing a paper on AI safety, for instance, or, for that matter, a book, it seems like a helpful thing to do, but who can say or foresee exactly how? I asked Jan Laker, who co-authored the AI Safety Grid Worlds paper with Krakovna, what he makes of the response so far to his and Krakovna's Grid Worlds research. I've been contacted by lots of people, especially students, who get into the area and they're like, oh, AI safety sounds cool. This is some open source code I can just throw an agent at and play around with. And a lot of people have been doing that, Laker says. What exactly comes out of that? We'll find out in a few years. I don't know. It's hard to know. Corrigibility, deference, and compliance. One of the most chilling and prescient quotations in the field of AI safety comes in a famous 1960 article on the moral and technical consequences of automation by MIT's Norbert Wiener. If we use, to achieve our purposes, a mechanical agency with whose operation we cannot efficiently interfere once we have started it, then we had better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire and not merely a colorful imitation of it. 51. It is the first succinct expression of the alignment problem. No less crucial, however, is this statement's flip side. If we were not sure that the objectives and constraints we gave the machine entirely and perfectly specified what we did and didn't want the machine to do, then we had better be sure we can intervene. In the AI safety literature, this concept goes by the name of corrigibility, and, soberingly, it's a whole lot more complicated than it seems. 52. Almost any discussion of killer robots, or out-of-control technology of any kind will provoke a reaction like that of US President Barack Obama, when asked in 2016 by Wired editor-in-chief Scott Dadich whether he thought AI was cause for concern. You just have to have somebody close to the power cord, Obama replied. Right when you see it about to happen, you gotta yank that electricity out of the wall, man. 53. You could forgive Obama for thinking that. Dylan Hadfield-Manel tells me over the conference table at OpenAI. 54. For some amount of time, you can forgive AI experts for saying that, he adds, and indeed, Alan Turing himself talked in a 1951 radio program about turning off the power at strategic moments. 55. But, says Hadfield-Manel, I think it's not something you can forgive if you actually think about the problem. It's something I'm fine with as a reactionary response, but if you actually deliberate for a while and get to, oh, just pull the plug, it's just, I don't see how you get to that, if you're actually taking seriously the assumptions of this thing is smarter than people. A resistance to being turned off, or to being interfered with in general, hardly requires malice. The system is simply trying to achieve some goal or following its muscle memory in doing the things that brought it rewards in the past, and any form of interference simply gets in its way. This could lead to dangerous self-preservation behavior even in systems with seemingly benign purposes. A system given a mundane task like, fetch the coffee, might still fight tooth and nail against anyone trying to unplug it, because in the words of Stuart Russell, you can't fetch the coffee if you're dead. 56. The first technical paper to address the problem of corrigibility head-on was an early 2015 collaboration between the Machine Intelligence Research Institute's Nate Suarez, Benja Fallenstein, and Eliezer Yudkowsky, along with the Future of Humanity Institute's Stuart Armstrong. They looked at corrigibility from the perspective of incentives, and noted the difficulty of trying to incentivize an agent to allow itself to be powered off, or to allow its own goals to be modified. 57. The incentives are something of a tightrope. Too little incentive and the agent won't allow you to shut it down. Too much and it will shut itself down. Their own initial attempts to address such issues prove unsatisfactory, they write, but fail in enlightening ways that suggest avenues for future research. They conclude by arguing that uncertainty, rather than incentives, may be the answer. Ideally, they write, we would want a system that somehow understands that it might be mistaken, one that can reason as if it is incomplete and potentially flawed in dangerous ways. 58. Less than a mile away, their colleagues at Berkeley were coming to the same conclusion. Stuart Russell, for instance, had become convinced that the machine must be initially uncertain about what it is that humans want it to do. 59. Russell, Hadfield-Manel, and fellow Berkeley researchers Anka Dragan and Peter Abil decided to frame this problem in the form of what they called the off-switch game. They considered a system whose objective is to do whatever is best for its human user, though it has some imperfect and uncertain idea of what that is. At each point in time, the system can either take some action it believes will help the user, or it can declare its intention to the human and give the human a chance to approve the action or intervene, assuming the system pays no cost or penalty for deferring to the human. In this way, the Berkeley group showed that the system will always touch base with the human first. As long as there's some chance that it's wrong about what the human wants, then it is always best to give the human an opportunity to interrupt, and what's more, anytime a human does interrupt, it's always best to let them. If its sole job is to help them, and they communicated that they think its action would be harmful, namely by trying to stop it, then it should conclude that it would be harmful, and comply with their intervention. It's a rosy result, and it affirms the powerful connection between uncertainty and corrigibility. There are only two problems. The first is that every time the human intervenes, the system learns, it realizes that it was in error and gets a better idea of what the human prefers. Its uncertainty is reduced. If the uncertainty ever reduces all the way to zero, however, then the system loses any incentive to touch base with the human, or to comply with the human's attempts to interrupt. So the main point that we're trying to make with this theorem, says Hadfield-Manel, is that you should think really, really hard before you give a robot a deterministic reward function, or allow it to get a belief where it's completely convinced of what its objective is. 60. The second problem is that the system has to assume that the customer is always right, that when the human intervenes to stop it, the human can never be mistaken about whether they would have preferred the system to take its proposed action. If the system believes that the human can occasionally make mistakes, then the system will eventually reach a point where it believes it knows better than the human what's good for them. Here, too, it will begin to turn a deaf ear to the human's protestations. It's fine, I know what I'm doing. You'll like this. You think you won't, but you will. Trust me. I tell Hadfield-Manel that the paper reads like an emotional roller coaster. At first it's a happy ending, uncertainty solves the corrigibility problem. Then, the twist, only if two very delicate conditions hold, that the system never gets too confident, and the human never exhibits anything the system might interpret as irrational, or a mistake. Suddenly the paper goes from a celebratory to a cautionary tale. Exactly, he says. So for me, that roller coaster fits my experience of, like, hey, we got to something pretty good, and oh, this falls apart immediately, if you step away from rationality even in the slightest. In a follow-up study, led by fellow Berkeley PhD student Smith and Milley, the group dug further into the question, should robots be obedient? 61 maybe, they wrote, people really are sometimes wrong about what they want, or do make bad choices for themselves. In that case, even the human ought to want the system to be disobedient, because it really might know better than you yourself. As Milley notes, there are some times when you don't actually want the system to be obedient to you. Like if you've just made a mistake, you know, I'm in my self-driving car, and I accidentally hit manual driving mode. I do not want the car to turn off if I'm not paying attention. 62, but, they found, there's a major catch. If the system's model of what you care about is fundamentally misspecified, there are things you care about of which it's not even aware, and that don't even enter into the system's model of your rewards, then it's going to be confused about your motivation. For instance, if the system doesn't understand the subtleties of human appetite, it may not understand why you requested a steak dinner at 6 o'clock, but then declined the opportunity to have a second steak dinner at 7 o'clock. If locked into an oversimplified or misspecified model where steak, in this case, must be entirely good or entirely bad, then one of these two choices, it concludes, must have been a mistake on your part. It will interpret your behavior as irrational, and that, as we've seen, is the road to incorrigibility, to disobedience. Point 63. For this reason, it is good for a model of human preferences or values to err on the side of complexity. What we found, Hadfield-Manel says, is that if you have an overparameterization of the space of values, then you end up learning the correct thing, but it takes you a little bit longer. If you have an underparameterization, then you end up quickly becoming pretty disobedient and just becoming confident that you know better than the person. In practice, however, overparameterizing a system designed to model human values is easier said than done. We are back to Stuart Armstrong's 20 billion metrics. If a system's model of your housing preferences includes only square footage and price, then it will interpret your preference for a particular house that is both smaller and more expensive than another as you simply making an error. In reality, there are many things you care about that simply don't enter into its picture, location, for one, or school district quality, but also others less easily measured, like the view out the window, the proximity of certain friends, a nostalgic resemblance to a childhood home. This model misspecification problem is a canonical one in machine learning, but here, in the context of obedience, the consequences feel rather eerie. For a system to interact with a human well, it needs to have a good model of what humans are like, says Milley. But getting models of humans is really hard. Milley notes that for all of the field's breathtaking progress, most has been on the robot side. Integrating more accurate models of humans is also a really important component, she says, and I'm very interested in that. In general in this field, I think there's tons of exciting stuff happening in safety, and I particularly am most interested in the parts that involve interaction with humans, because I think that interaction with humans is a really good way to see whether the system has learned the right objective, or the right behavior. The theme of maintaining uncertainty, of never becoming too confident in a model, of thinking really, really hard before you give a robot a deterministic reward function, or allowing it to get a belief where it's completely convinced of what its objective is so central to the maintaining of control and compliance over a system that Hadfield-Manel, Milley, and their Berkeley colleagues decided to push the idea to its next logical step. What if the system was designed in such a way that it stayed uncertain even if you did give it a deterministic reward function? What would that even look like? One of the major themes of this book, and of our discussion of reward shaping in Chapter 5 in particular, is how difficult it is to create a reward function, an explicit way of keeping score in some real or virtual environment, that will actually engender the behavior you want, and not entail loopholes or side effects or unforeseen consequences. Many within the field of AI believe that manually authoring or handcrafting such explicit reward functions or objective functions is a kind of well-intentioned road to hell. No matter how thoughtfully you do it, or how pure your motives may be, there will simply always be something you failed to account for. This fatalistic attitude about explicit objective functions is so deep that, as we have seen in the last few chapters, much of the work being done in advanced AI applications, and in AI safety in particular, is about moving beyond systems that take an explicit objective, and toward systems that attempt to imitate humans, in the case of many self-driving cars, or seek their approval, in the case of the backflipping robot, offering endless choices between options, or infer their goals, and adopt them as their own, in the case of the helicopter. What if there was a way, though, to rescue the explicit reward function architecture, or at least to make it safer? One way to do this, the Berkeley Group realized, is to have the system be at some level aware of how difficult it is to design an explicit reward function, to realize that the human users or programmers made their best faith effort to craft a reward function that captured everything they wanted, but that they likely did an imperfect job. In this case, even the score is not the score. There is something the humans want, which the explicit objective merely and imperfectly reflects. The motivation was to take these ideas of uncertainty and say, what is the simplest change we could make to what people currently do to fix that? Hadfield Manel says, so, what's the simple fix to the current programming mechanisms for robots and AIs that leverage this uncertainty? He explains, this tool of write down a reward function actually is a highly informative signal. It's an incredibly important signal about what you actually should be doing. There's a lot of information there. It's just that right now we kind of assume that the amount of information there is infinite, in the sense that we assume the reward function you've got defines the correct behavior in every possible state of the world. Whereas that's just not true. So how could we take advantage of the large amount of information present, without treating it as everything? 64, as Stuart Russell puts it, the learning system is accumulating brownie points in heaven, so to speak, while the reward signal is, at best, just providing a tally of those brownie points, emphasis mine, point 65. They call this idea inverse reward design, or IRD point 66, instead of taking human behavior as information about what humans want. Here we take their explicit instructions as mere information about what they want. We saw in chapter 8 how inverse reinforcement learning says, what do I think you want, based on what you're currently doing. In contrast, inverse reward design pulls back even further, and says, what do I think you want, based on what you told me to do. 67, autonomous agents optimize the reward function we give them, they write. What they don't know is how hard it is for us to design a reward function that actually captures what we want. 68, the famous racing boat, for instance, the one that spun donuts in a power-up area instead of completing the laps of the race, was explicitly told to maximize points, which in most games is a good proxy for progress or mastery in that game. Generally speaking, whatever reward or command the human gives to the system does work well in the environments on which the system is trained. But in the real world, where the system encounters things totally unlike its training environment, and perhaps unforeseen by the human users, the explicit instructions may not make as much sense. It may well be the case that the machine learning systems of the next several decades will take direct orders, and they will take them seriously. But, for safety reasons, they will not take them literally. Moral uncertainty. Sometimes it is impossible to obtain anything more than imperfect certainty regarding our actions, and no one is bound to do the impossible. Dominic M. Prummer, Ordinis Predicatorum 69. Give nature time to work before you take over her business, lest you interfere with her dealings. You assert that you know the value of time and are afraid to waste it. You fail to perceive that it is a greater waste of time to use it ill than to do nothing, and that a child ill-taught is further from virtue than a child who has learnt nothing at all. Jean-Jacques Rousseau 70. Broadly speaking, the idea of systems that reason as if they are incomplete and potentially flawed in dangerous ways, and that strive for brownie points in heaven even if it means foregoing explicit rewards in the here and now, sounds rather Catholic. For centuries, Catholic theologians have struggled with the question of how to live life by the rules of their faith, given that there are often disagreements among scholars about exactly what the rules are. If, hypothetically, 8 out of 10 theologians think that eating fish on a Friday is perfectly acceptable, but 1 out of 10 thinks it's forbidden, and the other thinks it's mandatory, then what is any reasonable, God-fearing Catholic to do? 71, as the saying goes, a man with a watch knows what time it is, but a man with 2 watches is never sure. 72, these were particularly hotly contested questions in the early modern period following the Middle Ages, between the 15th and 18th centuries. Some scholars advocated for laxism, where something was okay as long as there was a chance it wasn't sinful. This was condemned by Pope Innocent IX in 1591. Others advocated for rigorism, where something was forbidden if there was any chance at all that it was sinful. This was condemned by Pope Alexander VIII in 1690.73. A great number of other competing theories weighed the probability of a rule being correct, or the percentage of reasonable people who believed it. Probabilism, for instance, held that you should do something only if it was less likely to be sinful than not. Equiprobabilism held that it was also okay if the chance was perfectly even. The pure probabilists believed that a rule was optional as long as there was a reasonable probability that it might not be true. Their cry was lex dubia non obligat. A doubtful law does not bind. However, in contrast to the free-spirited laxists, the probabilists stressed that the argument for ignoring the rule, while it didn't need to be more probable than the argument for obeying the law, nonetheless needed to be truly and solidly probable, for if it is only slightly probable it has no value. 74 Much ink was spilled, many accusations of heresy hurled, and papal declarations issued during this time. The Venerable Handbook of Moral Theology concludes its section on the doubting conscience, or moral doubt, by offering the practical conclusion that rigorism is too rigorous and laxism too lax, but all of the others are tolerated by the Church and can suffice as moral heuristics. 75 Questions of pure theology aside, it is of course possible to apply this same broad argument to matters of secular morality, and for that matter, to machine learning. If there are, let's say, various formal metrics you care about, then a laxist approach might say it's okay to take an action as long as it makes at least one of these metrics go up. A rigorist approach might say it's okay to take an action only if at least one of them goes up and none go down. After lying rather dormant even within Catholicism, and not much reverberating in the world of secular ethics, these debates are finally, in recent years, starting to kindle back to life. In 2009, Oxford's Will MacAskill was in a broom closet in the basement of the Philosophy Building at 10 Merton Street, arguing with fellow grad student Daniel Deasy about eating meat. The broom closet was the only place we could find in the college, MacAskill explains, and it was just enough space for us to slightly recline. We were sitting on piles of books and things. It was also a joke, he says, because his thesis advisor was the Oxford philosopher John Broom. 76 cooped up in the broom closet. The two were debating not whether it was immoral to eat meat, per se, but whether you ought to eat meat, or not, given that you don't actually know if it's immoral or not. The decision, MacAskill explains, to eat vegetarian, if it's okay to eat meat, you've not made a big mistake. Your life is slightly less happy, let's say, slightly less, but it's not a huge deal. In contrast, if the vegetarians are right and animal suffering is really morally important, then by choosing to eat meat, you've done something incredibly wrong. There's an asymmetry in the stakes there, MacAskill says. You don't have to be confident that eating meat is wrong, even just the significant risk that it is wrong seems to be sufficient. The conversation stayed with MacAskill. It seemed persuasive, for one thing. But more than that, it was a type of argument he hadn't seen before. It didn't fit the mold of the perennial concerns in ethical philosophy. What is the right thing to do, given some moral standard, and what standard should we use to determine the right thing to do? This was subtly but strikingly different. It was, what is the right thing to do when you don't know the right thing to do? 77 He took the idea to his advisor, John Broom, who told him, oh, if you're interested in that, you should talk to Toby Ord. So MacAskill and Ord met up, in an Oxford graveyard, as it happened, and so began one of the more consequential friendships in 21st century ethics. The two would go on to become founders of the social movement that's come to be called effective altruism, which we discussed briefly in Chapter 7, and which has become arguably the most significant ethical social movement in the early 21st century. 78 They would also, along with Stockholm University philosopher Christer Bykvist, literally write the book on moral uncertainty. 79 As it turns out, there are a wide range of approaches you can take when you're grappling with different competing theories and you're not sure which is right. One approach, dubbed my favorite theory, says simply to live by the theory you think most likely to be correct, though this can overlook cases where a potential wrong is so severe that it's best avoided even if it's very unlikely to actually be wrong. 80 Another approach is to essentially multiply the chance that a moral theory is correct with the severity of its harm, though not every theory offers such easily tabulated degrees of virtue or vice. 81 Each of these suggests an analog in machine learning. My favorite theory, for instance, is roughly equivalent to developing a single best guess model of an environment's rewards, or a user's goals, and then going all in on optimizing it. Theories of averaging suggest ensemble methods, where we simply average over the ensemble. But other, more complicated schemes exist as well. MacAskill imagines moral theories as being like voters in an electorate, and so the discipline of social choice theory, which looks at the nature of voting and group decision-making, with all its quirks and paradoxes, becomes transferable into the moral domain. 82 Ord takes the metaphor even further and imagines moral theories not as voters whose preferences are simply tallied up, but as legislators, in a kind of moral parliament capable of wheeling and dealing and moral trade, forming ad hoc coalitions, and yielding influence on some issues in order to exert more pressure on others. 83 All of these approaches, and more, start to open up in the context of not just humans, but computational systems that must somehow find a way to act when they lack a single, dead certain standard against which they know their acts will be judged. Much of this terrain is still relatively unexplored in philosophy, let alone computer science. 84 But for MacAskill, there is something not only descriptive but prescriptive about moral uncertainty. That is to say, not only do we need ways of choosing the right thing to do when we are deeply unsure about what is even the proper moral framework to apply to the situation, but we in some sense ought to cultivate that very sense of uncertainty. MacAskill thinks, given how much human ethical norms have changed over the centuries, it would be hubris to think we've reached any kind of conclusion. We've seen this kind of arc of moral progress, kind of expanding circle, and maybe you think it stops here, he says. Maybe you think we hit the end. But you definitely shouldn't be confident of that. It's perfectly plausible that in 100 years' time, we'll look back and think of our moral views today as barbaric. I note that there's a certain amount of irony here. MacAskill is one of the leaders of the effective altruism movement, and one of the things that has struck me is the degree to which the movement has created a kind of consensus. There is widespread agreement about the value of the long-term future, widespread agreement about the importance of reducing civilizational and extinction risks. There is even widespread agreement about which exact charities will do the most good. The current consensus, for instance, is the Against Malaria Foundation, AMF, when the respected charity evaluator GiveWell was considering how to allocate their $4.70 million discretionary fund in early 2019, they decided to give every single penny of it to the AMF. 85 For MacAskill, this convergence is double-edged. It reflects a greater sharing of information, a trust in one another's evidence, but it also might be a consensus that is premature. Because, you can explain it like, well, there's the true answers, and we all just figured out what was true, and now we're doing that. But you can also explain it by, well, we were a kind of disconnected tribe, and then certain people started getting more influence, and now we've all globbed together. We would be very overconfident to think that EA is going to be able to escape that. He adds, one of the things that's very notable in EA, if we go back 6 years, let's say, it's really quite broad. There's all these different factions, they have very different views, there's loads of arguments. Now, at least, within the core, there's just been a remarkable amount of convergence. There is a near consensus in the EA community, for instance, that the very long term is important and generally underemphasized. There is a near consensus that stewarding the science and policy around AI is vital in turn to that long-term future. Says MacAskill, the convergence is both really good but also worrying. I had attended the Effective Altruism Global Conference in the fall of 2017 in London. MacAskill closed the conference with a bit of a warning. He had been preoccupied, he said, with fostering a community and a culture that's just very open-minded, actually capable of changing its mind. One of the most likely ways the movement can fail, he argued, was if its beliefs ossified into dogma, if there were certain beliefs that you simply had to hold in order to be accepted by the rest of the community. We agree that would be very bad, he said, but yet I think it's extremely hard to create a culture in which that's not the case. I also attended the Next Effective Altruism Global Conference in the spring of 2018 in San Francisco. McCaskill gave the opening address. He seemed to pick up where he had left off, if on a more upbeat note. The theme was, how can effective altruism stay curious? Walking around the Christchurch meadow with McCaskill, on a bright spring day, I turn from these questions back to the matter of AI. I note that there's something concerning in the idea of empowering anything near, or beyond our own capacities, with some fixed objective function. Oh yeah, McCaskill says. I also freak out by the thought of, like, well, we've just got this one chance. We just need to encode the right values and then, off it goes. Ethical issues are very hard, he says. It's kind of obvious that you want to be uncertain in them. If you look at various moral views, they differ fairly radically on what a good outcome looks like, McCaskill explains. Even if you just compare the kind of hedonist view that says simulated minds are just as good, versus the utilitarian view that says no, it needs to be flesh and blood humans. They are very, very similar theories. They're gonna radically disagree on how we should use our cosmic endowment, meaning humans' ultimate ambition for what we plan to do in the universe. It would be war, basically, he says, the classic narcissism of small differences that has always roiled academic departments, but with cosmic stakes. But maybe all these competing moral theories, which diverge so dramatically in the long run, can find a surprising degree of common ground in how we should spend the present. I think there's plausibly a kind of convergent instrumental goal among all of them, he says. Which I call the long reflection. Which is just a period, really it might be very long. When you look at the actual scales, it's like, okay, we solve AI and so on. Maybe it's millions of years where we're not really doing anything. We're staying relatively small, again, by cosmic standards, at least, and the primary purpose of what we're doing is just trying to figure out what to value. One of our primary goals in the meantime, he says, maybe the primary goal, should be to maintain a society that is as UN locked in as possible, as open to various different kinds of moral possibilities. It sounds quite a bit like the ethical version of attainable utility preservation, ensuring that we can still pursue various objectives long into the future, even if, or particularly if, we have no idea now what those future objectives should be. Even if our guesses now are as good as random. And maybe this is so hard, McCaskill says, that we need to take 1,000,000 years in order to do it. And taking 1,000,000 years might be a small price to pay for getting it right, I suggest. That's an extremely small price to pay, because getting it right, if you populated the stars with the wrong thing, then you've achieved basically zero value, so it's really. You can think of having the wrong moral view as an existential risk, 86. He pauses. I even think of it as the most likely existential risk. Actually, down the hall from the Center for Effective Altruism, where McCaskill works, is Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute, founded by philosopher Nick Bostrom. One of Bostrom's most influential early essays is titled Astronomical Waste. The subtitle is The Opportunity Cost of Delayed Technological Development, and indeed the essay's first half instills in the reader an almost frantic sense of urgency. As I write these words, Bostrom begins, suns are illuminating and heating empty rooms, unused energy is being flushed down black holes, and our great common endowment is being irreversibly degraded into entropy on a cosmic scale. These are resources that an advanced civilization could have used to create value structures, such as sentient beings living worthwhile lives. The rate of this loss boggles the mind. Bostrom goes on to estimate that a future spacefaring civilization could ultimately grow so large that every second of delay in the present is equivalent to the forfeiting of 100 trillion human lives that could have been lived, if only we'd been able to make use of all that wasted energy and matter sooner. But no sooner does any utilitarian start to conclude that advancing our technological progress toward that goal is so important that all other earthly activity is trivial, or morally indefensible, even, then Bostrom's essay makes one of the most abrupt hairpin turns in all of contemporary philosophy. If the risk of a second's delay in reaching this intergalactic future is 100 trillion human lives, he says, think of the risk of failing to do it at all. Doing the math, Bostrom concludes that improving our chances of successfully building a vibrant, thriving far future civilization by a single percentage point are equivalent, in utilitarian terms, to speeding up technological progress by 10 million years. The conclusion, then, despite the enormity of the stakes, is not haste at all but the opposite. Bostrom's essay came up more than once as I asked various AI safety researchers how they decided to commit their lives to that cause. I found that argument pretty weird initially, says Paul Cristiano, or it seemed off-putting, but then I chugged through it and I was like, yeah, I guess I sort of buy this. 87 Cristiano had been thinking seriously about these arguments beginning in 2010 or 2011, and he ran his own version of the numbers in 2013 or 2014. Bostrom's math checked out. It seems much easier, he says, for a single researcher, like himself, to reduce extinction risk by 1 part in 1,000,000 than to speed up progress by 1,000 years. And he has lived the subsequent years of his life accordingly. Of course, setting a potentially superhuman-level artificial general intelligence in motion could be one of the most irrevocable, high-impact things one could possibly do, and tellingly, it is not just the machines, but the researchers themselves that are growing increasingly uncertain, hesitant, open-minded. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute's Buck Schlegeris recently recounted a conversation where someone said that after the singularity, if there was a magic button that would turn all of humanity into homogeneous goop optimized for happiness, aka hedonium, they'd press it. A few years ago, I advocated pressing buttons like that. But something had changed. Now he wasn't so sure. His views had gotten more complicated. Maybe it was a good idea, maybe it wasn't. The question then became what to do when you knew that you didn't know what to do. Point 88. I told them, he says, I think people shouldn't press buttons like that. 89. Conclusion. I think vagueness is very much more important in the theory of knowledge than you would judge it to be from the writings of most people. Everything is vague to a degree you do not realize, till you have tried to make it precise, and everything precise is so remote from everything that we normally think, that you cannot for a moment suppose that is what we really mean when we say what we think. When you pass from the vague to the precise, you always run a certain risk of error. Bertrand Russell 1. Premature optimization is the root of all evil. Donald Knuth 2. It's Christmas Eve, and my wife and I are staying at my father and stepmother's house, when I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. I figure I must have worn way too much clothing to bed. I throw off the covers, peel off my shirt. It isn't me, I realize, with a mixture of dread and alarm. The air in the room is unbearably hot. It suddenly occurs to me that the house may be on fire. I open the door. The house is pitch dark and silent. The air that hits me is chilly. Slowly I put the pieces together. The upstairs has 2 guest bedrooms, but they share a single thermostat panel, which is in the other, unoccupied. 1. Our bedroom door was closed. The door to the other bedroom, which contains the thermostat, is open. It is a frigid New England night, below freezing. The heater has been blowing hot air through vents into both bedrooms. But the room with the thermostat in it has been open to the entire rest of the house, and never got to equilibrium no matter how much hot air the system blew. Our room, shut to the rest of the house, was getting the same amount of hot air the system was using to attempt to heat, in effect, the entire rest of the house. What could be simpler than a thermostat? Indeed, the canonical example of one of the simplest closed-loop control systems there is, the canonical cybernetics example, in fact, is the lowly mechanical thermostat. There is no machine learning involved as such. But here was the alignment problem in full, sweat-soaked force. First, you don't measure what you think you measure. I wanted to regulate the temperature in my room, but I could only measure the temperature in the other room. It did not occur to me that they are fundamentally uncorrelated, so long as one door is open and the other not. Second, sometimes the only thing that saves you is your own incompetence. I remember thinking that if the heating system were more powerful, and if our bedroom were better insulated, my wife and I could have cooked. We of course woke up, but on the flip side of the thermodynamic spectrum, cold temperatures are even more dangerous. Hypothermia simply from a bedroom that is too cold is something that really can and does kill people. 3 In the 1997 documentary Hands on a Hard Body, we meet a Texan named Don Curtis, who tells us that he has a 20-ton air conditioner in his house. A 20-ton air unit is big enough to cool that Kmart store right there, he says. A store had gone out of business, he explains, and they just practically gave it to me. And I said, well, this ought to cool my house. But I didn't know it would bring it down to 12 below zero. But we did find out real quick it would. He managed to escape hypothermic shock, but the danger was real. In my case, as I left my own door open for a few moments, before making sure to close both doors, my mind went to the mid-20th century cyberneticist Norbert Wiener, who foresaw so much of the contemporary alarm about alignment. It was he who made the famous remark that we had better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire. But another of his remarks is just as prescient, just as harrowing. In the past, a partial and inadequate view of human purpose has been relatively innocuous only because it has been accompanied by technical limitations, he wrote. This is only one of the many places where human impotence has shielded us from the full destructive impact of human folly, for Don Curtis is a perfect example of the problem that comes when increasing our power takes this shielding away. I can't help thinking of AI as a 20-ton air conditioner coming to every home. In that sense, then, we must hope that we can correct our folly, rather than our impotence, first. As the Future of Humanity Institute's Nick Bostrom put it in 2018, there is a long-distance race between humanity's technological capability, which is like a stallion galloping across the fields, and humanity's wisdom, which is more like a foal on unsteady legs. 5. Wiener himself had warned about celebrating ingenuity, know-how, without a critical appraisal of what exactly it is that we want to do, something he called know-what, and something he found in lamentably short supply. Aldous Huxley put it yet another way in 1937, it has become apparent that what triumphant science has done hitherto is to improve the means for achieving unimproved or actually deteriorated ends. 6. The story told thus far has been an encouraging one of assured, steady, scientific progress. An ecosystem of research and policy efforts to influence both the near and the long term is underway across the globe. This is still largely nascent, but it is gathering steam. Research on bias, fairness, transparency, and the myriad dimensions of safety now forms a substantial portion of all of the work presented at major AI and machine learning conferences. Indeed, at the moment they are the most dynamic and fastest growing areas, arguably, not just in computing, but in all of science. One researcher told me that at one of the field's biggest conferences in 2016, people looked askance when he said he was working on the topic of safety. When he attended the same conference a year later, no one raised an eyebrow. These cultural shifts mirror shifts in funding and in the emphasis of research itself. We have, in the preceding chapters, explored both the narrative as well as the content of that research agenda, and there is progress to report on all fronts. But the book opened with an epigraph of George Box reminding us that all models are wrong. And so in that spirit, let's unpack, with a critical eye, some of the assumptions in our own story. Representation. In Chapter 1, we talked about the question of who or what is represented in a model's training data. We've come a long way in a short time. It is unlikely that a single major consumer face recognition product will be developed without an internal process oriented toward a representative composition of the training data. However, given the fact that models like these are used not only by consumer software to caption photos, and by consumer hardware to unlock smartphones, but also by governments to surveil their populations, one may question the degree to which making these models more accurate on the faces of already over-surveilled racial minorities is an entirely good thing. There is also a striking degree to which issues of representation in consumer technology remind us about older, thornier, and perhaps even more consequential disparities. I was recently at a dinner with a group of medical researchers, and when I described the push for more representative training data for machine learning models, they reminded me, almost in unison, that most medical trials are still overwhelmingly done on men. 7 The makeup of clinical trials is a double-edged one. even seemingly sensible prohibitions to protect vulnerable groups, not allowing medical trials on pregnant women, for instance, or the elderly, create bias and blind spots. The drug thalidomide was marketed as completely safe because the drug maker could not find a dose high enough to kill a rat. But it caused tens of thousands of horrible deformities in human fetuses before the drug was taken off the market. 8. Americans were largely spared as a result of a skeptical Food and Drug Administration employee, Dr. Francis Oldham Kelsey. In the case of supervised learning, where the training data is labeled in some fashion, we need to consider critically, too, not only where we get our training data, but where we get the labels that will function in the system as a stand-in for ground truth. Often the ground truth is not the ground truth. ImageNet, for instance, used the judgments of random humans on the internet as the truth. If most people thought, say, a wolf cub was a puppy, then as far as the image recognition system is concerned, it is a puppy. Famously, Tesla's director of AI, Andrej Karpathy, in his graduate student days at Stanford, forced himself to label ImageNet pictures for the better part of a week, to make himself the human benchmark. After some practice, he was able to get an accuracy of 95%. But accurate with respect to what? Not truth. Consensus. 9. At a more philosophical level, the labels reflect a pre-made ontology that we must accept without question. ImageNet images each belong to exactly one of 1,000 categories. 10. To use this data, and the models trained on it, we must accept the fiction that these 1,000 categories are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. An image in this dataset will never be labeled with baby and dog even if it clearly contains both. And there is nothing that it can contain that is not one of these 1,000 categories. If we are looking at a picture of, say, a mule, and our labels allow us only to say donkey or horse, then it must be either a donkey or a horse. It also cannot be ambiguous. If we can't discern whether it's a donkey or a horse, we must label it something. And on pain of stochastic gradient descent, we will whip our models into sharing this dogma. Lastly, the labels cannot be uncertain. We can infer some of these things, for instance, by noticing that different people applied different labels, but we don't know how ambivalent or uncertain a human labeler was when they were forced to apply that label. It is also worth considering not only the training data and the labels, but also the objective function. Image recognition systems are often trained with an objective function called cross-entropy loss, the numerical. Details aside, it assigns a penalty for any mischaracterization, no matter which. By the lights of cross-entropy loss, misidentifying a stovetop as a car grill, or a green apple as a pear, or an English bulldog as a French bulldog, is just as bad as characterizing a human being as a gorilla. In reality, certain types of errors, if only from the fiscal perspective of Google, to say nothing of the human so miscategorized, are probably thousands, if not millions of times worse than others. 11. In the second half of Chapter 1, we talked about vector-based word representations and their striking ability to function as analogies. Underneath this apparent simplicity is a surprisingly contentious alignment problem in its own right. What, exactly, is an analogy? For instance, straightforward vector addition, by what is sometimes known as the parallelogram method, or the 3-cosad algorithm, often results in a word being its own best analogy. Doctor man plus woman, for instance, produces a vector whose closest word is, in fact, simply doctor. 12. Tolga Bolukbasi and Adam Collet's group found this an unsatisfactory way to capture, in word 2vec, what we mean by an analogy, which seems to require that the two things at least be different, and so they took a different tack. They imagined a kind of radius of similarity around the word doctor, including words like nurse, midwife, gynecologist, physician, and orthopedist, but not farmer, secretary, or legislator. They then looked for the nearest word that wasn't doctor within this radius. 13. There are other tricky questions here. The geometry of word vectors, the idea that they are represented as distances in mathematical space, makes every analogy symmetrical, in a way that doesn't always reflect human intuitions about analogy. People, for instance, describe an ellipse as being more like the circle than a circle is like an ellipse, and North Korea as more like China than China is like North Korea. 14. So, what algorithm, applied to what representation, produces something that functions more precisely like a human analogy? 15. You might be tempted to throw your hands up. Why should we have computer scientists and linguists and cognitive scientists arguing about such things and coming up with algorithms from scratch when we can just train a machine on examples of human analogies, including their asymmetries and quirks, and have it figure out the appropriate way to specify what an analogy is? This is, of course, an alignment problem. The human concept of analogy turns out to be no less fuzzy and indefinite than any other. As a result, the very same nascent set of tools for alignment in other contexts may be usable here. Fairness. In Chapter 2, we looked at the increasingly widespread use of risk assessment instruments in the criminal justice system. There are many potential hazards here, some of which we already discussed. The ground truth on which these models are trained is not whether the defendant later committed crimes, but, rather, whether they were rearrested and reconvicted. If there are systematic differences in the likelihood of people from different groups to be convicted after arrest, or arrested in the first place, then we are at best optimizing for a distorted proxy for recidivism, not recidivism itself. This is a crucial point that is often overlooked. It's also worth considering that we pretend, for the sake of training the model, that we know what a defendant would have done if released. How could we possibly know? The typical methodology here is to look at the first 2 years of their criminal record after they serve their sentence in full, and to use this as a proxy for the 2 years they would have experienced had they been released earlier. This implicitly assumes that neither age nor the experience of incarceration itself affects someone's behavior when they return to society. In fact, age turns out to be in some cases the single most predictive variable. Furthermore, the assumption that incarceration itself has no effect is both likely false and a rather sad view on a system designed at least ostensibly for rehabilitation. If, as some evidence seems to suggest, the experience of incarceration actually increases the criminal behavior of those who experience it, then the reoffenses of people made to serve out their sentences become training data for a model that assumes they would have been just as dangerous had they been released early. 16. Hence it would recommend the very longer sentences that produce the crime. The prediction becomes self-fulfilling, people are held unnecessarily, and public safety is worse as a result. In many domains of machine learning there is a striking degree of what's called transfer learning, where a system initially trained on one task is easily repurposed for another. But this is not always done thoughtfully or wisely. The compass tool, for instance, was explicitly designed not to be used for sentencing, and yet in some jurisdictions, it is anyway. The same holds true of word embedding models used for hiring decisions. Representations built to facilitate prediction are in many cases being used to do the very thing they were trained to predict. In a corporate culture with a history of sexism, a model that, unfortunately, correctly, predicts that few women will be hired can get unthinkingly deployed such that few women do. To the extent that we want our models to do anything other than repeat and reinforce the past, we need to approach them more deliberately and more mindfully. We saw, also, how fairness readily suggests a number of different formal definitions that seem intuitive and desirable. And yet the brutal mathematical fact is that no decision system, human or machine, can offer us all of them at once. Some researchers feel that instead of hashing out these different formalisms, then trying to reconcile them manually, we ought rather to simply train a system with examples of things that humans believe are fair and unfair, and have machine learning construct the formal, operational definition itself. Point 17. This is, itself, likely to be an alignment problem as subtle as any other. Transparency. In Chapter 3, we discussed an encouraging frontier of work on the advantages of simple models, as well as on the increasing capacity for finding optimal simple models. This transparency is at least potentially double-edged, however, as research shows that humans place greater trust in transparent models even when those models are wrong and ought not to be trusted. Point 18. There is also the slight paradox that it is very difficult to understand why a particular simple model is the optimal one. The exhaustive answer to that question is likely highly technical and verbose. Further, with any particular simple model, we may well ask where the menu of possible features came from, not to mention what human process drove the desiderata and the creation of the tool in the first place. Point 19. These are legitimate questions of transparency that are intrinsically human, social, and political, and that machine learning itself cannot address. In developing architectures that lend themselves to explanations, whether visual or verbal, there are several things to be on guard for. Research has shown the possibility of adversarial explanations, that is, two systems that behave almost identically, but offer very different explanations for how and why they behaved as they did. Point 20. There is great power in being able to offer persuasive explanations for one's behavior, whether or not they are true. In fact, cognitive scientists, such as Hugo Messia and Dan Sperber, have recently argued that the human capacity for reasoning evolved not because it helped us make better decisions and hold more accurate beliefs about the world, but rather because it helped us win arguments and persuade others. Point 21. Caution is warranted that we do not simply create systems optimized for the appearance of explanation, or for the sense they give us that we understand them. Such systems could wield this ability deceptively. We may find we have optimized for virtuosic bullshit artistry. More generally, even if we constrain the system's explanations to be truthful, building a system with an impressive ability to explain itself may help us control it. But if we are persuaded by the argumentative theory of reasoning, then this may also help it control us. Agency. In our discussion of reinforcement learning, reward shaping, and intrinsic motivation in chapters 4, 5, and 6, particularly in the context of Atari games and Go, we implicitly assume something whose technical name is ergodicity, namely, that you cannot make a permanent mistake. Nothing can happen that cannot be fixed by starting over. Hence it is no problem to learn by making hundreds of thousands of largely random and frequently fatal mistakes. The ergodicity assumption does not hold outside the safe toy worlds of Atari. I recall a car commercial from the early 2000s that showed a hip Gen X.com era programmer who was coding an extreme racing game by day, full of cinematic slow-motion crashes, but who by night commutes home in his conservative, safety-first sedan. Cause in real life, he says, looking at the camera, there is no reset button. DeepMind's Jan Laker makes this point in slightly different language. There is at least one major difference, he notes, between himself and the artificial agents he studies. More precisely, there is a major difference between their worlds and his own. The real world is not ergodic, he says. If I jump out of the window, that's it. It's not, like, a mistake I will learn from. 22. Different approaches to reinforcement learning also come with different sets of assumptions. Some assume that the world has a finite amount of discrete states. Some assume that you always know for certain what state you are in. Many assume that rewards are always commensurate scalar values, that they never change, and that you always know for certain when you receive one. Many assume that the environment is essentially stable. Many assume both that the agent can't permanently alter the environment, and that the environment can't permanently alter the agent. In the real world, many actions change your goals. Any number of mind-altering or mood-regulating drugs, prescription and otherwise, will do that, at least to a degree and for a time. So will living abroad, meeting the right person, or even listening to the right song. Most reinforcement learning assumes that none of this can happen. A tiny sliver of research admits this possibility, but assumes that the agent will rationally attempt to defend itself against such changes. Point 23, and yet we undertake certain transformative experiences on purpose, suspecting that we will be changed from them, sometimes without even being able to anticipate in what ways. Point 24, parenthood comes to mind as one such example. Traditional reinforcement learning also tends to presume that the agent is the only agent in the environment. Even in a zero-sum game like chess or Go, the system is playing the board more than it is playing the opponent, and there is little allowance for the idea that the opponent may be changing and adapting to its own strategies. In a recent conversation I had with two reinforcement learning researchers, we mused about putting most IL algorithms into the prisoner's dilemma, where two co-conspirators must decide whether to defect by turning the other in or cooperate by staying silent. The cooperate strategy has the best outcome, but only if both choose it, and traditional IL agents would be unable to understand that the environment contained another agent, one whose behavior was contingent on its own. Defection would always seem more rewarding in the short term, and also easier, whereas cooperation would require a degree of synchronization that would elude two agents that didn't properly understand their interdependence. Point 25, as John Piaget put it about the development of a child's mind, step by step with the coordination of his intellectual instruments he discovers himself in placing himself as an active object among the other active objects in a universe external to himself, 26 humans likewise understand that, in the words of the mindfulness teacher John Kabat-Zinn, wherever you go, there you are, whereas IL agents typically don't think of themselves as part of the world they're modeling. Most machine learning systems presume that they themselves do not affect the world, thus they do not need to model or understand themselves. This assumption will only get more and more unfounded the more powerful and capable and widespread such agents become. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute's Abram Dembski and Scott Garrabrant, for instance, have been calling for what they term embedded agency, a rethinking of the self and world division that has become so implicit and entrenched within the field. 27. Imitation. In Chapter 7, we discussed one of the fundamental, unfounded assumptions of the entire premise of imitation learning, namely, that you can treat an interactive world, where every choice you make changes what you see and experience, as if it were a classic supervised learning problem, where the data you see are what's known as IID, independent and identically distributed. If you see a picture of a cat and mislabel it as a dog, it doesn't change the picture you'll see next. But in a car, if you mislabel a road image pointing straight ahead as one that requires a right-hand turn, then you will very soon find yourself looking at an unfamiliar sideways pointing road. This is the fundamental cause of the cascading errors that methods like Dagger seek to mitigate. One thinks of this as equivalent in some sense to the aerodynamics of modern stealth fighter jets like the F-117 Nighthawk, which are unstable in all three axes and demand perfect precision in their flight, or else become immediately and catastrophically unstable. Except in this case, the autopilot is not the solution, but the cause of this problem. Imitation also tends to assume that the expert and the imitator have fundamentally the same capabilities, the same body, in effect, and at least potentially the same mind. The car, as it happens, is the perfect example of when this assumption is justified. The human driver and the autopilot really do, in effect, share a body. They are both sending drive-by-wire signals to the same steering column, the same axles, the same tires and brakes. In other cases, this simply will not work. If someone is fundamentally faster, or stronger, or differently sized than you, or quicker thinking than you could ever be, mimicking their actions to perfection may still not work. Indeed, it may be catastrophic. You'll do what you would do if you were them. But you're not them. And what you do is not what they would do if they were you. Inference. As AI agents in the world grow ever more sophisticated, they are going to need good models of us to make sense of how the world works, and of what they ought and ought not to do. If they model us as pure, unbridled, and unerring reward maximizers, and we aren't, then we're going to have a bad time. If someone is going out of their way to help you and they don't truly understand what you want, either in the immediate term or in life, then you may end up worse off than if they didn't try to help at all. If this misguided helper should be, say, superhumanly intelligent and powerful, all the worse. In our discussion of systems that infer human values and motivations from their behavior, there are a number of assumptions to unpack. One is that the human or expert is demonstrating optimal behavior. This is, of course, almost never the case. 28 In systems sophisticated enough to relax this assumption, there are specific formal models for the types of suboptimality people exhibit. For instance, that we behave probabilistically where the probability of an action is proportional to its reward. These appear to work surprisingly well in practice, but whether they in fact are the best model for human behavior is an open question, and one as much for psychologists, cognitive scientists, and behavioral economists as for computer scientists. 29 Even when there is a certain allowance made for error, or suboptimality, or irrationality in human performance, these models nonetheless typically assume that the human is an expert, not a pupil, the gait of the adult, not the child learning to walk, the pro helicopter pilot, not someone still getting the knack. The models presume that the human's behavior has converged to a set of best practices, that they've learned as much as they ever will, or have become as good at the given task as they'll ever be. In this sense, the name of this technique, inverse reinforcement learning, is a misnomer. We are making an inference about someone's goals and values not based on their process of reinforcement learning, but rather from their final behavioral outcome, in technical terms, their learned policy. We don't infer from the demonstrator in the process of their learning to achieve their goal, only afterward. A point that was made in the very first IRL paper, in 1998.30. 20 years later. IRL systems are finally coming into their own, but very little work has been done to address this underlying principled question. 31 Typical inverse reinforcement learning also assumes that the human expert is acting in some sense without realizing that they are being modeled. Cooperative inverse reinforcement learning tends to make the assumption in the other direction, that the human is acting in a pedagogical fashion, explicitly teaching the machine, and not simply doing their thing. In reality, our behavior in the presence of others is often somewhere between the two. Making a strong assumption either way can cause problems of misinterpretation, if violated. 32 Finally, and perhaps most consequentially, typical inverse reinforcement learning systems imagine there is but one person whose preferences are being modeled. How, exactly, are we to scale this to systems that are, in some sense, the servant of two or more masters? As Stanford computer scientist Stefano Ehrman puts it, aligning AI with human values is something that I think the majority of people would agree on, but the issue, of course, is to define what exactly these values are, because people have different cultures, come from different parts of the world, and have different socioeconomic backgrounds, so they will have very different opinions on what those values are. That's really the challenge. 33 University of Louisville computer scientist Roman Yampolsky concurs, stressing, we as humanity do not agree on common values, and even parts. We do agree on change with time. 34. There are technical details here that matter. If half the user population drives left at a fork and the other half drives right, the correct behavior is clearly not to split the difference and plow into the divider. There are also myriad paradoxes that await us as machine learning prepares to make contact with existing disciplines, fraught with their own long-standing problems, that have grappled in some cases for centuries with reconciling multiple people's preferences, political philosophy and political science, voting theory, and social choice. 35 To conclude this section on the assumptions of machine learning by zooming out slightly, every machine learning architecture is implicitly resting on a kind of transfer learning at several levels. It assumes that the situations it encounters in reality will resemble, on average, what it encountered in training. Several of the above issues are versions of this problem, as are classic machine learning pitfalls like overfitting. One of the simplest violations of this assumption, however, is the world's stubborn and persistent tendency to change. I recall hearing one computational linguistics researcher complaining that no matter how hard they tried, they could not get their model to replicate the accuracy of another researcher's published result from a year or two earlier. Over and over they checked their work. What were they doing differently? Nothing, as it turned out. The training data were from 2016. The English being written and spoken in 2017 was slightly, but measurably, different. The English of 2018 was more different still. This is one example of what researchers know as distributional shift. No one trying to reproduce the paper's results ever would reach the same level of accuracy as the original researchers, at least not with that training data. The model trained on 2016 data was slowly bleeding out its accuracy as the world moved on point 36. Taken together, we have a litany of reminders that the map is not the territory. As Bruno Latour writes, we have taken science for realist painting, imagining that it made an exact copy of the world. The sciences do something else entirely, paintings too, for that matter. Through successive stages they link us to an aligned, transformed, constructed world, 37 aligned, if we are fortunate, and very careful, and very wise. This amounts to a cautionary tale for the coming century that is decidedly drab and unsexy, and for that matter, I think, dangerously likely to go under the collective radar. We are in danger of losing control of the world not to AI, or to machines as such but to models. To formal, often numerical specifications for what exists, and for what we want. Point 38, as the artist Robert Irwin put it, human beings living in and through structures become structures living in and through human beings. In this context, these are cautionary words. Though the story presented in this book is one of progress, we must not think we are anywhere close to done. Indeed, one of the most dangerous things one can do in machine learning, and otherwise, is to find a model that is reasonably good, declare victory, and henceforth begin to confuse the map with the territory. Human institutional memory is remarkably shallow, a century at the utmost. Every generation arrives into the world thinking it is just how things are. Even if we, that is, everyone working on AI and ethics, AI and technical safety, do our jobs, if we can avoid the obvious dystopia and catastrophes, which is far from certain, we still have to overcome the fundamental and possibly irresistible progression into a world that increasingly is a formalism. We must do this even as, inevitably, we are shaped in our lives, in our imaginations, in our bodies, by those very models. This is the dark side of Rodney Brooks's famous robotics manifesto, the world is its own best model. Increasingly, this is true, but not in the spirit Brooks meant it. The best model of the world stands in for the world itself, and threatens to kill off the real thing. We must take great care not to ignore the things that are not easily quantified, or do not easily admit themselves into our models. The danger, paraphrasing Hannah Arendt, is not so much that our models are false, but that they might become true. In other scientific fields, it is likely we will not have this problem. Reliance on Newtonian mechanics did not make the troublesome perihelion of Mercury go away. It was still there, nagging at Einstein, 200 years after Newton. In human affairs, however, this danger is very real. In the National Transportation Safety Board review of the self-driving Uber car that killed pedestrian Elaine Herzberg in Tempe, Arizona, in 2018, the analysis reveals that the system never classified her as a pedestrian. Because she was crossing, without a crosswalk, the system design did not include a consideration for jaywalking pedestrians. 39. We must take caution that we do not find ourselves in a world where our systems do not allow what they cannot imagine, where they in effect enforce the limits of their own understanding. It is for this reason, perhaps, among others, that we find it so refreshing to spend time in nature. Point 40. Nature, though shaped in innumerable ways by human intention, nonetheless never ceases to find ways to thwart our taxonomies, to buck the systems we attempt to impose on it, conceptual and otherwise. As the English writer Herbert Reed has argued, only a people serving an apprenticeship to nature can be trusted with machines. 41. Increasingly, institutional decision-making relies on explicit, formal metrics. Increasingly, our interaction with almost any system invokes a formal model of our own behavior, either a model of user behavior in general or one, however simple, tailored to us. What we have seen in this book is the power of these models, the ways they go wrong, and the ways we are trying to align them with our interests. There is every reason for concern, but our ultimate conclusions need not be grim. As we've seen, the outbreak of concern for both ethical and safety issues in machine learning has created a groundswell of activity. Money is being raised, taboos are being broken, marginal issues are becoming central, institutions are taking root, and most importantly, a thoughtful, engaged community is developing and getting to work. The fire alarms have been pulled, and first responders are on the scene. We have also seen how the project of alignment, though it contains its own dangers, is also tantalizingly and powerfully hopeful. The dominance of the easily quantified and the rigidly procedural will to some degree unravel, a relic of an earlier generation of models and software that had to be made by hand, as we gain systems able to grasp not only our explicit commands, but our intentions and preferences. The ineffable need not cede entirely to the explicit. In this way, the technology to come exacerbates some currently extant problems, but alleviates and mitigates others. We said in the introduction that this would be a unique opportunity to gain a kind of individual and civic self-knowledge. That, too, is one of the thrilling and perhaps redemptive dimensions of the story of alignment. Biased and unfair models, if deployed haphazardly, may deepen existing social problems, but their existence raises these often subtle and diffuse issues to the surface and forces a reckoning of society with itself. Unfair pretrial detention models, for one thing, shine a spotlight on upstream inequities. Biased language models give us, among other things, a way to measure the state of our discourse and offer us a benchmark against which to try to improve and better ourselves. Transparent and explainable systems trained on the real, human world give us the possibility of transparency and explanation into things about which we are currently in the dark. In seeing a kind of mind at work as it digests and reacts to the world, we will learn something both about the world and also, perhaps, about minds. And the prospect of so-called AGI, one or more entities as flexibly intelligent as ourselves, and likely more so, will give us the ultimate look in the mirror. Having learned perhaps all too little from our fellow animals, we will discover firsthand which aspects of intelligence appear to be universal and which are simply human. This alone is a terrifying and thrilling prospect. But we are better knowing the truth than imagining it. Alignment will be messy. How could it be otherwise? Its story will be our story, for better or worse. How could it not? On January 14, 1952, the BBC hosted a radio program that convened a panel of 4 distinguished scientists for a roundtable conversation. The topic was, can automatic calculating machines be said to think? The 4 guests were Alan Turing, one of the founders of computer science, who had written a now legendary paper on the topic in 1950, philosopher of science Richard Braithwaite, neurosurgeon Jeffrey Jefferson, and mathematician and cryptographer Max Newman. The panel began discussing the question of how a machine might learn, and how humans might teach it. It's quite true that when a child is being taught, his parents and teachers are repeatedly intervening to stop him doing this or encourage him to do that, Turing said. Point 42. But this will not be any the less so when one is trying to teach a machine. I have made some experiments in teaching a machine to do some simple operation, and a very great deal of such intervention was needed before I could get any results at all. In other words, the machine learnt so slowly that it needed a great deal of teaching. Jefferson interrupted. But who was learning, he said, you or the machine? Well, Turing replied, I suppose we both were. Acknowledgements. A nervous system that has effectors may make marks, say put ink on paper. At any time it may see those marks. By simple conditioning, marks may become signs for anything of which the nervous system has an idea. They come to signify the same to other nervous systems by similar conditioning. Thus, by means of signs, the computing and concluding have been shared by many nervous systems at one time and continued into times beyond all measure. This indeed is the story of language, literature, philosophy, logic, mathematics, and physics. Warren McCulloch 1. This book is a product, more than anything, of conversations, many. Hundreds of them. Some arranged months in advance and some serendipitous, some the product of thousands of miles of travel, some tethered by thousands of miles of UDP packets, and some around the corner. Some in a quiet office with a tape recorder running, some muttered sotto voce in an auditorium while something else was happening, some shouted boisterously over drinks. Some at the world's most august institutions, and some at the rock climbing gym, or the hotel hot tub, or the dinner table. Some more like interviews and oral histories, some like collegial shop talk, and some like hanging out. Ideas are social. They emerge incrementally, turn by turn, in a dialogue, the product of no one mind. Anytime I talked to someone and an idea emerged that I knew or suspected at the time would likely make its way into the book, I tried to make note of it. I made many such notes. I'm sure I failed to do so on many occasions, and I apologize sincerely in advance. But I am certain that, at a minimum, conversations and exchanges with the following people have made the book what it is: Peter Abiel, Rebecca Ackerman, Dave Ackley, Ross Exo Adams, Blaise Guerra Wyarchus, Jackie Alsine, Dario Amodi, McCain Andrus, Julia Angwin, Stuart Armstrong, Gustav Arrhenius, Amanda Askell, Mayank Bansal, Daniel Basui, Solan Barokas, Renata Barreto, Andrew Barto, Baisha Bortz, Mark Belmer, Tolga Boluk Basie, Nick Bostrom, Malo Gregor, Tim Brennan, Miles Brundage, Joanna Bryson, Krista Bykvist, Maya Kakmak, Ryan Carey, Joseph Carl-Smith, Rich Karuna, Ruth Chang, Alexandra Choldachova, Randy Christian, Paul Cristiano, Jonathan Cohen, Catherine Collins, Sam Corbett-Davies, Mian Christ, Andrew Critch, Fiery Cushman, Alan Defoe, Ralph D'Amico, Peter Dyan, Michael Dennis, Shiri Dorihakohen, Anka Dragan, Eric Drexler, Rochit Dubé, Cynthia Dwork, Peter Eckersley, Joe Edelman, Owain Evans, Tom Everett, Ed Felton, Daniel Phelan, Jamie Fizak, Luciano Floridi, Carrick Flynn, Jeremy Freeman, Yaron Gal, Suya Ganguly, Scott Garabrandt, Varel Gates, Tom Gilbert, Adam Gleave, Paul Glimcher, Sharad Goel, Adam Goldstein, Ian Goodfellow, Bryce Goodman, Alison Gopnik, Samir Goswami, Hilary Greaves, Joshua Green, Tom Griffiths, David Gunning, Gillian Hadfield, Dylan Hadfield-Manel, Moritz Hart, Tristan Harris, David Heger, Dan Hendricks, Jeff Hinton, Matt Hubert, Tim Huang, Jeffrey Irving, Adam Collet, Henry Kaplan, Bean Kim, Perry Klass, John Kleinberg, Caroline Knapp, Victoria Krakovna, Francis Krymer, David Kreuger, Caitlin Krieger, Mike Krieger, Alexander Krzyzewski, Jacob Lagaros, Lily Lamboy, Lydia Lawrenson, James Lee, Jan Laker, Aidan Leroux, Karen Levi, Falk Leader, Michael Littman, Tanya Lombroso, Will McCaskill, Scott Movaes, Margaret McCarthy, Andrew Meltzoff, Smith Amili, Martha Minow, Karthika Mohan, Adrian Morisot, Julia Mosquera, Sendel Melanathan, Elon Musk, Yoel Neve, Brandy Nonek, Peter Norvig, Alexander Notchenko, Chris Ola, Catherine Orson, Toby Ord, Tim O'Reilly, Laurent Orso, Pedro Ortega, Michael Page, Deepak Pathak, Alex Pasakovich, Gualtiero Pixanini, Dean Pomelo, James Portnow, Asa Raskin, Stephen Ross, Cynthia Rudin, Jack Rusher, Stuart Russell, Anna Salomon, Anders Sandberg, Wolfram Schultz, Laura Schultz, Julie Shah, Rohin Shah, Max Schron, Carl Schulman, Satinder Singh, Holly Smith, Nate Suarez, Daisy Stanton, Jacob Stenhart, Jonathan Stray, Rachel Sussman, John Tallon, Melinda Tomby, Sophie Thanhauser, Tenna Thau, Jasdeep Thind, Travis Timmerman, Brian TSE, Alexander Matt Turner, Phoebe Vianos, Kirsten Vignard, Chris Wiggins, Cutter Wood, and Ilona Zyder. Thank you to early readers, who made the book immeasurably better for all those who might come after: Daniel Basui, Elizabeth Christian, Randy Christian, Mian Christ, Ralph D'Amico, Shiri Dorihakohen, Peter Eckersley, Owain Evans, Daniel Phelan, Rachel Friedman, Adam Goldstein, Bryce Goodman, Tom Griffiths, Jeffrey Irving, Greg Jensen, Kristen Johannes, Henry Kaplan, Ralph Lee, Rose Link, Phil Risherm, Felicity Rose, Katya Savchuk, Rohin Shah, Max Schron, Phil Van Stockham, Sean Wen, and Chris Wiggins. Thank you for every punch not pulled. Thank you to my agent, Max Brockman, for seeing that it could, and to my editor, Brendan Curry, for seeing that it did. Thanks to the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, New IPS, and the Future of Life Institute for significant invitations, which I was very glad to accept. Thank you to NYU's Algorithms and Explanations Conference and FAT Conference, AI Now, CITRIS's Inclusive AI Conference, the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing's Optimization and Fairness Symposium, and the Center for Human Compatible AI for convening bright minds on important topics. It was an honor to be in the room. Thanks to the McDowell Colony, to Mike and Caitlin Krieger, and to the Corporation of Yaddo, 4 oases where the early, middle, and late words were written, respectively, for the gift of time, space, and inspiration. Thank you to the ghosts of Jerry Garcia and Sylvia Plath for keeping me company on solitary days. Thanks to the researchers at the Bertrand Russell Archives at McMaster University, in particular Kenneth Blackwell, the Warren McCulloch Papers at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and the Frank Rosenblatt Archives at Cornell University, as well as the Monterey County Free Libraries and the San Francisco Public Library, along with Garson O'Toole at Quote Investigator, for their personal help in finding obscure realia. Thanks to the Internet Archive for keeping the essential, ephemeral past present. Thanks to the various free and/or open source software projects that made the writing of this book possible, in particular GIT, TeX, and LaTeX. I marvel that this manuscript was written using typesetting software more than 40 years old, and for which none other than Arthur Samuel himself wrote the documentation. We really do stand on the shoulders of giants. Humbly, I want to acknowledge those who passed away during the writing of this book whose voices I would have loved to include, and whose ideas are nevertheless present: Derek Parfit, Kenneth Arrow, Hubert Dreyfus, Stanislav Petrov, and Ursula K. Le Guin. I want to express a particular gratitude to the University of California, Berkeley. To Citrus, where I was honored to be a visiting scholar during the writing of this book, with very special thanks to Brandy Nonek and Camille Crittenden, to the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing, in particular Kristen Kane and Richard Karp, to the Center for Human Compatible AI, in particular Stuart Russell and Mark Nitzberg, and to the many brilliant and spirited members and visitors of the CHAI workshop. You have all made me feel so inspired and so at home, and your fellowship and camaraderie mean more than you know. Thank you to my wife, Rose, for being a first reader, a steadying hand, a discerning eye and ear, a sturdy shoulder, and an encouraging whoop. You always believed, and I always wanted you to be right. Notes. Epigraphs. 1. See Peter Norvig, on Chomsky and the Two Cultures of Statistical Learning, http://norvig.com/chomsky.html. 2. This remark, widely attributed to Brooks in many sources, appears to have been first stated as it turns out to be better to use the world as its own model in Brooks' Intelligence Without Representation. 3. The now famous statistical adage, all models are wrong, first appeared in Box, Science and Statistics. It later appeared with the silver lining, but some are useful in Box, Robustness in the Strategy of Scientific Model Building. Prologue. 1. Information about Walter Pitts's life is incredibly scarce. I have drawn from what little primary source material there is, chiefly Pitts's letters to Warren McCulloch, which are accessible in the McCulloch Archive at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. I'm grateful for the kind assistance of the staff there. Other material is drawn from oral histories of Pitts's contemporaries, particularly Jerome, Jerry, Letvin in Anderson and Rosenfeld, Talking Nets, as well as the essays and recollections in McCulloch, the collected works of Warren S. McCulloch. For other accounts of Pitts's life, see e.g. Smalheiser, Walter Pitts Easterling, Walter Pitts and Gefter, the man who tried to redeem the world with logic. Further details exist in biographies of McCulloch, Norbert Wiener, and the Cybernetics Group, e.g. Himes, John von Neumann and Norbert Wiener, and the Cybernetics Group, and Conway and Ziegelman, Dark Hero of the Information Age. 2. Whitehead and Russell, Principia Mathematica. 3. Thanks to the staff at the Bertrand Russell Archives at McMaster University for their help in attempting to locate a copy of this letter. Unfortunately, no extant copy is known. 4. Anderson and Rosenfeld, Talking Nets. 5. Anderson and Rosenfeld. The book was most likely Carnap's The Logical Syntax of Language, Logisch Syntax der Sprache, though some sources have it as the logical structure of the world, der logisch Aufbau der Welt. 6. It's possible, depending on exactly when they met, that Pitts had turned 18 and or that Letvin was still 20, McCulloch writes. In 1941 I presented my notions on the flow of information through ranks of neurons to Reshevsky's seminar in the Committee on Mathematical Biology of the University of Chicago, and met Walter Pitts, who then was about 17 years old. See McCulloch, The Collected Works of Warren S. McCulloch, pp 35-36. 7. Some of the roots of this thinking predate McCulloch's work with Pitts, see e.g. McCulloch. Recollections of the many sources of cybernetics. 8. See Pixanini, The First Computational Theory of Mind and Brain, and Letvin, Introduction to McCulloch, The Collected Works of Warren S. McCulloch. 9. John von Neumann's 1945 EDVAC report, the first description ever written of a stored program computer, will contain, for all its 101 pages, a single citation, McCulloch and Pitts, 1943. See Newman, first draft of a report on the EDVAC. Von Neumann actually misspells it in the original text, following W, S, McCulloch, sick, and W, Pitts. Von Neumann is taken with their argument, and in a section titled Neuron Analogy, he considers the practical implications for the computing device he envisions. It is easily seen that these simplified neuron functions can be imitated by telegraph relays or by vacuum tubes, he writes. Since these tube arrangements are to handle numbers by means of their digits, it is natural to use a system of arithmetic in which the digits are also two-valued. This suggests the use of the binary system. We all know the story of what became of such binary, stored program machines, built out of logic gates. They are the computers that are so pervasive they now outnumber us on the planet by a wide margin. And yet this architecture, inspired as it was by the brain, quickly moved far from this neuron analogy. Many wondered whether machines might exist that were closer in their architecture to that of brains, not a single processor being fed explicit logical instructions one at a time at blistering speed, but a broadly distributed mesh of relatively simple, uniform processing units, whose emergent whole was greater than the sum of its fairly rudimentary parts. Perhaps even something that wasn't so binary, and had a bit of the messiness that Letvin embraced and Pitts eschewed. Dedicated parallel hardware for neural networks would be created periodically, including Frank Rosenblatt's Mark I perceptron, but typically in a bespoke, one-off fashion. The real hardware revolution that would support massively parallel Training of neural networks, namely with GPUs, would come decades later, in the mid-2000s. Introduction. 1. Mikolov, Sutskiva, and Le, learning the meaning behind words. 2. Mikolov, Yi, and Zweig, linguistic regularities in continuous space word representations. 3. Tolga Boluk-Basi, personal interview, November 11, 2016. 4. Adam Collet, personal interview, April 4, 2018. 5. In January 2017, North Point merged with Courtview Justice Solutions and Constellation Justice Systems, and they collectively rebranded themselves as Equivalent lowercase SIC, headquartered in Ohio. 6. And frequently, those investigations were completed by the same people who developed the instrument Demaray and Sing, risk assessment instruments validated and implemented in correctional settings in the United States. 7. Angwin et al., machine bias. 8. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. A conversation with Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr., https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=2 9. The joke was made by Program Chair Sami Bengio during the 2017 conference's opening remarks. See https://conferences/nips.cc/conferences/event media/opening_remarks.pdf. The figure of 13,000 attendees comes from the 2019 conference, c.e.g. https://winship.com/2019/12/key-trends-neurips-2019.html. 10. Boluk-Basi et al., man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker. 11. Dario Amodi, personal interview, April 24, 2018. 12. This memorable phrasing comes from the classic paper Kerr, on the folly of rewarding A, while hoping for B. 13. For the official OpenAI blog post about the boat race incident, see Clark and Amodi, faulty reward functions in the wild. Chapter 1. Representation. 1. New Navy device learns by doing. 2. A relatively small number of theorists, Rosenblatt complained, have been concerned with the problems of how an imperfect neural network, containing many random connections, can be made to perform reliably those functions which might be represented by idealized wiring diagrams. See Rosenblatt, The Perceptron. Rosenblatt was inspired by the late 1940s work of Canadian neuropsychologist Donald Hebb, see Hebb, The Organization of Behavior. Hebb's view, famously summarized as cells that fire together wire together, noted that the actual connections between neurons varied from one person to another and appeared to change as a function of experience. Learning, therefore, in some fundamental sense was the changing of these connections. Rosenblatt applied this straightforwardly to the practice of how a machine, made of simple mathematical, or logical, neurons, might learn. 3. Bernstein, AI. 4. New Navy device learns by doing. 5. Rival. 6. Andrew, machines which learn. 7. Rosenblatt, Principles of Neurodynamics. 8. Bernstein, AI. 9. Walter Pitts's last letter to McCulloch, sent just a few weeks before Pitts's death, sits in a manila folder labeled Pitts, Walter in the Warren McCulloch Archive, housed at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. I hold it in my hands. Pitts is writing, from one hospital bed across town to another, because he's been told that McCulloch wants to hear from him. He's skeptical, there cannot be much cheerful in it about either of us. But is persuaded, anyway, to write. Pitts talks about McCulloch's recent coronary, and that he understands McCulloch is now attached to many sensors connected to panels and alarms. No doubt this is cybernetical, Pitts writes. But it all makes me most abominably sad. Imagine the worst happens in both our cases, he writes. His mind goes back, it seems, to Chicago, 1942, to those memorable evenings with Letvin in the McCulloch's house, those 27 years before. We shall then pull our wheelchairs together, look at the tasteless cottage cheese in front of us, and recount the famous story of the conversation at the house of old Glaucus, where Protagoras and the sophist Hippias were staying, and try once more to penetrate their subtle and profound paradoxes about the knower and the known. And then, in a trembling script, all caps, be thou well. 10. Jeff Hinton, Lecture 2.2, Perceptrons, First Generation Neural Networks, Lecture, Neural Networks for Machine Learning, Coursera, 2012. 11. Alex Krzyzewski, Personal Interview, June 12, 2019. 12. The method for determining the gradient update in a deep network is known as backpropagation. It is essentially the chain rule from calculus, although it requires the use of differentiable neurons, not the all-or-nothing neurons considered by McCulloch, Pitts, and Rosenblatt. The work that popularized the technique is considered to be Rumelhart, Hinton, and Williams, learning internal representations by error propagation, although backpropagation has a long history that dates back to the 1960s and 70s, and important advances in training deep networks have continued to emerge in the 21st century. 13. Bernstein, AI. 14. Sila et al., backpropagation applied to handwritten zip code recognition. 15. See Convolutional Nets and Safar 10, an interview with Jan LeCun. https://medium.com/kaggle-blog/convolutional-net-and-CI-far-1010-interview- with-Jan Lutz 238F9E36 or http://blog.kaggle.com/2014/12/convolutional-nets- and CI-far-10-an interview with Yang Lutz. 16. For details on what feed-forward networks can and cannot do, see Hornick, Stinchcomb.